Chapter 376-400. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. After calming his excitement over the new boots and the attached powerful skill whose side effect would not affect XIETIAN in the future thanks to his natural agility points exceeding by a wide margin the threshold required to ignore the immobility, he took off the old pair of normal grade treasure boots and replaced them. You two have done well, you deserve a good rest. He patted each boot as he put them aside. These boots had been his second pair of boots as the first pair had been destroyed during his first battle against a first-order existence. However, this second pair of boots had been with him longer than almost all of the equipment he wore on his body, with the blazing ring and the broken bronze bell being the only two comparable. Therefore, to him, they had a bit of special meaning. After his happy mood returned to neutral, he picked up another treasure, a ring. The ring had a rather unique aspect as instead of being completely circular with a hole in the center through which the finger would pass, it actually had the symbol of a tree on the top, and instead of being completely circular, it had four root-like extensions growing from the tree which served to hold it firmly on the finger. It was the first time XIETIAN had seen such a strange ring, but he had to admit that the model looked quite interesting. Green Defender Ring, magic grade treasure. It was forged using branches from a powerful third-order plant-type creature several centuries ago, and it is said that part of the creature's will now resides within the ring. When equipped, it automatically increases the user's mana by plus 20 points and health by plus 15 points. In addition, one time every 24 hours you can activate the attached skill Treant Defender Summon. Treant Defender Summon, convoke the Treant Defender creature using the remaining will of its past self. The creature's power is equivalent to that of a second-order beast initial stage and possesses its own skills. The duration of the skill is 2 hours. Reading the information contained in the records of the Green Defender Ring, XIETIAN sighed. It really was an item worthy of being a magic grade treasure. In fact, it was probably one of the most powerful magic grade treasures from many points of view. At this stage of the apocalypse, probably very few humans could contend with a second-order existence, and surely all of them were either great fighters or had incredibly high luck to reach the point of being in possession of so much power. However, the oddly shaped ring in XIETIAN's hands granted its possessor the skill to summon a plant-type creature with a power equivalent to a second-order existence. Even if it was only second-order initial stage, a second-order creature was still a second-order creature. Moreover, the summoned plant-type creature would possess its own skills, which made it even more terrifying. Plant-type creatures were in some ways the most terrifying nemesis of large-scale armies. This was because many of these creatures possessed the ability to strike with long tentacle-like whips, and others could even hide their roots underground to wreak havoc in the midst of armies. Unfortunately, this ring was of little use to XIETIAN. If he were someone weaker, then he would gladly equip the Green Defender Ring immediately and jump up and down with joy. However, his power at this point was clearly beyond a normal second-order existence. In fact, the current XIETIAN even doubted that a peak second-order could defeat him even if it put up a bit of a fight. In other words, what use was it to him to summon a creature in the second-order initial stage to fight against a second-order peak or even third-order? Probably not much, since the difference between an initial second-order and a peak second-order was completely different from the difference between an initial first-order existence and a peak first-order existence. After all, to reach the absolute maximum of the first-order stage, one only needed to climb 25 levels and would immediately find oneself on the threshold of the next stage. However, from the initial second-order stage to the absolute maximum second-order stage there was a difference of 50 levels. More difference in levels equaled more difference in stats, and consequently greater was the difference in power. This would only increase more and more with each order, and there would come a point where it would basically be impossible to jump levels to fight unless one had hundreds or even thousands of stat points above one's own level. This was also the reason why existences capable of level jumping were so rare and distant from each other. As he rolled the eccentric ring between his fingers, XIETIAN thought for a moment what to do with the object. However, he didn't have to think about it too much, as he immediately decided who the future owner of the ring would be. Hadn't he previously thought that he should start looking for some defensive equipment for when he found his family in the near future? This Green Defender Ring was a good start. It will be for her. He decided as the image of a young girl 3 years younger than him flashed in his mind. Although it had only been about 6 months since he had last seen his younger sister Meng Qi, a lot had happened during the past span of time. XIETIAN felt that a lifetime had passed since the last time he hugged his loved ones, and now he regretted tremendously for taking for granted all those hugs and kisses he shared with his family in the past, believing that it was normal and would always be like that. When the effect of his stone heart skill kicked in, it was hard to get his mind back to normal. It took XIETIAN almost 10 minutes to return to his previous state of mind once he thought of those 3 people who were always in his subconscious. After putting away the Green Defender Ring inside his bag, XIETIAN picked up the 4th magical grade item and the second to last one. Top VL updates on n/o/v/lb/in.com. This item was actually a deep black bracelet with 2 thin dark purple lines that intertwined several times with each other like a string of genetic code along the length and width of the bracelet. Purple End Bracelet, magical grade treasure. It was forged using rank 2 metals and possesses some of the power of a rank 3 lightning seed. When equipped, it automatically increases the user's magic stat by plus 30 points, and one time every 6 hours you can activate the attached skill Lightning Chain. Lightning Chain, as the name of the skill suggests, it releases a chain of purple lightning and strikes all enemies within a range of 50 meters in front of the user without distinguishing between allies and enemies. The power of the attack is proportional to the user's magic stat as well as the magic attack power. Although it was not as amazing as the Green Defender Ring, the ironic reality was that the Purple End Bracelet was of more use to XIETIAN compared to the ring. After taking off the Earth Bracelet, XIETIAN equipped the Purple End Bracelet and his magic stat received a plus 20 boost, which was equivalent to 10 levels if one wanted to obtain that many status points in magic. Now there was only one magic grade treasure left, the last of the 5. XIETIAN looked at the final treasure and scratched his head in confusion. This last magic treasure turned out to be a hand mirror whose edges and back were black with pure white decorations. But the most striking thing was that this mirror was actually broken. He couldn't even see his own reflection clearly there. Still, this was the first time XIETIAN had seen such a treasure, so he somehow estimated that it should be a rarity among rarities even if it was broken. After all, it was a treasure that came out of a magic grade orb, and so far he had never been disappointed even if in the end he couldn't use the treasure or if it didn't match him. After finding no answers for himself, he finally gave up and stretched his hand forward to read the item's records. Remnant Inner Heart Mirror, magic grade treasure. This was once a great treasure that enjoyed great power and mystical abilities, however, it now only possesses a single skill, but even then it was greatly weakened. One time every 24 hours you can use the skill Inner Heart. Inner Heart, to activate the skill it is necessary to point the mirror at another entity so that their appearance is reflected in the crystal. Effect, you can discover when someone is telling you the truth or lying, but it only works on beings that are no less than one stage below you. What? Bai Zeman couldn't help but exclaim in surprise as he read the information of the artifact in his hands over and over again. However, it was clear that the records in the mirror did not change just because Bai Zeman read them several times, and they would not change no matter how many more times he read them. It really was an impressive treasure. A treasure that had the ability to tell who was lying and who was not. Even if this mirror didn't give any statistics, only its single attached skill was insanely powerful and useful. To many, this mirror may not be of much use compared to a strength-enhancing treasure, however, in Bai Zeman's eyes, it was a priceless treasure. This was because he was a faction leader. What was in the factions? By nature, every faction had traitors. But with the mirror in his hands, he could catch the traitors or would-be traitors before things got out of hand. Soon, however, he frowned as he realized a not at all minor problem. One stage below. Simply put, the difference had to be one order for the mirror effect to work on the other party. The current Bai Zeman was a first-order existence, and he would probably stay there for a good while longer. Even if his actual power was far beyond what his current stage represented, it was indisputable that he was still in the first order of the power scales. This also meant that he could not use the effect of the Inner Heart skill to know whether or not another first-order existence was lying, regardless of whether or not Bai Zeman was tremendously more powerful. However, the frown on his face soon stretched and his expression returned to normal. Even if the treasure was currently useless against other first-order existences due to Bai Zeman's own incapacity, the truth was that the number of first-order humans he had met so far were not too many. Most of the soul evolvers were still unclassified existences. Bai Zeman could use the mirror effect to clean out as many traitors as possible before they all break through, and in case he was still in the first order. Although the 24-hour cooldown time was somewhat cumbersome as it would waste many uses in case the other person had no evil thoughts, from another perspective it could also be said that the mirror would help Bai Zeman trust a little more his own subordinates who fought for him and deserved a certain level of trust. Unconsciously, Bai Zeman thought about Wu Yujun, and remembering her possible feelings for him, he felt that the mirror effect might be good to confirm it. However, he soon dismissed such thoughts. Even if he ignored the fact that Wu Yujun had already advanced to first order, Bai Zeman felt that it would be disrespectful to do such a thing. If Wu Yujun really loved him as it seemed that she did, then she would surely be hurt if he brought up something like that. Since Bai Zeman had already experienced how painful heartbreak was, he naturally did not want to make someone else suffer because of him. At least not as far as was reasonably possible. One of his life mottos was the simple but precise phrase that went like this. Don't do what you wouldn't want others to do to you. Therefore, the thought of using the mirror on Wu Yujun once he advanced to second order was only there for a second before it died as quickly as it was born. First of all, he would have to make sure to talk to her to clarify many things, and then, he needed to make his priorities clear so that she would understand that nothing would be easy. As for love. To be honest with himself, Bai Zeman was still somewhat afraid of such an emotion. Otherwise, his stone heart skill would not have been born. After he finished observing and analyzing the broken mirror, which turned out to be an awesome treasure but at the same time slightly complex to use due to Bai Zeman's own limits, he carefully put it on the nightstand next to the bed. Although he knew that destroying the treasures that appeared from the treasure orbs was not a simple task, Bai Zeman could not help but want to be careful. What if the mirror was broken even more than it already was? Wouldn't he be taking a great loss? Better safe than sorry. Eventually, Bai Zeman's eyes focused on the last treasure orb that still lay on his bed if one ignored the number of red orbs piled to the side as if they had been discarded. What a beautiful green color. He rubbed his hands together excitedly before finally picking up the orb that represented an epic grade treasure. Although Bai Zeman had killed 3 second-order existences, his luck was not as good this time and he only obtained a single green-colored treasure orb. However, he was also not dissatisfied with the result because, to be honest, Bai Zeman knew perfectly well that the battle had been much easier than he initially estimated. The Goblin army and the Goblin leaders had basically come to say goodbye to Bai Zeman, and as a farewell gift they gave him a large spoil of war. That was how things really seemed. With a firm grip, the green orb in his right hand was soon filled with cracks, and a brief moment later the sound of something similar to a glass cup breaking after falling to the floor rang out in the silent room. Flash. Green light flashed for a few seconds, forcing him to close his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened his closed eyelids again, Bai Zeman was very surprised to notice that the flash of green light slowly changed to a blue flash. But the most surprising thing was that the temperature inside the room rose abruptly and without warning. Unconsciously and with his mind on constant alert, Bai Zeman quickly jumped back as he gazed at the ball of green light that gradually became more and more navy blue. Even without him holding it, the ball of light floated more than a meter above the floor with no problem at all. About 5 seconds later, the green light had completely disappeared and the ball of light was nowhere to be seen anymore. This. What's this all about? Bai Zeman couldn't help but raise his voice as he stared wide-eyed at the object or whatever it was floating a short distance away from him. In fact, Bai Zeman knew perfectly well what this object that floated suspended above the floor as if gravity had no effect on it was. However, even he could not believe it. The reason behind his disbelief stemmed from the fact that this was by far the strangest treasure Bai Zeman obtained from a treasure orb, even many several times stranger than infinite reduction. The object was navy blue in color and its color deepened more and more as one moved away from the edges to look toward the core. It was about the size of a palm at this point, looked small, and swayed gently as it floated there. The crackling sound filled the room and the ambient temperature rose to what seemed to be the temperature of the worst summers experienced in China. In fact, Bai Zeman believed for some strange reason that this temperature could rise even higher than this. Fire? A flame. Bai Zeman wondered dumbfounded as he curiously watched the dancing flame a short distance away. Although he knew inwardly that nothing bad would happen, his wariness toward the world in general and distrust toward the unknown made Bai Zeman only dare to take one step at a time, very carefully approaching the blue-colored flame. When the distance between him and the flame closed to only 2 or 3 steps, a green message flashed across Bai Zemin's retina. Endless blue lotus flame wishes to establish a soul pact with you and become your subordinate. Do you wish to accept? Bai Zemin's expression froze when he received the message from the soul record expressing the intention of the small flame in front of him. After he finished comprehending what was happening, his expression changed and slowly became somewhat weird as he looked at the flame that was still dancing carefree through the world. This was, without a doubt, the strangest message Bai Zemin had ever received in his life if one left out the first day of the apocalypse when the soul record arrived on Earth. Even though it felt a little strange in his heart, he didn't even hesitate, so when he came out of his initial astonishment he said as if he was giving a verbal command to Siri or Alexa, accept. Of course, the soul record didn't respond as those two artificial intelligences would. Instead, what happened left Bai Zemin dumbfounded for the second time in less than a minute. Swoosh. The palm-sized blue flame suddenly shot out at full speed, and due to the surprise as well as his naturally lowered guard after receiving the message from the soul record, Bai Zemin couldn't even react. Before he knew it, the flame had struck his chest. Bai Zemin's face turned slightly pale at the thought that he had just received a fatal injury, and 1,000 thoughts flashed through his head in just an instant. Even if his health stat was high, if his chest was pierced and his heart destroyed, then even if God himself descended to this world he could not save him. However, he soon realized that he felt no pain, and as he looked down, he did not notice any bloody holes. Just when his mind was blank and with no answers, another message from the soul record flashed in his retina. In the past, it was one of the 5 most powerful flames born under the forces of the universe and carefully bred by a talented warrior to become a terrifying combat weapon. After the fall of its previous master in combat, the endless blue lotus flame refused to submit to another master, and despite the numerous efforts of countless beings to subdue or destroy it, none succeeded because, as its name suggests, the endless blue lotus flame is a limitless flame that never goes out as long as it still has soul power to consume. However, over the last 1,000 years, the soul power reserved by the endless blue lotus flame was almost entirely consumed, causing it to fall from a god-grade natural treasure to its current pitiful state, an epic-grade natural treasure. After hesitating for a long time, the barely conscious little will of the endless blue lotus flame submitted to the soul record and until now has been waiting for a new holder. Your F4 stories on /o/v/lbn.cm. Holy Mother of God. Bai Zemin shouted so loudly that he was sure his voice had been heard even to the outside of his mansion. However, how could he care about that now? At first, and while reading the extremely long message from the soul record, Bai Zemin's expression was quite calm and not too surprised. This was so even though he read that the flame he had just formed a strange pact with under the name of Soul Pact was one of the 5 most powerful flames in the universe, at least in the past. However, as he read more and more, the surprise in his heart grew to the breaking point. This breaking point was when he learned that the little palm-sized flame that had just given him the scare of his life had once been a god-grade treasure. God-grade. Holy Mother of God. At such a thought, Bai Zemin cried out again as he sat down on the bed heavily. Although he had no idea how difficult it was to obtain a god-grade treasure, there definitely shouldn't be many in the universe. According to what Lilith had once told him while she was being lazy, god-grade treasures possess the strength to challenge the most powerful beings in the universe. However, as he thought about it, Bai Zemin's excitement cooled down considerably and his face became slightly serious as he muttered, "Wait a moment. If a god-grade treasure possesses power capable of challenging the mightiest in the universe, then how did the endless blue lotus flame master fall?" After thinking about it for a long time, the only plausible answer Bai Zemin found to this terrifying question was that probably the previous master of the endless blue lotus flame had fallen prey at the hands of another being just as powerful or slightly above and possessing a god-grade treasure as well. He did not want to think beyond that because he inadvertently felt that only despair would wait ahead. Pushing the terrifying thought deep into his head, Bai Zemin finally came to the conclusion that the treasures coming from the orbs falling from the body of slain enemies were once in the past forged artifacts and even entities nurtured by another living being. Bai Zemin estimated that probably the soul record used the soul power that failed to be absorbed by the winner to move a treasure worthy of victory depending on the difference in strength and sealed it inside a treasure orb. Then, when the treasure orb was crushed by the winner, the item sealed there would come out. Now that Lilith was not there with him, his natural intelligence began to flow rapidly and his thoughts became much more fluid. After all, not having someone to depend on or rely on to know everything, Bai Zemin could only handle everything by himself. Alright, let's see what's going on with this. Bai Zemin took a deep breath before closing his eyes and focusing on the depths of his body. More precisely, on his soul. Bai Zemin's soul had no form, it was like a strange reddish-colored gas or smoke that was simply there inside his body. However, as he became stronger, he could feel how little by little that gas became denser and denser. He wondered if it would ever become liquid or even solid in the higher orders. But right in the middle of all that scarlet cloud of gas, Bai Zemin perceived a faint deep blue light flickering steadily. This faint deep blue light was the small flame with which Bai Zemin had just formed a soul pact. He knew it since after forming that strange pact he could feel the small flame inside him, and if he was calmer before he would have even realized that the small flame did not have the slightest evil intention towards him, so he would not have been panicked. Bai Zemin stretched both hands forward and said in a low voice, "Endless blue lotus flame, come out." At first, Bai Zemin wondered what was happening. Soon, however, he noticed how both his hands lit up with a faint blue flash. Slowly, a small flame of fire emerged from inside his hands, and a few moments later Bai Zemin found himself watching the small flame the size of a baby's palm gently swaying as it was floating an inch or two above his hands. His face lit up at the blue glow of the small flame. What was most surprising was that in stark contrast to the previous temperature spike, this time the temperature of the room did not change at all. As he stared at the small flame and marveled at its beautiful color, suddenly Bai Zemin's heart fluttered. For an instant he felt as if someone was watching him or trying to tell him something, but the next moment that feeling simply disappeared, making him wonder if he was going crazy. Endless blue lotus flame, epic grade treasure, a flame with sensibility and a will of its own. In the past, it was tremendously powerful and its fire represented the infinity. It is said that once an attack with endless blue lotus flame was launched, the flames would spread to the ends of the universe limitlessly and sweep away everything in its path. Its current power has been greatly weakened and the sensibility that turned this natural treasure into an intelligent entity is in deep sleep. To awaken the sensibility and enrich the will of endless blue lotus flame, the master of the flame needs to feed it with soul stones. The more soul stones and the better the quality, the clearer the effects and the faster the recovery process. Soul Pact Effect. Passively increases by +40 all the user's stats as natural points / passively increases the user's fire resistance by +20% / passively increases the power of fire type physical and magical attacks by +10%. Bai Zeman sighed as he looked at the terrifying number of stats he had received after forming a soul pact with the endless blue lotus flame. Increasing all stats by +40 points and to top it off in natural points was simply insane from his point of view. 40 points in each stat added up to a total of 240 stat points. However, another thing that Bai Zeman also liked a lot was receiving fire-type elemental resistance. With this type of resistance, his adaptability to hot environments would be a lot higher and the damage that fire-type attacks would inflict on him from here on out would be reduced by quite a considerable margin. But what terrified Bai Zeman was the +10% increase in his physical attacks with firepower and his magic spells. This might be the smallest percentage among all he was getting from the endless blue lotus flame, however, to Bai Zeman, that 10% was the most scary. This was because he, a fighter who aimed to completely overwhelm and finish off his enemies as quickly as possible, an increase of 10% in his most powerful attack to date was simply immense. Just imagining a Crimson Blood Judgment powered by gravity manipulation, plus the activation of the Mystic Earrings Magic Blast skill, plus the newly acquired 10% extra damage to fire-type attacks, and adding the power of the endless blue lotus flame on top of that. Bai Zeman gasped for air as he imagined the result in his head. He definitely couldn't use that skill so casually or he would definitely end up killing his allies. My skills. Don't they seem to be too well interconnected with each other? Bai Zeman finally realized something that he had previously not been paying much attention to. While he had been very careful and selective with the active skills he learned for obvious reasons, even he himself was surprised as everything seemed to come out too perfect. Fortunately, and this wasn't a novel or else there was sure to be a reader who would jump up shouting excitedly, "Plot armor! Plot armor!" Bai Zeman laughed at his own thoughts and then put the endless blue lotus flame back inside his body. He could feel how the little deep blue flame was practically exhausted beyond words. Next, he would feed it some soul stones to strengthen it. Talking about soul stones, Bai Zeman was really excited to know the way he could increase the power of the endless blue lotus flame. At the very least, he was aware that soul stones were the way to go and he wasn't lost having to find the right path like a headless fly. Approximately 10 minutes later, Bai Zeman had finished counting the number of soul stones and skill scrolls obtained after his goblin hunt. Of course, the soul stones that Bai Zeman counted were only a tiny fraction as far as unclassified soul stones were concerned. It was simply impossible for him to waste his time counting how many there were as there were definitely several thousand. He had only brought a few with him as it never hurt to have some on his body just in case. In the end, inside his bag were 154 unclassified soul stones, 32 first-order soul stones, and 1 second-order soul stone. Although it was a pity that 3 of the second-order goblins he had killed did not have a soul stone inside their heads, in a sense Bai Zeman already expected something like that to happen and was even prepared not to receive any second-order soul stone. As for skill scrolls, there were a few dozen of those. None of the skills caught his attention too much except for a few that made him curious but nothing more. In the end, Bai Zeman kept a few scrolls for his family such as first-order active skill Earth Shield, active skill Mortal Vines, first-order active skill Feather Walk, active skill Fireball, active skill Lightning Bolt, and several other active and passive ones. As for him, he finally got a passive skill he didn't count on until now. Speed Boost, unclassified passive skill, level 3, after learning this skill, increase agility by +20 points permanently. Surprisingly and despite being only unranked skills, the passive skills that permanently improved stats were quite difficult to obtain. As for this level 3 unranked passive skill called Speed Boost, in Bai Zeman's faction, very few people possessed it, and while he as a leader might have appropriated the scrolls, it would not look good for him to act that way in front of his subordinates. Besides, it wasn't as if Bai Zeman lacked agility at this stage of the apocalypse either, so even though he was interested in the skill, he just tolerated it. Now, he could finally learn his own without leaving room for bad emotions to take root in the hearts of his subordinates. Before I start upgrading this skill, let me check if what I saw that day is correct. Bai Zeman got up from the bed and picked up the last item he had yet to inspect. It was an ancient scroll made from what appeared to be sheepskin. Another recipe or construction blueprint. Goblin Magic Cannon, rank 3A construction blueprint for a weapon created by a talented blacksmith and artifact builder belonging to the Goblin race. The power of the Goblin Magic Cannon is enough to crush second-order existences and threaten the lives of those of the third order. To forge it you need a metal with a minimum rank of 3, magical powder, third-order soul stone. It has a range of 500 meters in a straight line and there must be a lapse of 120 seconds between each shot per barrel to avoid overheating and possible collapse of the armament. It really is. Bai Zeman nodded with a rather calm expression as he surveyed the information he had just received. This rank 3 Goblin Magic Cannon could potentially be the weapon that mankind would have to rely on in the future. Although it was still impossible to build it, possessing the construction blueprint and knowing the limits of the weapon as well as its operation was of great help in preparing the necessary things for the assembly of the weapon. Bai Zeman had many ideas in his head and he was sure that if he received the support of other brilliant minds they would definitely improve even more. Of the requirements needed to build the Goblin Magic Cannon, Bai Zeman had nothing. However, at least he had the formula to make the magic powder. Moreover, while the construction process required a metal of at least rank 3, Bai Zeman was fairly certain that even metals of rank 2 would work. Of course, the consequence would probably be the collapse of the magic cannon after one or hopefully a few shots. But even if the cannon ended up collapsing after a few shots, as long as it saved the human base it would be protecting it would be more than enough. The material loss was bearable but the annihilation of the race was not. Bai Zeman kept the construction blueprint of the Goblin Magic Cannon while in his heart he prayed that no talented blacksmith would appear in that foul goblin race that ran free in the land of his world. Although rare, it was true that there were some fantasy stories or novels in which goblins were genius artifact builders and even had some blacksmiths almost comparable to the legendary dwarves who loved the forge. After putting away the construction blueprint, Bai Zeman went straight to the log of his newly learned skill Speed Boost and looked at the evolution requirements. Evolution requirements. Speed boost unclassified level 3-level 4. Soul Stone, 2 halves. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next level? Bai Zeman did not hesitate and immediately proceeded with the evolution. A few seconds later, the evolution was complete and the speed boost skill became an unclassified skill of level 4, now granting him 30 points of agility passively. But he did not stop and continued. Speed boost unclassified level 4-level 5. Soul Stone, 6/6. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next level? Yes. Speed boost unclassified level 5- next order. Soul Stone, 12/12. First order Soul Stone, 2 halves. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next stage? Yes. The skill speed boost has successfully evolved to first order enhanced dexterity level 1. First order enhanced dexterity level 1-level 2. First order Soul Stone, 2 halves. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next level? Yes. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next level? Yes. Do you want to evolve the skill to the next level? Yes. Bai Zeman did not stop and continued to evolve the skill he had just learned until the skill now called enhanced dexterity reached the peak of the first order. The reason he had to stop there was because just like some of his main skills, enhanced dexterity required second order soul stones as an evolution requirement, and even though the current Bai Zeman had around 3 second order soul stones, he was definitely not willing to spend them right now. He would only use them if he really had no choice, as they were a priceless treasure at this stage of the apocalypse. It was also precisely for that reason that Bai Zeman's blood manipulation skill was still at level 1 of the second order. To evolve blood manipulation to second order level 2 he needed 2 second order soul stones, something he was naturally unwilling to do. At least not now. When he starts hunting second order existences to complete his breakthrough quest once he heads to another world, only then would Bai Zeman start evolving those demanding skills. In the meantime, all his skills would stay as they were, since it wasn't as if he needed to evolve them anyway, thanks to the fact that with his current power he could handle almost everything. Even if he had to face a third order enemy. In the end, the skill enhanced dexterity reached the maximum of the first order and now looked like this. Looking at the amount of first order soul stones he had left, Bai Zeman hesitated for a moment. Currently, he possessed 18 first order soul stones within his bag, as he had previously consumed quite a few to evolve the passive skill enhanced dexterity. Even so, there were about 10 soul stones stored in the faction's treasury, as there were several other first order creatures that were defeated in groups by other soul evolvers and armed men. Of course, the losses were not small but not colossal either. However, obtaining the treasure-filled corpse of such a powerhouse definitely made up for it. The reason why Bai Zeman was hesitating was because he did not know what to do next. Although first order existences were gradually beginning to appear more naturally, and although they were still a rarity, it was no longer at the level of a month ago. The first order soul stones were indeed very valuable treasures in Bai Zeman's eyes. So, he didn't know whether he should stop there or continue evolving his passive skills. Screw it, let's try one more and then stop there. He finally made up his mind and started looking carefully at his passive skills before finally stopping in one. First order bronze skin level 5, a skill that not only increased Bai Zeman's stamina but also turned his skin extremely tough and protected him from external attacks. But the real reason why Bai Zeman chose this skill was because he wanted to check something. Bronze skin first order passive skill level 5- next order. Evolution requirements. Stamina stat above 700 points without external support, complete. Soul Stone, 30/30. First order Soul Stone, 15/15. Do you wish to evolve the skill to the next stage? Bai Zeman almost spit out 2 liters of blood when he saw the evolution requirements for the bronze skin skill. To go from level 4 to level 5, the skill barely asked for 9 unclassified soul stone, and the amount of points needed in the stamina stat was 300 without external support. However, to go from level 5 to the next stage, the greedy skill actually wanted 30 unclassified soul stone, 15 first order soul stone, and more than twice as many natural stamina stat points than before. Even if the advancement between levels and orders were 2 different worlds, there should be limits to the insanity. Just as Bai Zeman was about to evolve the skill, he remembered something he had forgotten and jumped to his feet. His eyes glittered uncharacteristically as he pulled out the small pearl of liquid storage. It's not like I lose anything by trying, he muttered as he activated blood manipulation and sent a pinch of his mana to the inside of the pearl. Uptodate DFRM no/v/e/lb/i/n.c/o/m. Swoosh. 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 There were exactly 5 thin strands of blood flowing out from inside the small liquid storage pearl in Bai Zem's hands, and under the control of his second order blood manipulation skill the blood slowly accumulated until a few seconds later there were 5 balls of blood. Bai Zeman stopped drawing blood from inside the small pearl when he judged that there should be about half of a liter of blood in each floating ball. As he carefully observed the blood before him, he easily noticed that although the 5 groups of blood belonged to second order existences, the difference in quality between them was quite obvious. This blood belonged to 5 of the 7 second order existences that Bai Zeman had defeated in combat and killed. The reason why the other 2 types of blood were not there was because the blood of the second order archaic bear that had been defeated first after a fierce death fight had already been consumed by him, and the blood of the second order poisonous bloom spider had left nothing behind after being stricken by Bai Zeman's blood trident. Without further ado, Bai Zeman did not beat around the bush and slowly controlled the blood of the lowest level creature, which if he remembered correctly had the name Abil, that goblin whose upper half exploded after being hit by Bai Zeman's blazing scale greatsword. The reason he did this was because he didn't want to risk any kind of backlash, since the blood of second order existences was quite potent. By absorbing small quantities and going from the lowest level to the highest, Bai Zeman's organism would gain some resistance and his stats would be higher. Soon, the blood of the goblin level 69 named Abil rushed into his organism and began to fight wildly as if it wanted to wreak havoc inside him. Unlike that time when Bai Zeman drank the blood of the second order archaic bear, and even though the level of the goblin named Abil was higher than that of the bear, Bai Zeman did not feel so much pain as to make his face twitch as it did back then. A few minutes later, the discomfort disappeared and the information from the absorbed record in the form of a message flashed across his retina. Magic plus 32, mana and 37. For the next 60 seconds reduce the mana consumption of the skills used by 10%. Oh. Bai Zeman raised an eyebrow with surprise glittering in his eyes. The second message was something that Bai Zimin was in no way expecting but was certainly a welcome surprise. As he looked at the approximately 8 liters of blood collected from the goblin abyll, Bai Zimin felt his heart flutter lightly at the discovery of what might be a new treasure. He had just drunk approximately half a liter of blood as from previous experience he knew it was the necessary requirement to absorb most of the power contained in the blood of the defeated creature. While this worked only once, the side effect did not necessarily have to be activated only once. An idea flashed in his mind and after a moment's thought, he approached the door to his room. When he opened the door, a beautiful woman with a strikingly seductive body immediately bowed and smiled beautifully at him as she said in a polite and respectful voice. Lord, do you need anything? This person was Qin Ming, Bai Zimin's housekeeper and the first woman to stand up when he and his group took control of this village after defeating the 4 previous leaders who ruled with an iron fist and oppressed everyone while doing whatever they pleased. The current Qin Ming no longer had that burn around her mouth, a wound that had been caused by one of the 4 previous leaders of the camp due to her unwillingness to become his plaything. Under her maidservant dress, even the bruises that plagued her skin had completely disappeared after consuming first-order mutant beast meat, and her skin had become much silkier, shinier, and her overall beauty had increased by several folds. Qin Ming, look for. Bai Zimin paused for a moment as he was about to say Shang Guanbing Shui and instead said, tell someone to find Wu Yujun and tell her to come, it's important. Qin Ming's eyes flashed in a strange way and without a word she bowed and left. Seeing her go, Bai Zimin returned to his room to continue absorbing second-order blood. The reason why he preferred to call Wu Yujun instead of Shang Guanbing Shui was to avoid unnecessary trouble with some people. Besides, Wu Yujun's position was more suitable for what he was about to do. Soon, Bai Zimin absorbed 500 ml of blood belonging to the second-order explosive flame ape level 71. The current was much more powerful compared to when Abel's blood entered his body and Bai Zimin felt as if his soul was going to burn for a brief moment. Fortunately, he had gone slowly and gradually or else it could have been extremely painful to directly consume the blood of a fire-type beast without cooking it or mixing it with other foods to reduce its effect, which Bai Zimin did not want. He aimed for the maximum benefit even if he had to go through a great deal of pain, he was willing to bear it. Strength plus 24. Magic plus 25. For the next 30 seconds increase fire resistance by 15%. Bai Zimin's eyes lit up again and his lips curved slightly upward. Without saying a word, he proceeded to drink 500 ml from the female goblin whose name if he remembered correctly was Kurno. Kurno's blood was much easier to absorb. Bai Zimin didn't even frown once during the whole process and about 5 minutes later he was done. Agility plus 28. For the next 10 seconds, the chances of being sent flying by an enemy are reduced by 10%. Reduces the chance of being sent flying. Bai Zimin was startled when he read the second message. Did that mean that if he reached 100% his feet would always be steady as Mount Tai and not move at all even if a fourth-order existence were to strike? Although it sounded a bit crazy, it really seemed to be so. Of course, whether he survived the strike or not was another different matter. However, Bai Zimin was simply surprised to see a new non-trackable statistic and that was all. He was fully aware that reaching 100% in anything was no simple task. Even Lilith had pointed that out earlier when he said that his chance of causing critical hits with his attacks was steadily increasing. After drinking some of the blood of the female goblin Kurno, Bai Zimin went on to drink the blood of the second-order Ice Light Tiger level 73. The first moment the creature's blood flowed into his body, Bai Zimin felt his veins freeze slightly and his whole body shuddered. He hurriedly controlled his blood flow and as the speed increased the light mist of frost began to give way until it gradually merged with his flesh and blood. The whole process of absorption and assimilation took approximately 10 minutes. Agility plus 30. Stamina plus 30. For the next 60 seconds increase the power of light and ice type attacks by 15%. It's a pity to waste the temporary power increase, but I really need the stats. Bai Zimin lamented quietly. Moreover, seeing the plus 30 stamina, a satisfied smile appeared on his face. One of his stats had finally broken the 1000 point mark. Just as he expected, a message from the soul record flashed across his retina. However, before he could focus on it, the door of his room was knocked softly followed by Qin Ming's voice. Lord, Miss Wu Yujun is here. Approximately 20 minutes had passed since Bai Zimin gave the instruction for someone to bring Wu Yujun and considering that the two's villas were not that far apart, he judged that she was probably busy with something important. Without thinking too much about it, he calmly said, let her pass. The door of his room opened smoothly as those words left his mouth and a moment later it closed again. This was the first time Wu Yujun had entered Bai Zimin's room and as she looked around she noticed that while it was somewhat messy due to the number of soul stones, treasure orbs, and other things on the bed, the room in general smelled extremely good. It was a smell she knew and longed for very much. Realizing this, she blushed slightly, and realizing that she was alone in his room, she blushed even more. Her mind went a little crazy and she had to try very hard not to let two wild thoughts pop into her imagination. While it wasn't the first time she had been in a room alone with Bai Zimin, it was the first time they had been alone together since she had become fully aware of her feelings. As if that wasn't enough, a bed was there. Wu Yujun felt as if her heart tried to burst out of her chest and for a brief moment she even wondered if the man sitting on the bed could hear it beating. Since she finally came to accept and notice that she was in love with the man in front of her, an emotion she felt for the first time in her life, Wu Yujun felt that being in front of Bai Zimin was a lot harder than it normally should be. Ironically, even though she felt a little shy and embarrassed, she didn't want to stay away from him either, on the contrary, the longer and closer, the better. Just as she was about to say something to break the silence and to avoid Bai Zimin realizing that she was so nervous she didn't know what to do, his voice rang softly in the middle of the room. Sit wherever you please, I'll be with you in a couple of minutes. Just let me finish with this first. Wu Yujun finally realized that Bai Zimin had not looked at her yet. However, she also realized the reason why he was so focused on something else. In front of him were 5 different clumps of blood, 2 of them were much larger in size than the other 4 which were barely a few thin drops that probably didn't reach 100 ml. The floating blood did not draw Wu Yujun's attention too much as everyone in the faction was aware that Bai Zimin was in possession of a powerful skill that allowed him to control such an element and manipulate it practically at will. What caught her attention was the power that radiated from within and around the blood. Even she, who was a first-order existence, felt slight threat even though it was only blood. Wu Yujun was an intelligent woman, so she naturally came to the conclusion that this danger she felt did not come from the blood itself but from the creature to which that blood belonged in the past. As she wondered if that was the blood belonging to a powerful second-order beast similar to that terrifying bear they met in the forest, she watched as Bai Zimin controlled one of the two larger blood globes and slowly swallowed it. Bai Zimin closed his eyes and frowned slightly. When the blood of the goblin named Anak, whose level while alive was 74, he felt as if his flesh was being pierced by countless needles. If it wasn't for the fact that he had experienced pains that were a lot greater than this, to the point where his skin and flesh burned and to the point where his bones were crushed to dust, Bai Zimin knew that he would definitely be rolling around on the bed while screaming in pain. Wu Yujun became somewhat anxious as the minutes passed and she watched the frown on Bai Zimin's face deepen little by little. Moreover, occasionally she could see the skin on his arms, hands, face, and probably every part of his body tingle as if there was some mysterious creature tugging at his flesh inside. About 10 minutes later, Bai Zimin finally opened his eyes again and exhaled, letting the heavy air in his lungs out and relieving him greatly. Agility plus 30. Stamina plus 15. For the next 20 seconds, increase the probability of inflicting critical hits on your enemies by 5%. Without saying a word, Bai Zimin looked at Geminder's blood and after a moment he used blood manipulation to slowly make the blood glob go into his mouth in the form of liquid threads. Geminder's level was 87, considerably close to third order. At the very least, Geminder was by far the closest enemy to level 100 that Bai Zimin had met and faced to date. Ironically, he was also one of the easiest enemies to defeat despite being the most powerful of them all. This was because by the time Geminder appeared before him, Bai Zimin already possessed stats comparable to those of a peak second order, and by the time Geminder angered him through threatening his loved ones, Bai Zimin acquired another 400 strength points after activating the first level of the skill Blood Berserker's Wrath unlocked at that time. Humans possess the ability to create atomic bombs but cannot withstand their explosions. The reasoning behind Bai Zimin not being able to consume Geminder's blood so easily despite defeating him so easily was very similar to the previous reasoning. When the blood of the former most powerful and highest goblin leader of the northern region of China entered Bai Zimin's body, he immediately felt as if a 2,000-kilogram hammer had hit him directly on the head. For a moment, he felt like his world was spinning around him and he almost fell on his back on the bed. Then, his flesh seemed to tear apart only to regenerate once again in the next instant. His muscle fibers seemed to break into pieces countless times at the same time, regenerating over and over again. This whole process lasted a total of 20 minutes. During the past 20 minutes, Wu Yujun could only stare as Bai Zimin's face turned red and his eyes grew to the point of looking quite terrifying. It was obvious from the way he was gritting his teeth that the pain he felt threatened to drive him out of his senses. She felt anxious whether sitting or standing, as if she were a little girl arriving at elementary school for the first time leaving her parents at home. However, for the past 20 minutes, Bai Zimin's mouth remained closed at all times, not even the slightest grunt slipped from his lips. His show of tenacity greatly surprised the only woman in the room. Not only did this make her care for him more, but she also unconsciously felt that this was how a real man should be. She didn't want him to suffer, but at the same time, she felt that his masculine charm increased dramatically. Bai Zimin was completely different from those men who had approached her in the past. All those young men from prominent families, wealthy, or multi-talented, they were all women in men's skin who, if they were in the man's place before her, would definitely be calling out the name of their mothers, fathers, grandparents, and the entire generation of their ancestors. After the hell finally ended, Bai Zimin slowly sat back down and when he looked at himself he realized that he was drenched in sweat. It was worse than I expected, he said with a bitter smile. He really didn't expect to experience so much pain in return for so few stats. Strength plus 40. Stamina plus 40. For the next 120 seconds increase physical attack power by plus 200. 80 stat points. If 90% of the living, self-aware beings in the universe who were struggling hard to level up for 2 stat points heard what Bai Zimin had just said, they would probably curse him and those who brought him into this world for being so shameless. Really, the most effective way is to absorb soul power from other existences. Bai Zimin thought as he sighed and ruffled his somewhat humid hair. While one could obtain stats once by absorbing second-order blood before the body became immune, the pain in some cases was too great to receive a rather miserable compensation compared to the large amount of extra stats that could be obtained by absorbing soul power. Still, a boost of power was always welcome and Bai Zimin was willing to experience the same pain multiplied several times over just for the sake of getting even a fraction of what he had just received. That's how desperate for power he was. Hey, are you okay? A soft voice brought them out of their inner thoughts and as he looked to his right he remembered Wu Yujun was there. Sorry. I was so focused on absorbing this blood that I couldn't pay attention to you properly earlier. Bai Zimin apologized with a somewhat awkward smile as he looked at the woman sitting on the couch by the window. Wu Yujun was wearing a pretty refreshing violet summer dress with ruffles that flowed down to just above her knees, covering her thighs but exposing her beautiful calves and shiny skin. Most eye-catching was that her hair was pulled back in a high ponytail and this in tandem with her baby face but an extremely hot body made her look extremely charming and seductive. It's okay. Don't worry about it. She hurriedly shook her head. Seeing her ponytail bouncing wildly along with her movements, Bai Zimin chuckled as he calmly said, "Give me 2 minutes, I'll be with you after checking a new record." Oh okay. Wu Yujun nodded as she kept her stare focused on him and his movements. Bai Zimin forced a smile into his heart and shook his head secretly as he saw this. Soon, he looked at a fixed point before him and began to roll through his records, easily finding what he was looking for as it had just happened. Your stamina stat has broken the 4-digit threshold without external support. Your skill First Order Bronze Skin level 5 evolves forcibly to the next stage. Bronze Skin, First Order Passive Skill, level 5 - Silver Skin, Second Order Passive Skill, level 1. Silver Skin, Second Order Passive Skill, level 1, your skin becomes tough and strong enough to withstand large caliber bullets. Rank 0 physical weapons will not be able to penetrate your defense and the effect of rank 1 physical weapons is reduced by 10% against you. The strength of your internal organs is multiplied twice compared to the previous level. Automatically increases your stamina stat by plus 300 points permanently. A big smile lit up Bai Zimin's handsome face when he saw and verified that things did indeed turn out as he estimated. Although he didn't know that such a crazy increase was required to force a skill to evolve forcefully, he was at least fully aware that such a thing would probably happen at some point. If his body met the stat requirement and even exceeded that requirement, then the soul record had no need to use the power contained within the soul stones, it could simply use the stamina-type soul power that far exceeded the limit of X's rune to force it to evolve and adapt to the body. Because he had been carefully studying and learning about the soul record, Bai Zimin managed to save a large number of unclassified soul stones, and more importantly, first-order soul stones. While this was only possible because he was a beast with human skin, at least his previous theory turned out to be quite accurate with only a few minor but inconsequential differences. In addition to strengthening his body from the outside, the skill Silver Skin also strengthened Bai Zimin's internal organs to twice what they were before. This was an extremely good thing since his internal organs were stronger, and shock from blows would not hurt him internally as much compared to the past. In addition, his skin became softer and more delicate, which without neglecting the overall masculine look gave him a far more radiant appearance, briefly dazzling Wu Yuzhen as she observed all these changes from up close. I'm sorry for keeping you waiting around here. Bai Zimin finally shifted his eyes back to Wu Yuzhen and looked at her with an apologetic smile. This was not the time to dive into deep thoughts or analyze too many things. Don't worry. Wu Yuzhen also smiled to see him that, despite the pain he had just experienced, it seemed to have been worth it as he had a smile bright as the sun on his face. So, about the reason why I called you here. Bai Zimin didn't beat around the bush and got straight to the point. Why yes. Tell me. Wu Yuzhen became a little nervous and her heartbeat was disturbed. For an instant, she thought that maybe he wanted to talk to her about what happened 4 days ago and that was why he had called her here. Of course, Bai Zimin wasn't planning to do anything like that. At least not now. V said no, V, 3LB/N, CM for new OVL. Instead, what he said was the following. Do we have anyone capable of making potions or similar brews? Do we have anyone capable of making potions or brews like that? After those words left Bai Zimin's mouth, he fell silent and looked at Wu Yuzhen as he waited for a response from her. However, even after several seconds, the room remained silent as neither of them said a word. Just as Bai Zimin was about to ask if something was wrong, she said with wide eyes, excuse me? Potions or brews? Yes, potions or similar brews. Bai Zimin repeated, somewhat confused by the surprise expressed by the beautiful girl in front of him, and patiently explained, just like in role-playing games and the like, magic potions with amazing effects, brews capable of assisting the consumer in combat, stuff like that. And no. I do understand what you mean by potions or brews. It may not seem like it, but I also played a few games in my life, so I am aware of the similarity of our status window to that of a video game character. Wu Yuzhen shook her head gently, and seeing that Bai Zimin didn't seem to be joking, she said somewhat puzzled, but even if our faction had someone capable of doing such stuff, how are we supposed to craft a benign potion and not a poisonous one? Even though our botany team has already studied roughly 100 mutant plants, it's still not enough to create something so mage-like. Besides, Wu Yuzhen seemed to have more to say, but Bai Zimin raised a hand to indicate her to stop for a moment, something she obediently did while nodding in a sweet and cute manner towards him. I understand what you mean. Bai Zimin said calmly before adding, however, the potions I'm talking about shouldn't be that complicated to make, since investigators won't have to go around experimenting with different combinations or testing the effects. I don't get it. Wu Yuzhen shook her head as her shoulders slumped in defeat. Bai Zimin knew that it was not easy to explain what he had in mind with words, so instead of wasting time he sent several drops of blood floating towards Wu Yuzhen. That blood belonged in the past to a second-order existence I defeated not long ago. Bai Zimin explained as he pointed with his right hand, if you drink it, you will understand what I mean. Wu Yuzhen looked at the blood in front of her curiously before opening her mouth slightly. Her full red lips parted slightly, and under Bai Zimin's control, the red blood gently fell onto her small pink tongue. This was not the first time Wu Yuzhen tasted second-order blood. She had consumed the blood of the second-order archaic bear when she finally evolved to first order. While the number of statistics and benefits she obtained was not that great, as she was barely able to drink around 50 drops before she had to stop due to her own mortal body's incompetence, it was enough for her to know for sure how precious that blood was. At the same time that she knew that second-order blood was a treasure, Wu Yuzhen was also aware of the pain and inconvenience one must experience. However, for the sake of becoming more powerful, she was willing to do practically anything. Not only did she want to become stronger for herself and her family, she now had another goal to fight and strive for. Wu Yuzhen gritted her pearly teeth as she felt as if her body was going to explode at any moment. Despite the wrenching pain, her black eyes were incredibly steady as she looked at the man sitting a few feet away. As Bai Zimin looked into her eyes without averting his eyes and his black eyes met her black eyes, he could not deny that he was secretly shocked when he noticed the girl's resolve before him. Wu Yuzhen had lived a cosset life since birth. She had probably never experienced real physical pain other than a few scratches, and even the apocalypse did not change this, as so far she had never been in a battle even remotely close to the battles he or Shangguan Bingshui had previously faced. However, she endured. She did not even let a sound escape from her mouth, even though her body was shivering uncontrollably as if she was a small boat in the middle of a raging sea. Even if the blood Bai Zimin was giving her was the blood of that female goblin named Kurino, since despite its higher level it was much lighter than the blood of the goblin named Abil, Wu Yuzhen's stats were not monstrously high as Bai Zimin's were. They were both two completely different beings inside, even though they were both humans born in the same world. Therefore, Wu Yuzhen was currently suffering pain that should be intolerable for a little princess like she had been all her life. However, she endured like a true queen. Approximately 10 minutes later, Wu Yuzhen's body finally stopped shivering and she received 2 messages in her retina. Agility +8. For the next 10 seconds, the chances of being sent flying by an enemy are reduced by 10%. Wu Yuzhen gasped at the second message. She could clearly feel her body becoming firmer than before, just like a mountain that could not be knocked down by normal forces. After 10 seconds, that strange sensation disappeared, awakening her from her shock. She raised her head, and even though some small beads of sweat were falling down her face, she still looked incredibly beautiful as she said with a smile, "Now I finally understand what you were talking about before." Bai Zimin just stared at her without saying anything for a couple of seconds. No one knew what he was thinking. Seeing him silent and looking at her so intently, Wu Yuzhen again felt anxious and inadvertently started playing with her hands. What's wrong? She asked almost in a whisper small enough that had it not been for the silence of the villa it might not have reached the desired ears. It's nothing. Bai Zimin shook his head and said slowly, I simply wanted to compliment your courage. Not only did you just unhesitatingly take something I gave you even though we've barely known each other for less than 2 months, but you even endured the pain like a true female warrior even though your whole life was probably smooth and prickle-free. I think such an attitude is worthy of praise. Bai Zimin was being really honest here. A person who ran every day might be able to run 20 kilometers without rest, but a person who had never practiced sports or stamina exercises would definitely fall down a lot sooner. What Wu Yujun had done had really surprised him a little. Wu Yujun smiled gently at the honest tone from him and said quietly, well, I think you will always get somewhere if you walk far enough. You will always get somewhere if you walk far enough. That's an interesting way of looking at life and saying never give up. Bai Zimin closed his eyes for a second and smiled as that phrase was imprinted in his heart. My grandfather always said I should never give up once I set a goal. Wu Yujun looked at Bai Zimin with steady eyes and said with a smile a hint unusual, who knows, if I give up I might regret it the next second. Because maybe, at the next second I will get what I want and what I fought so hard for. Wouldn't it be a pity then? Bai Zimin was slightly dumbfounded at her words. The next instant, however, he forced a bitter smile into his heart. How could he not understand what she was figuratively saying to him? V said no, V, 3LB/N, CM for new OVL. I think that your grandfather is quite an optimistic person. In the end, he could only say that. Wu Yujun smiled sweetly and her eyebrows curved into a crescent shape, looking extremely cute. So, regarding the records you just absorbed. Bai Zimin took the opportunity to slide the topic to what really mattered to him and said matter-of-factly, can you read the second message to me? Of course I can, just give me a second. Wu Yujun also did not continue with the previous topic. She believed that when things had to happen they would definitely happen. Another phrase her grandfather always told her was, not before, not after, everything comes when it has to come. After hearing that Wu Yujun also received the same bonus as him and its duration had not been shortened at all while the potency of the effect also stayed intact, Bai Zimin was surprised. She had absorbed far less blood than he had. When he brought this up to Wu Yujun she was also surprised. However, she soon seemed to understand something and said somewhat uncertainly, isn't it? Isn't it that the effect is always the same regardless of whether it's 1 drop or 2 liters? Yet. I was also thinking the same thing just now. Bai Zimin nodded. Since that was the case, then everything was easier. I was thinking of using this blood and dissolving it in water. Bai Zimin explained his thoughts to Wu Yujun slowly. My idea is to use just about 1 drop of blood and dissolve it in small 500 ml bottles. If the side effect works well, then we can try dissolving 1 drop of blood in a 1 liter bottle, and so on until the effect no longer works. When the effect stops working we will simply use the option before failure. Wu Yujun's eyes lit up when she heard his idea. That's a really great idea. If only 1 drop of second order can be dissolved in a 500 ml bottle, then we can find or make small containers of about 50 ml and give 1 to each soul evolver before going into battle. That way, a single drop of blood will be enough to form 10 brews which is equivalent to 10 soul evolvers boosted. And if a single drop of blood can be dissolved in a larger amount of water, then the result will be even more brilliant. This time it was Bai Zimin's turn for his eyes to light up. He had not thought about what she had just said, but after thinking about it for a moment, he realized that Wu Yujun's words were indeed true. After all, how much liquid could a person drink? It wasn't as if a normal human could swallow 500 ml of water in 1 gulp anyway. Since the effect was activated by swallowing the blood and assimilating it, a large amount wasn't necessary. Look at this. Bai Zimin drew out a few more drops of blood and sent them floating gently towards Wu Yujun for her to consume one by one. Approximately 40 minutes later, Wu Yujun had received several stat points. Although she was only able to consume only a few drops of blood and barely a single drop of Geminder's blood due to the abysmal power difference between the two, she was satisfied with the result. My god. 6 different effects, which is equivalent to creating 6 brews capable of empowering our troops on the battlefield. Wu Yujun covered her mouth with both hands as her eyes flashed with disbelief. She was fully aware that while it seemed that effects that barely increased X stats by 5% or 10% was little, in a battle between beings with equal or similar power, that difference would mark the victory and decide who would live or who would die. Second-order blood information should be kept as a highly classified secret. Make sure the entire investigation team knows the consequences of opening their mouths. As much as possible that all of them have family. Bai Zimin looked at Wu Yujun and his eyes flashed with a hint of imperceptible coldness. Don't worry, I understand. I know what to do. Wu Yujun said nodding towards him. She naturally was no fool, she understood the importance of this matter. Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun talked for more than 2 hours about the matter of potions and brews. While the foundation of the main matter had already been settled, there were still many details that needed to be discussed in greater depth. After all, this was by no means a small matter. The matter of potions and brews could decide the future of the faction, it was no exaggeration to say that the survival of many was tied to this. Nor was it an exaggeration to say that a single potion could save the life of a soul evolver as, for example, the critical hit effect was activated in the midst of desperate combat, the tables of battle would turn immediately. Even for Bai Zimin himself, regardless of his personal strength, the boost he could get from potions and brews was important to the point of being completely impossible to ignore. Even more so considering that his stats were higher and higher stats represented a higher percentage when it came to being boosted by the potion or brew consumed. In the end, Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun came to the conclusion that it was better to allow a small portion of the second order's blood to be saved instead of being used to dissolve in water. In this way, the botanical team and the team of investigators that the faction was nurturing would be able to use a small part of the blood to test the effect it would have with different herbs. Who knows, in the future, there could be mana recovery potions, stamina recovery potions, potions that would speed up wounds recovery, and so on. The possibilities were almost limitless, limiting themselves only to what they already knew for fear of the unknown was definitely not the way to go, at least, it wasn't if they wanted to go far. Before Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun knew it, the sun slowly began to settle on the distant horizon. The view from Bai Zimin's room on the top floor of his personal villa was splendid, to say the least. The sky devoid of grey clouds was tinged crimson-red with hints of orange in the immediate vicinity as the sun slowly set to signal the end of a day and the fall of a new night. As Bai Zimin looked out at the outside world with a steady glance, hundreds of thoughts flashed through his mind at practically the same time. From the moment his eyes opened to the moment they closed again during a few insignificant hours of sleep, his mind was in constant turmoil, so the fatigue he felt was unimaginable to many. Am I doing it right? Could I do it better? How can I make everyone stronger faster? Should I start destroying the settlements of other powers without trying to be so merciful? Such thoughts were always alive inside him without anyone knowing, without anyone realizing that beneath his firm and confident appearance was actually a young man who in many senses of the word was a first-timer. As Wu Yujun secretly looked at the face of the man beside her illuminated by the crimson sunset, she could not help but let her eyes moisten slightly. The erratic beating of her heart surprisingly calmed down and her breathing turned steady and smooth enough for anyone to think that she had fallen asleep. When was the last time she felt so peaceful? So peaceful to the point where she could stay inside this room without moving for an eternity of time. Although Wu Yujun was a strong and considerably independent woman because her family's upbringing required it in order to survive in the political world, at the end of the day, she was a 23-year-old young woman. At such an age she should be enjoying her best days at university, making new friends, meeting new people, committing mistakes, and learning from them. She should be enjoying this time, a time when she was like a flower at its most beautiful and brightest point in life. However, everything had changed. That quiet and seemingly bright life that was promised to her was taken from her hands even before she realized it. As they both stood in silence with thoughts that shared some similarities with each other but at the same time were intrinsically different, time passed. A few minutes later, as her gaze was lost in the horizon and her dark eyes lit up at the beautiful sight in front of her, Wu Yujun said almost in a whisper. If you were given the choice to choose to go back to your previous life, just before everything changed, would you be willing to go in reverse? V said no, V, 3LB/N. CM for new OVL. Bai Zimin did not look at her, as his indifferent eyes that made it difficult for people to understand the depths of his soul gazed into the distance. He thought about what the beauty beside him had just asked him and easily came to a conclusion. If I were given the choice to choose to go back, to have everything returned to how it was before this entity called Soul Record reached our world and be assured that my life and the lives of my loved ones would never again be dragged into a hell like the one we are living in at this very moment, then why wouldn't I do it? Wu Yujun was surprised to hear his response, but when she turned her face slightly to look at him and realized that he didn't seem to be joking about his decision, she couldn't help but ask. Even if it means losing all the power you've gained so far after fighting countless battles to deaths? Even if going back and making everything return to normal means going back to being just a normal citizen with no power over anyone? I'm sorry. I don't mean to offend you. She hastily apologized, realizing that her words could easily be misinterpreted. Bai Zimin smiled slightly and shook his head as he said, your words do not offend me in any way. For me, being just a normal citizen with no power is nothing to be ashamed of at all. On the contrary, I believe that normal citizens have more qualifications to be proud of themselves compared to those wealthy or powerful families. Because different of them, we, the poor and normal people, achieved everything by our own efforts while they remain mommy's and daddy's children until the end of their days. Wu Yujun was plunged into deep thoughts as she listened to what Bai Zimin had just said and, to her surprise, she realized that he was right. Wasn't she, a grown woman, still being cared for and supported by her family? Even her future work would probably be influenced by her family. She blushed slightly, feeling for the first time in her life truly ashamed. It was only then that she understood the reason why Bai Zimin never felt beneath anyone despite his normal birth. Still, she couldn't help but say. But, losing all your power, are you sure you would be willing to let go it so easily? Wu Yujun found that hard to believe. After all, humans were greedy and ambitious creatures by nature. It was extremely rare and close to impossible to find a truly pure and conformist soul, capable of being happy with little. Many might say otherwise, but the truth of life was that one could not live off love and affection. Money and power had the capacity to move mountains, let alone to move the human heart. Unfortunately, Wu Yujun was wrong. She clearly did not know Bai Zimin at all. The reason why I fight and the real reason why I am extremely fierce and tenacious against my enemies but also myself is all due to my family. Bai Zimin said in a deep voice as he gazed into the distance with unwavering eyes. Each and every step I have taken since the first day this world became the hell it is today, always and without exception, has been expressly to secure the future of those I love and will love. You and many others may see me as a godlike existence at this moment, but that is only because so far I have always managed to overcome every obstacle that has crossed my path. But only I know that in this great universe, my existence is more insignificant than a grain of sand in the middle of the ocean. Although Bai Zimin's voice sounded indifferent and seemed as if he was recounting something insignificant, Wu Yujun could faintly notice the pain, regret, and self-shame he felt. What kind of burdens was weighing him down? What were those secrets that he hid deep in his heart so that no one would see them for fear of being hurt? Wu Yujun had countless questions she wanted to ask the young man at her side, but when she heard his next words they stuck in her throat. Because in the past I was weak, I could not protect the past of those I loved. Because today I am weak, I cannot protect the present of those I love. Bai Zimin said with self-reproach. His eyes flashed with resolution and his voice was filled with murderous intent as he said, but that will not be like this forever. There will come a day when I will be strong enough to protect the future of those I love. And from then on, I will take care of their future presence. Wu Yujun felt her heart squeeze slightly as she felt Bai Zimin's self-disdain and self-reproach in his voice. He was the man most acclaimed by countless women within the faction, he was the most powerful person everyone had ever known, a being with the ability to make the heavens rumble and the earth tremble, but that same man seemed to have a very low opinion of himself. In fact, Bai Zimin did not consider himself a genius as Lilith always said. What was the use of being a genius? At the end of the day, being an amazing talent did not change the fact that he was weak, it did not change the fact that because of his own incompetence those he loved had to experience so much suffering and would probably experience many more even if he tried his best to prevent it. The only thing that others saw were his positive or negative points, his good deeds or his bad deeds. But everyone seemed to forget that he was also a human. Still, Wu Yuzhen couldn't help but say in a choked voice. Aren't you being too hard with yourself? You have already done and are doing an excellent job. You've done it better than anyone else because I don't think anyone could have done it better than you. I think you should be a little proud of yourself. Bai Zimin looked at her for a second and smiled bitterly as he shook his head. Proud? Of course, Bai Zimin was very proud of himself. He was always a proud existence, and this was not so just because he had recently acquired a bit of power that in the eyes of the truly strong was insignificant. However, Wu Yuzhen still continued to fail to comprehend it. As he looked into her eyes, he noticed real concern in her stare. That beautiful pair of dark eyes were moist with small beads of tears that seemed barely contained and on the verge of falling. In a moment of impulse and believing that at the very least, she deserved to know about the condition of his heart, Bai Zimin extended his right hand toward her. I think once you see this you will understand. And I also believe that once you see my heart, you will be able to make a better decision about what to do with your own heart. His heart? Wu Yuzhen looked at his outstretched palm and then looked at his face again. Seeing that smile that contained a hint of helplessness, bitterness, but at the same time gratitude, she finally understood. She finally understood that perhaps, the existence called Bai Zimin knew and thus carried burdens that neither she, nor Shangguan Bingshuat, nor any other woman could ever understand. Perhaps only a true goddess of heaven could possibly understand. She thought as she reached out her delicate hand towards his. Slowly, as if afraid of something, Wu Yuzhen watched as her small hand moved closer and closer to Bai Zimin's comparatively larger hand. Bai Zimin, on the other hand, was a lot calmer than she was. As he looked into her eyes he noticed uncertainty, revealing that the beautiful woman at his side was afraid of discovering or not being able to understand what he wanted to show her. But he believed that once she viewed the effects of his stone heart skill, she would come to understand that getting into his heart could very well be classified as impossible. No, not impossible, Bai Zimin thought as in his head appeared for the 1000th time the shadow of the most beautiful woman he had ever seen in his entire life and whose smile was so dazzling as to oppress the rays of the sun. As the image of Lilith appeared in his head and in his heart, as he secretly wondered what she could be doing and if she was doing well, Wu Yuzhen's hand finally touched his. Then, let her see. Let her see and decide for herself. Bai Zimin immediately started moving through his records and skills. When he found the record of the skill 3rd Order Stone Heart, he wanted to share that record with Wu Yuzhen and let her see that tiny part of his soul. However, what happened next perplexed them both. As if they had been electrocuted by an electric shock of several thousand volts, Bai Zimin's and Wu Yuzhen's faces changed at the same time as they hurriedly pulled their hands apart as a reflex action. Ugh! Wu Yuzhen grimaced slightly as she used her trembling hand to tightly clutch her chest. Bai Zimin wasn't much better off than her either, as he also felt a sharp pain that was hard to describe. While he didn't complain as she did due to his much higher pain tolerance, that didn't stop the pain that made him feel as if someone had replaced the blood running through his veins with burning lava from scaring him. It was as if his soul were burning him from the inside out. When he finally felt himself regaining the breath that had been abruptly stolen from him, he looked at Wu Yuzhen and asked worriedly, "Are you all right?" Wu Yuzhen could not respond immediately as it was still extremely difficult for her to breathe. It was the first time in her life that she had experienced pain of such magnitude, to the level where even breathing caused her pain. The pain she felt while absorbing the various drops of second-order blood was nothing compared to this. Bai Zimin hastily supported her and carefully let her lie down on his bed. He waited for a couple of seconds but just as a precaution decided to go find Kong Lan. "I am fine." Just as he was thinking of leaving to look for the strongest healer of his faction, Wu Yuzhen finally found enough breath to utter a few words. "Are you sure?" he asked with a slight frown. Wu Yuzhen did not respond immediately and instead took several deep breaths. A few seconds after repeating the same process several times, her pale face immediately began to return to normal and about a minute later she finally reverted to her optimal condition. "I'm really fine now. I really am. Don't worry." Wu Yuzhen smiled warmly as she could feel genuine concern from him toward her. She felt that even if she had to experience the same thing several more times, she would be willing to multiply it a couple of times even if it was worth a gentle look like the one he had at this moment as he looked at her. Love was undoubtedly one of the most powerful emotions that existed. A double-edged sword that could lift one to the top or plunge one to the bottom of an abyss, and at the same time an emotion that could affect the rationality of the most string person in the world in just a second. Wu Yuzhen, who was always rational but was experiencing such a powerful emotion for the first time in her life, was a clear example of this. Bai Zimin had no idea of the inner thoughts of the beauty on his bed. In fact, he had no time to think about it. Right now, his preoccupation was with what had just happened a minute or two ago. What on earth had just happened? Bai Zimin had an extremely deep frown on his face as his doubt-filled eyes stared at a fixed point in search of answers. If Lilith were present, he might be able to get the answers he was looking for. But with her so far away and somewhere unknown in the vast universe, it was absolutely impossible for him to know what had just happened. What was that shock earlier? Why did something like that happen? Bai Zimin was completely clueless. In the past, he had shared his records with Lilith on many occasions, and yet nothing even remotely similar to what had just happened when he tried to do the same with Wu Yuzhen ever occurred. Visit novelbin.c/m for the L-test updates. Just now, you wanted to show me a record of your soul, didn't you? Wu Yuzhen's voice brought him back to reality, and when he raised his head to look at her he nodded as he said in puzzlement. Yes. A skill to be specific. No wonder for an instant I felt as if part of your soul joined with mine. Wu Yuzhen nodded with a "so that's how it is" expression on her face. Then she smiled sweetly and said in a soft voice, "Even though it only lasted an instant, I clearly felt as if that part of your soul wanted to embrace mine." Bai Zimin was not surprised by this, as every time he shared his records with Lilith he felt something similar. Although it was not as exaggerated as Wu Yuzhen described, the feeling was somewhat similar. Seeing his still confused expression, and even though Wu Yuzhen herself had doubts as to how Bai Zimin had learned to do something like this, and more so, how he had such knowledge, she instead said calmly. "Don't overthink it. It's probably because your soul is much stronger than mine, so as security, my soul didn't accept your records temporarily moving to me." After listening to her words and analyzing them for a moment, the frown on Bai Zimin's face gradually began to recede. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that what Wu Yuzhen had just said made sense. Therefore, a few seconds later, his expression returned to normal. I think you're right. Bai Zimin sighed and sat down heavily on his bed, letting his body bounce gently due to the springs. You seem quite surprised by what just happened. Wu Yuzhen couldn't help but point out with slight suspicion, could it be that you've already done this in the past? Bai Zimin knew that there were some strange things about what had just happened and that trying to hide it would only do more harm than good, so he said half-heartedly, yes, I have done something similar in the past as an experiment. Wu Yuzhen looked at him unable to detect lies in his clear eyes, so she finally shrugged her shoulders. Okay, I've taken up a lot of your time for today. Bai Zimin stretched his hand forward and chuckled as he jokingly said, don't worry, it won't hurt this time. Even if I were to burn alive in hell I would still take your hand. Wu Yuzhen said as she looked into his eyes with a slight blush on her lovely face, taking his hand an instant after. You. Bai Zimin used a bit of strength to help her stand up gently and sighed as he heard her words. What? It's not like you don't know anyway. Wu Yuzhen stuck out the tip of her tongue playfully before saying, there's no point in hiding it when it's too glaringly obvious. Realizing that it wasn't possible to avoid the point and at the same time feeling that it wasn't right to keep a good woman like her on hold for something that had little chance of happening, Bai Zimin finally decided to broach the matter. Look. Sit here, let's have a little chat. I think it's necessary for you to know a few things. Bai Zimin sat on the edge of the bed again and carefully patted the place beside him. Since he could not show her his stone heart skill, then there was no choice but to explain things slowly and in words so that the girl next to him would understand and would have a better idea of what she was dealing with. Only then she could decide more wisely what she wanted to do and if the effort was worth it or not. Wu Yuzhen felt her heart begin to pound as she saw the complicated look Bai Zimin was giving her as he looked at her. Although she had been waiting for this moment, now that the time had finally come she couldn't help but feel apprehensive. Bai Zimin seemed to understand her fears for as he saw her hesitating on whether to sit next to him or flee the room. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he said in a helpless voice, don't overthink it, I will simply tell you a few things about my past and about me. I'll also explain one or two things you need to know, that's all. Oh okay. Wu Yuzhen nodded, finally gathering courage and letting the weight of her light body rest gently on the elegant mattress. Bai Zimin didn't even feel the bed sink as she rested beside him, that's how light the woman next to him was. Neither of them said anything at first, but Bai Zimin knew perfectly well that he had to be the one to start the conversation. Therefore, after thinking a bit about what he wanted to say, he slowly stated. To be honest with you, I still find it kinda hard to believe that a girl like you has feelings for me. I know that the world has changed, I also know that if I were my past you would probably never develop emotions for the Bai Zimin of that time. In this span of almost 2 months, less than 60 days of time, my personality took a tremendous turn. And believe me when I tell you that if you knew me before the apocalypse you would definitely not be able to associate me with my current self. Taking advantage of the brief moment of silence he decided to take, Wu Yuzhen asked. Would you mind telling me about your past? Bai Zimin turned his head slightly and looked at her with a small smile as he nodded, That's what I plan to do. I want you to understand who I once was and the biggest reason why I am who I am today. Wu Yuzhen nodded silently and took a deep breath. The palms of her hands began to sweat as a sign of how nervous she was, nerves and anxiety slowly growing due to the uncertainty and waiting. You see, as you may have already noticed, I don't have much experience with girls. Sure, even though my physical appearance was never particularly outstanding, I did have my strong points even before the soul record made me what I am today, so naturally, there were a couple of girls who asked me out. Unfortunately, because in the past a girl broke my heart in a rather cruel way, I always feared getting hurt again, but I feared more not being able to get back on my feet. Bai Zimin slowly began to narrate small fragments of his past that were necessary for Wu Yuzhen to know in order for her to eventually understand the crux of the whole issue he wanted to get to. A girl hurt his heart? Wu Yuzhen wondered what kind of girl could be so cruel and so simple-minded to hurt a man like him. Even without her knowing the past Bai Zimin, even if the present him was different, his essence as a person definitely could not have changed a lot. What made him who he once was, his identity must still be present somewhere. Therefore, from the point of view of a woman in love like Wu Yuzhen, whoever that girl was, she was definitely not right mentally. The more Wu Yuzhen listened, the more her agitated emotions such as nervousness and anxiety seemed to calm down. However, this by no means meant that she was as calm and placid as her outward face suggested, since if Bai Zimin were to look into her eyes closely he would easily discover a flame of anger burning in those two pretty dark eyes of hers. That's right, the usually calm and generally kind Wu Yuzhen was angry. No, to say she was angry was an understatement. She was furious. When she found out that at some point in Bai Zimin's adolescence there was a girl who was vicious enough to play with his heart, for the first time in her life she wanted to grab a woman by the hair and roll her all over the ground until she shined the floor tiles. Check out LTSTVL on novel/bin.cm. After Bai Zimin stopped talking, she secretly gritted her teeth and said in a low voice. How can that girl be so heartless? Bai Zimin didn't know whether to laugh or cry as he looked at her out of the corner of his eye. Although the voice of the girl beside him was low and soft, it was impossible not to notice the anger boiling under the seemingly stable surface. You don't need to overthink it. While I won't deny that it was an important part of my past, it's no longer important to me now. The reason I told you this is because I needed to get here so that you would understand the real reason why I may not be able to reciprocate your feelings. Wu Yuzhen's face instantly turned pale when she heard this. The river of lava that seemed to flow through her veins and filled her with anger and heat suddenly seemed to freeze and turn into a huge glacier that froze her blood completely and even made it difficult for her to breathe. Why? She asked with latent fear. Bai Zimin sighed in his heart seeing her like this. Regardless of what the reason might be, rejection was rejection no matter how nice one made it look or sound. When the love one felt was not reciprocated, one was bound to suffer and cry, that was life after all. But this was especially the case for a girl like Wu Yuzhen, a girl who in over 20 years was just experiencing the first love of her life. Even if Bai Zimin was not rejecting her outright, his words basically suggested it from a certain point of view. At least, that was how Wu Yuzhen herself felt and it made her little heart tighten. Bai Zimin had no way of knowing, but the truth was that the pain Wu Yujun felt at that moment was even greater than the pain she felt several minutes earlier when he tried to share part of his records with her briefly. The pain she felt came from deep within her existence, difficult to describe, a pain that robbed her of sleep and the will to live. Because my magic stat and my mana stat were more than 10 times higher than what a normal existence should have at the beginning of the evolution, the soul record seemed to give me some importance above the rest. At least that's what I think. Bai Zimin explained slowly as he stared at the slowly darkening sky outside the window. My experience in love, as I just told you before, was not good at all, and my broken heart somehow fomented for the most part my careful and distrustful personality towards people. This was especially so with women. Then, when the soul record turned my past into records imprinted on my soul, that particular record was apparently aggravated or given more attention than usual. As a result, approximately 24 hours after the soul record arrived on Earth, a passive skill automatically awakened in me. A skill? Wu Yujun asked with some difficulty, forcing herself to calm down. Somehow, it seemed that the really important thing was yet to come. A skill. Bai Zimin nodded and turned his face to look her in the eyes as he slowly said, the name of this skill is Stoneheart, and it is a third-order passive skill. Lilith aside, this was the first time Bai Zimin told another person or living being about the existence of the skill Stoneheart. Although one of his greatest secrets was coming out, he was 90% sure that Wu Yujun would never use it against him. Besides, he somehow believed that she deserved to know the truth. A good-hearted girl should not have to go through something as bad as what he went through years ago. Wu Yujun's eyes trembled and her pupils constricted slightly when she heard the name of the skill. At the same time, her heart tightened a little when she learned that this skill even had such a high level. Third order. This was by far the highest level skill Wu Yujun had ever known and would most likely stay that way for quite a while longer. Stoneheart. She muttered unconsciously as she stared at him. Stoneheart. Bai Zimin nodded and said in a clear voice, just as the name of the skill suggests, the function of the Stoneheart skill is to protect my heart from suffering disappointment in the future by expecting something from others. Specifically, this skill makes it extremely difficult for people other than those close to me to move my emotions or touch my heart. Now I understand. Now I understand how a normal student went from being a citizen to someone capable of keeping his sanity and unblinkingly slaughtering so many people. Wu Yujun felt as if a great veil of mystery that was always there was slowly becoming clearer. Bai Zimin nodded, that's right. I don't know how many higher orders there are after Stoneheart evolves, but a third order skill is definitely powerful. And especially a passive one. Even though I had never killed anyone before, the first time I did it I felt no joy or sadness, my heart didn't move at all and it was no different than breathing. That skill. It's too dangerous. Wu Yujun looked at him worriedly and pointed out, sure, now it helps you keep a level head in front of people and helps you make mostly rational decisions, but that can also cause you to be alone for the whole eternity. That's one of the problems. Bai Zimin nodded with a faint smile of helplessness. The skill Stoneheart not only prevents those foreign to me from having a lot of difficulties and making it nearly impossible for them to break into my heart, but this effect is doubled against the opposite sex. In return, my affection for those I love is greatly magnified. You. Wu Yujun's expression became incredibly sad as she looked into his eyes. To her, that helpless smile hid a great weight and sadness that no one could understand. She was not sad because she had just learned that her beloved had a skill that basically made it impossible for any woman to ever win a place in his heart no matter how small. The reason behind her sadness was that the man she loved so much was suffering. If Bai Zimin's affection and attachment increased as a consequence of the skill Stoneheart, then Wu Yujun could not even imagine how much affection he felt for his family at this moment. Only now did she understand the reason why he had told her earlier that every single step he took since day one of the apocalypse had been focused on helping his loved ones. He loved them so much, he loved them more than with all his heart. However, because he didn't have the ability to cross an entire district by himself, in the end, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and hold on. But how much pain was he feeling? How heavy was his heart as he went to bed every night and thought about whether his loved ones were alive or not? How guilty would he feel as he enjoyed sumptuous meals every day while wondering if his loved ones were eating well? I'm sorry. I had no idea about anything. She apologized and shook her head vigorously as she barely managed to hold back the urge to cry. It's okay. Bai Zimin shook his head without saying much more about it. To be honest with himself, while he didn't appreciate others feeling sympathy for him, he also couldn't deny that it felt a little good to know that there was finally someone who understood one thing, that he was human, that he also suffered, and that he also needed understanding. So far, all he had done had been to advance without being defeated even once, which made everyone unconsciously look at him as if he were a divinity among mortals. But they were all wrong. Wu Yujun had realized precisely that. That's why she apologized. Because at the end of the day, she also ended up unwittingly believing that Bai Zimin was an almighty all-powerful existence, because that was how it had been until now. So, I think you now understand the reason why I told you what I said before. He looked at her seriously and said plainly, I don't want to give you false hope for anything, because I know how cruel it would be to do that. Therefore, I think it will be better for you if you make an effort to kill those feelings as soon as possible. I know it will hurt a lot, but I firmly believe that it is better to feel a lot of pain for a few weeks, months, or a few years, and not feel pain every day for the rest of your life. Bai Zimin was remarkably honest and hid almost nothing. He knew how painful it was to have one's emotions played with when one was in love, so he was not willing to become a piece of scum like those who taunted him and whom he once repudiated. The only thing he did not tell Wu Yujun was that in case anyone ever managed to conquer his love, there was a woman who at the moment had the absolute leadership of that position and hardly a contender would be born. Of course, all this was as long as the skill Stoneheart continued to be Stoneheart after evolving to the next stage if at some point Bai Zimin managed to fulfill all the evolution requirements. Because if the skill Stoneheart changed completely, then things could be very different from what he thought right now. But, the problem was... Did Wu Yujun think the same as him? That's for me to decide, not you. She said out of nowhere, and when Bai Zimin looked at her he met her face filled with stubbornness as she stared at him. Whether or not it is impossible to carve out a place in your heart. That is yet to be seen. I firmly believe that it is only impossible if you believe that it is. Even stones will crack eventually. She got up from the bed and walked towards the door, leaving Bai Zimin speechless. Just before she opened the door, she said without looking back, if it were someone else, I would certainly advise her to give up to avoid suffering. But you know what? Wu Yujun, was always a woman who gives good advice to others but rarely follows it. You, Bai Zimin, are the man I want to spend my whole life with, and as hard as it may be, I will fight for it no matter what. Did you not hear everything I just said? Bai Zimin looked at her back and frowned slightly angrily as he said, are you crazy? Maybe I am. She replied and opened the door, but, in a world of crazies like this, being sane is craziness. Bang. The door was slammed shut as if the person who had just left had struck an imaginary hammer similar to a dictatorial judge in a courtroom who had reached her irrevocable decision. Bai Zimin looked at the closed wooden door, dumbfounded. His mouth opened and closed several times as if he wanted to say something but not even a sound came out. In a world of crazies like this, being sane is craziness. When night fell, Bai Zimin was sitting in the dining room of his own villa. Fortunately for him, he had two cute little angels who practically accompanied him every night at mealtime so he didn't feel so lonely. This meat is so delicious. Xiang Feng put both hands on her cheeks and shook her head tenderly. Luoning poked a small piece of meat from a creature called blue fish with her chopsticks and put it into her mouth quickly. As she felt the tenderness with which the meat of the unclassified fish melted inside her mouth, her eyes lit up and she said happily. This fish is super deli too. The two girls sat on both sides of the main seat, from where Bai Zimin watched everything with a faint smile on his face as he enjoyed his own meal. As he watched the two little girls enjoying their dinner and exclaiming with joy every time they found something that delighted their tastes, Bai Zimin felt as if a part of his worries disappeared. Even if that feeling in which it seemed like the weight he carried on his back was light and only lasted for an instant, that instant was very precious to him. Xiang Feng, try this meat. The rice my mom cooked with the help of the elder sisters is also very yummy. The voices of both girls were like wind bells dancing in the spring breeze. Compared to the roars of the terrifying beasts and the growls of the zombies in the outside world as well as the chill of the night, anyone who stepped into this properly air-conditioned villa and listened to the cheerful and carefree voices of the two little elves enjoying the dinner prepared by Bai Zimin's hired maids would definitely not be able to believe that right outside the front door the world was falling apart. After dining and enjoying some desserts, the maids began to clear the table in an orderly fashion. Even they had smiles on their faces. Because Bai Zimin's villa was very large and there were too many spare rooms, he proposed that instead of going back to their homes in the middle part of the village they could all stay on the main floor. 90% of the maids accepted Bai Zimin's proposal without even hesitating and there were even many of them who basically stopped seeing their former husbands in order to spend more time there. Living in the villa of the strongest person and the highest ruler of the village, these women who had previously suffered different levels of cruelty were fully aware that they would no longer have to worry about their safety. As for those who had husbands, they all knew that in this life one could not live purely from love and even less so considering the current situation in the world where even the children would be willing to sell their parents for a piece of bread. Mama, let me help you. Xiang Feng jumped nimbly from her chair and took some things from her mother's hands, making her smile gently and accept her help gladly. Findu chapters on nve/lbi.com. Bai Zimin said nothing about it. Instead, he looked at Luoning and asked curiously, Little Ning, what is your current level? Big brother Bai, I'm currently level 24. Luoning stuck out her non-existent chest and said in a proud voice, Uncle Fu Suifeng and the other strongest aunts and uncles are level 25, very soon I will catch up with them. Haha. Little Ning, you are growing up so fast. Bai Zimin laughed and patted the little girl's head, causing her eyes to narrow like those of a cat satisfied with its master's caresses. The maids who listened to the interaction of the two silently as they went about their work were surprised and secretly looked at the little girl, barely 9 years old, in complete and total disbelief. Many of them felt a bit embarrassed that such a little child had the courage to do something that they, grown women, did not. When you reach level 25 and the soul record presents your evolution options, ask Fu Suifeng and the rest. You can even look for me. Don't make hasty decisions just based on the name of the job, okay? Because she was so young, Bai Zimin had to be careful and do his best to prevent Luoning from making a wrong decision. After all, the first path chosen was from a certain point of view the most important since that path would be the one that would open up different forks later on. Okay. Luoning nodded her head easily. She fully and completely trusted in Bai Zimin as she knew that he would never say or do anything to hurt her. Alright, little girl. Go back home or your big brother will get jealous and look at me as if I have stolen his lovely little sister's affection in the future. Bai Zimin chuckled. Hehehe. Luoning said nothing more and after giving Bai Zimin a powerful killer kiss on the cheek she ran off at such a high speed that it left the maids wordless. Bai Zimin shook his head and stood up with a smile before heading to his room. Unfortunately for him, even after trying for almost a full hour, he was unable to fall asleep. His earlier conversation with Wu Yujun and the words the beauty had said to him before leaving still weighed on his mind. So boring. Bai Zimin groaned and sat up in bed. Seeing the starlight beyond the sky, his gaze focused for an instant on the brightest star in the firmament, briefly recalling his previous conversation with Lilith about the firmament fragments and bringing back to his memory that distant past event with the far-off constellation of the Heavenly Wolf. Since wasting time trying to fall asleep was stupid as his head was filled with thoughts that weighed more than he initially estimated, Bai Zimin didn't even bother to take off his sleeping clothes and noiselessly jumped out the window as if he were a thief instead of going out through the front door like the master of the house. It didn't take him long to get to the workshop, and when he opened the door, what greeted him was a much larger space compared to the past. It wasn't that the shop where he worked had gotten any bigger, not at all. This was his personal workshop and a large workshop shed was being built for the other blacksmiths who would be starting their training shortly. This large shed would also have the capacity to store a large number of forging materials, so Bai Zimin did not have to share his space with other people. The reason why the workshop seemed bigger and why the internal space had increased was because all the shelves that were filled to the brim with bottles and different blood containers were gone. When Bai Zimin arrived at the base, one of the things he did as soon as he had some free time was to take all the blood samples and store them in the liquid storage pearl. Bai Zimin took his blazing scale greatsword and as he gently played with the blade he easily noticed the large number of cracks that stretched across the length and breadth of the weapon. As if that wasn't enough, the tip of the greatsword had disappeared and was nowhere to be seen. That fucking goblin, I should have made him suffer a while longer. Bai Zimin complained aloud. The reason why the tip of his great sword had ended up being destroyed, the real culprit had been that goblin named Inak. Back then, Bai Zimin had used his great sword to stop the deadly attack that the goblin had fired at his back, and the power behind that attack had been too much for his great sword that was already damaged due to the fierce attack that Bai Zimin had launched a few days earlier against that earthworm that was hiding in the subway. As he looked at the empty chimney, Bai Zimin sent a thought to his new friend and immediately he felt movement inside his body. A few seconds later, like a small child who had just woken up from napping, the small deep blue flame shot out from Bai Zimin's chest and floated a short distance in front of him. The flames flickered and the atmosphere immediately brightened, giving it a more lugubrious appearance than it actually was. So, the soul power within you stopped being consumed after forming a soul pact with me? Bai Zimin asked as he looked at the small flame before him. Of course, he didn't get an answer to his question and he didn't expect one either. Rather than a question, his previous words were more of a sort of affirmation. Okay, time to work. He said and took the small flame in his hands, putting it into the forging furnace. Bai Zimin took out an unclassified soul stone and threw it into the furnace to let the endless blue lotus flame consume it. However, not to his surprise, the unclassified soul stone was devoured in an instant without leaving a trace. If it were earlier, Bai Zimin might have spat out old blood at such a sight. After all, soul stones were valuable to him regardless of whether it was unclassified or not. However, he now had a supply of tens of thousands of unclassified soul stones and it might even be more than 100,000 considering the large number obtained from the goblins. Of course, even though that was a large number of soul stones, Bai Zimin also had to take into account that his soldiers needed soul stones to evolve their skills as well, so it wasn't as if he could do whatever he wanted with them. However, since his top priority was his own strength boost, spending a few thousand should be fine. Bai Zimin threw unclassified soul stones into the forging furnace. The endless blue lotus flame absorbed the power within the soul stones so quickly that if it wasn't for the large amount Bai Zimin threw at the same time it could easily seem like there was nothing there in the first place. It was only after about 200 unclassified soul stones that he began to see some growth of power in the little blue flame. Bai Zimin was thankful that in his workshop he had several types of soul stones for forging magical weapons or else his own supply might have been insufficient. Seeing that the result of the unclassified soul stones was not too good even after spending over 200, Bai Zimin gritted his teeth and threw a first-order soul stone. The result showed itself immediately. The flame of the endless blue lotus flame burned much brighter than before as the spirit of the flame had risen when it smelled the scent of a good meal. This time, it took a few minutes to consume all the power contained within the rock. Bai Zimin judged that he should be fine for now and immediately got to work. The first thing he did was to make a small sketch of the type of weapon and approximate appearance he wanted it to look like. His weapon, of course, would still be a greatsword. Next, he took a large metal block about 20 centimeters long and about the width of a palm. It really is heavy, he said as he felt his hand sink slightly. This block of metal was the rank 2 metal called lapiodite, the strange metal he had found in the forest after killing the second-order existences that were fiercely fighting to obtain a precious plant that unfortunately ended up being destroyed by Bai Zimin's fierce attack. I wonder how powerful my physical attacks will become when hitting with a greatsword. Bai Zimin couldn't help but rub his chin as he thought aloud. This metal increases its weight x2 relative to the Earth's gravity for every piece used. Its weight will undoubtedly be terrifying to the point where I fear I won't be able to lift the sword. However, in retrospect, if a powerful strike performed by a monster like Bai Zimin using a heavy weapon of such magnitude were to be launched, the results would probably be anything but beautiful. In fact, Bai Zimin's imagination went a little crazy when he imagined an attack from him without holding back at all. When the resulting image flashed in his mind, he was 100% certain that even if a third-order existence appeared in front of him once his weapon was finished he would definitely have enough power to make his enemy suffer the consequences. If another existence heard his words, especially higher existences, they would definitely scoff at him. A first-order existence believed to be capable of threatening the life of a third-order existence? Even jokes had their limits. However, if those existences were to see Bai Zimin's status window which was not at all in accordance to someone of his level, and if those existences were to see his active skills and managed to comprehend the enormous synergy those skills had with each other, they would definitely not think that Bai Zimin was joking. But before the sword, I think I should prepare the proper tools. Until now, Bai Zimin hadn't had much choice regarding his forging tools. However, now that a good metal had appeared before him, it was impossible for his heart not to be moved. The first thing he did was to use part of the bones from the skeleton of the second-order ape that Shangguan Bingshui had killed. It was perhaps a quality that only started from the second order, but curiously, the bones of this creature had certain metallic properties, so when Bai Zimin took it to the furnace and the endless blue lotus flame began to burn, instead of being destroyed the bones slowly began to overheat. Crack. The sound of cracking after about 2 or 3 minutes of burning caused a sigh to creep from inside Bai Zimin. It really won't be easy, he muttered as he looked at the broken bones. Although they had not been useless, the current him had no way of using them to forge equipment as his knowledge of blacksmithing was still not high enough. The endless blue lotus flame had been a flame used for combat rather than a forging flame. The memories that slept within the flame's conscience and will was destruction and annihilation, so something like be careful was new to this small flame that now burned with greater ferocity in the forging furnace. Bai Zimin had to go through a long process of trial and failure before he reached success, and since he did not want to lose valuable second-order material he began to practice with the flame using unclassified materials. Burn a little harder. A little less. A little shit. Burn. Like that, there you go. Try to remember that feeling from before. Visjate and Felbin. CM for new updates. Bai Zimin continued to give instructions to the endless blue lotus flame and tried to guide it as best as possible. It was not a simple task at all, as even after 3 whole hours, a large number of forging materials had been wasted. However, Bai Zimin was fully aware that with the endless blue lotus flame's ability to sleep almost completely and with a barely awakened conscience, his job was no different than dealing with a newborn baby, so a lot of patience was required in this regard. Time passed and before Bai Zimin knew it, it was already 5 AM. It was only another hour before the sun began to show signs of rising. It had been about 7 hours since he had started practicing the burning process with the endless blue lotus flame, and it had been something similar to tug of war. Bai Zimin felt more exhausted than when he fought the archaic bear and almost lost his life in the process. However, one's efforts rarely go unrewarded. That's it, that's how you do it. He exclaimed as he looked at the blue flame that was burning furiously as if celebrating its triumph. In front of him, the second-order ape's bones finally reached the perfect temperature where the faint grey had turned to bright reddish. So proud. Is this how a father feels when he teaches his child to ride a bicycle? Bai Zimin wiped away his crocodile tears before taking the hammer and layering it with several layers of his mana. Even though it wasn't perfect and a lot of training was still needed as the time required to reach the culminating point was far more than would actually be needed, this had undoubtedly been a big step for the little endless blue lotus flame. Clang. 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 Bai Zimin hammered hard on the second-order ape's bones and although at first it seemed that the power was not enough, it slowly showed the results. The shape of the thorax bones began to gradually mold under the constant hammering thanks to the fact that the burning temperature of the endless blue lotus flame had caused the bones with metallic properties to temporarily lose some of their hardness, turning that hardness into greater moldability. Bai Zimin wielded the hammer from different angles, slowly giving the bones the shape he was looking for. Approximately 30 minutes later, he stopped his movements and took a closer look at what was before him. Still burning red hot, what was in front of Bai Zimin's eyes appeared to be a mold for making muffins or cakes. However, the shape of the mold was exactly the shape of a forging hammer and its size made it impossible for anyone to mistake it for a mold for making muffins or cakes. With the mold ready, Bai Zimin looked toward the furnace and said in a serious voice, "Little fellow, I know it's hard for you to listen to me but I need you to focus hard this time." The little endless blue lotus flame seemed to blink in response or maybe it was just Bai Zimin's imagination but whatever the case there was no choice but to take the bull by the horns and continue. He took a fragment of lapiodite and threw it into the flames that burned non-stop in the furnace. The flames engulfed the material, but as Bai Zimin expected, it was not easy to make a rank 2 mineral heat up in a matter of seconds. Seeing that even after 5 minutes the lapiodite showed no signs of melting, Bai Zimin gritted his teeth and threw 2 first-order soul stones. As the flames engulfed the 2 first-order soul stones Bai Zimin felt as if his heart was about to bleed. Fortunately, throwing fuel on the fire proved to be the best option. The endless blue lotus flame burned far more fiercely than before as it savagely absorbed the power of the new soul stones just as if it were a thirsty man in the middle of the desert who suddenly encountered an oasis. Under its constant oscillation, the lapiodite fragment quickly began to show signs of giving way. Bai Zimin sighed a sigh of relief in his heart and hurriedly took the tongs. Here came the crux of success or failure. Try to focus all your heat on one point. Try to ignore everything except the metal. Bai Zimin patiently explained his intention and the endless blue lotus flame seemed to understand as slowly the temperature inside the workshop began to drop. As the surrounding temperature dropped, the speed at which the lapiodite fragment heated up increased as a result of the heat focus. Bai Zimin realized that he had to hurry so he hurriedly took the mold and dipped it into a large container of cold water. Steam shot up to the ceiling as the temperature of the mold dropped abruptly after coming into contact with the freezing water. Bai Zimin grabbed the tongs and quickly carried the now cold instead of fiery red mold back to the dancing flames. The cold water not only helped to keep the mold's temperature lower but also served to temporarily battle against the blue flames that had lost ferocity as the endless blue lotus flame focused on the lapiodite fragment which at this point was already completely fiery red. Bai Zimin took a fire poker and hurriedly rolled the burning lapiodite fragment into the mold, which was rapidly showing signs of overheating. Next, he took the mold back to the flames and instructed the endless blue lotus flame to increase the temperature around the mold but to focus primarily on the mineral inside. A few minutes later, the lapiodite fragment was completely melted under the endless blue lotus flame's constant oscillation and Bai Zimin wanted to shout for joy. However, now came one of the most important points, a process in which he had little or no power. I hope the mold can withstand the temperature of the lapiodite or else all my previous efforts will go down the drain. Bai Zimin prayed to God, the devil, dragons, even ghosts. The now completely melted lapiodite fragment had adapted to the shape of the mold, so that before Bai Zimin there seemed to be a forge hammer burning with little flashes of lightning amidst the gurgling lava. Unfortunately, luck did not seem to be on his side as approximately 20 minutes later, the mold began to show signs of not being able to withstand anymore. Bai Zimin hurriedly picked up the mold again and took it back to the cold water basin, dipping it in as quickly as possible. The steam rose uncontrollably and the workshop soon seemed to be enveloped by a white cloud. More than 100 liters of water were evaporated in a matter of seconds, but the temperature of the burning lava hardly dropped at all. Even so, this served to prevent the mold from silting up so quickly. However, Bai Zimin was not happy at all and instead had a grim expression on his face as he thought about what to do next. The cooling from before had only bought him several seconds or maybe 1 or 2 minutes if he were lucky. Besides, judging by how the lapiodite in a liquid state still burned so brightly, Bai Zimin believed that even a river could be evaporated before it cooled down completely so submerging it in water didn't seem to be a really viable option either. Just as his expression sank deeper and deeper, he felt the door to his workshop gently open, and when he looked in that direction, his expression brightened as he muttered aloud, "My ray of light in the midst of darkness has come at just the right time." ******. Shang Guanbing Shui had gone to look for Bai Zimin at his villa as she wanted to ask him something important. However, when she got there, the maids who had just awakened told her that he was apparently sleeping. She found this strange so she went to knock on the door of his room, only to find that no one was actually there. She was quick to judge the place where he might be so she immediately went to his forge shop. Not to her surprise, she felt several sounds coming from inside. However, when she opened the door, a large cloud of steam assaulted her. Just as she was about to ask Bai Zimin what he was doing to cause so much steam and why he kept the door closed without letting it out, she heard words that startled her. "My ray of light in the midst of darkness has come at the right time." Her blue eyes stared at the man several feet away and for a moment she didn't know what to say. However, she didn't have time to think things through too much at all either. Bai Zimin ignored everything in the world and hurriedly moved forward, crossing the distance between her and him in an instant. "Hurry, I need your help here." Shang Guanbing Shui, still shocked by what she heard earlier, unconsciously let her feet carry her as Bai Zimin pulled on her arm urgently. Both of them did not notice that as the events unfolded a distinctly unnatural blush appeared on the face of the cold and indifferent ice princess. Because Bai Zimin was too anxious about the fast-rising temperature of the hammer-shaped mold, he had no time to pay attention to Sheng Guanbing Shuet. If the mold was burned and the lapiodite fragment turned into lava fell to the ground, Bai Zimin's losses would not be light at all. Not only would he be losing all the work done after more than 7 hours of effort, but he would also be losing a precious block of rank 2 ore. Bai Zimin was definitely not willing to suffer such heavy losses, so when Sheng Guanbing Shui appeared in the midst of his despair, it was no different to him than an angel descending from the heavens. As for Sheng Guanbing Shui herself, for a moment she felt something peculiar that she could not identify correctly. However, she did know that as she felt Bai Zimin's big hand hold hers to rush her to the work table, she felt that for some reason she could not keep 100% calm as she had always done. Bing Shui, help me. Bai Zimin quickly urged. Help you. She looked at him still in a daze. Quickly. Use your skill and freeze this. Bai Zimin didn't give much explanation as the mold began to lose shape faster and faster. If he didn't hurry, everything would be lost, and even if they didn't manage to contain the heat in the end, the shape of the hammer would distort to the point where it would become completely useless. Sheng Guanbing Shui quickly calmed down and looking at the place pointed out by Bai Zimin, she was immediately able to judge what was happening. The whole situation became clear to her in an instant. The steam, the reason why he said those words, the cause behind his anxious expression as well as his haste. She sighed as if relieved of something and then stretched both hands forward as she sent a wave of mana to one of the runes engraved on her soul. The skill second order ice maker level 1 activated at her command and the mist condensed in her hands stretched forward. An instant later, the mist whose color wavered between white and light blue swirled, surrounding the hammer-shaped mold in a few blinks. Seal. She said in her distinctive cold, indifferent voice. V said no, V, 3LB/N, dot, CM for new OVL. The mist seemed to stagnate for a brief moment, and in the next instant, it flashed into light. Phew. Bai Zimin let out a huge sigh of relief at the sight of the ice block on the table. However, even though the biggest of his worries hadn't happened, Bai Zimin knew that it wasn't over yet. Inside the hammer-shaped mold, the yellow lava still burned fiercely as if trying to free itself from the ice which imprisoned it. What's wrong with this lava? Sheng Guanbing Shui asked in surprise. Although the sealed lava was far from being able to break free from the bonds of her ice maker skill, she was surprised that it did not turn into a pile of ice. It was obvious that it was not lava made of ordinary rocks and normal fire. Do you remember the rank 2 ore I showed you earlier? Bai Zimin looked at her with a smile. You mean that stuff called lapiodite something? Sheng Guanbing Shui furrowed her eyebrows slightly, somewhat unsure. Lapiodite. He nodded before continuing, that's it. I was trying to forge a new forging hammer since the normal hammer I'm using now will probably have too much difficulty shaping a rare precious metal like this. Even if Bai Zimin empowered the normal hammer with his mana, the amount of work he had to do due to not having a proper working tool was much larger than it actually should. Therefore, before setting to work on a new weapon he decided that the wisest and smartest thing to do would be to forge a hammer using the most valuable metal he currently had in his possession. Sheng Guanbing Shui nodded, finally understanding everything as she turned her eyes to the hammer-shaped mold. Since Bai Zimin did not have the ability to mold the metal at will due to the lack of tools, he had no choice but to create a mold that would fit the shape of the hammer he wanted and then melt the metal completely before putting the liquid inside the created mold. It was assumed that after melting the lapiodite liquid into the mold I would just have to wait for the heat to subside so that the lava would settle once again. But I didn't expect that even a mold created from the thorax bones of a second-order mutant beast wouldn't be able to contain the heat. Bai Zimin couldn't help but smile bitterly. He looked at her and said with genuine gratitude in his eyes and voice, you really saved me this time. If it wasn't for your timely arrival, I'm afraid that more than 7 hours of work and valuable materials would have been wasted. Sheng Guanbing Shui stared at him, saying nothing to his words. Her blue eyes looked like a scanner, staring at him as if she wanted to see into his soul. Bai Zimin felt a little awkward at the intense stare, so he asked somewhat perplexed, did something happen? You. Sheng Guanbing Shui frowned slightly, but the next moment her expression returned to normal as if nothing had happened. She sighed and while continuing to keep her skill active to cool the contents sealed in ice faster, she said with some helplessness in her voice, Bai Zimin, you should be more careful with your words. Excuse me. He looked at her with wide eyes. Sheng Guanbing Shui shook her head and stopped looking at him. Now that she had calmed down and understood the situation, she could finally realize the reason why previously her heart fluctuated strangely. It was just that she didn't want to believe it, so she vehemently denied it. She refused to believe that this fluctuation was her emotions in motion, even though she no longer felt anything unusual now. Seeing that she didn't seem very willing to talk, Bai Zimin shrugged his shoulders and also didn't attach any importance to her earlier words. Instead, he said, by the way, if you don't have something urgent to do, would you mind helping me freeze the hammer? It'll be much faster and I can get to work sooner. All right. She nodded easily. Actually, I was looking for you cause I need to talk to you about something. Tell me. Bai Zimin replied as he gently jumped up and sat down on the work table. Sheng Guanbing Shui only now noticed that he was still wearing sleepwear and the corner of her mouth twitched a couple of times as she looked at him closely. About Camp Baequan, what will you do with them? Camp Baequan. Bai Zimin thought about this question a long time ago last night, so it didn't take him too long to respond now, we will finish them off. We will crush their forces completely until they submit. Sheng Guanbing Shui looked at him silently and he did not evade her gaze. After almost a full minute, she finally couldn't bear it and looked away as she said in a neutral voice. So this is how it will all end after all. I'm afraid I don't have time to do it as smoothly as I would like. Bai Zimin replied and then revealed, I have to conquer China in a few months. Is it because of your breakthrough mission? Yes, it is because of my breakthrough mission. The workshop remained silent after that. But this silence did not last long as Bai Zimin had not yet finished. Bing Shui, I would like to ask you for a favor. A favor? She looked at him in confusion. A proud person like Bai Zimin would definitely not ask favors from someone easily. Even when his life was at stake during several battles in the past, he didn't ask for help from anyone nor did he beg anyone for support. Therefore, she was genuinely curious to know what could be so important to him. Currently, you are one of the few people I trust enough to ask this of. He nodded and sighed as he said, after conquering China, I'm afraid I'll have to leave Earth for a while. Shang Guanbingshue's face changed at such a revelation and her voice subconsciously pitched up, what do you mean by that? Then, Bai Zimin began to slowly explain what was happening. The way he had obtained the title irregular after killing with a single attack 2 second-order beings despite still being a first-order existence and the function of the title. Rather than the function of the title, what Bai Zimin explained to her was the special skill of the title but left out the bizarre but ominous description. Then, he told her a bit about the requirements he needed to fulfill to evolve to the second stage of evolution so that she understood the reason why he said he needed to leave Earth for a while. I see. Shang Guanbingshue didn't know what to say or feel about it. On one hand was the fact that he received a strange and powerful enough title that allowed him to undertake space travel to reach worlds with a power that somehow or other more suited his current strength and growth speed. On the other hand, there was the fact that the young man in front of her had received a breakthrough mission that limited his time to only 12 months, 1 year. If he failed to complete those crazy and nonsensical requirements, then all his effort would be wasted. Therefore, he had to leave this world. Because the current Earth did not possess the ability to spawn so many second-order monsters so casually, let alone third-order monsters. Even after almost 2 months of apocalypse, first-order existences were still rarities that could not be found everywhere like unclassified existences. While feeling a little uncomfortable inwardly, Shang Guanbingshue couldn't help but wonder what kind of existence the man in front of her would one day become. With everything that had happened, she had forgotten for a moment that this stubborn and proud man aspired to become the most almighty existence in the universe. Your strength and my strength. The disparity only continues to grow and I fear it will only grow even more. Shang Guanbingshue smiled bitterly and shook her head. Bai Zimin tried to smile, but he could not. What Shang Guanbingshue had just said was true. It wasn't just her, Bai Zimin's strength was growing so fast that it was most likely that each and every person he knew would never even be able to see his back. Don't worry. He said, trying to ease the slightly heavy mood a bit. No matter how strong I get, we'll still be friends. If someday you become stronger than me, will you look down on me? Of course, no. Shang Guanbingshue hurriedly shook her head and stared at him as she said in a softer voice, friends in life and friends in death. That's how it is. Friends in life and friends in death, hey. Bai Zimin repeated before smiling slightly. That's a good way to put it. Hey, Bai Zimin. She suddenly raised her head after lowering it and while looking at him asked somewhat hesitantly, that title of yours. Doesn't it allow you to bring a second person? A second person? Bai Zimin blinked in surprise. Eyes wide open, he said somewhat uncertainly. It shouldn't, should it? Shang Guanbingshue's eyes twinkled uncharacteristically as she realized that he wasn't sure if his title could let him carry one or more companions. If that was the case, didn't that mean she had hope? If she could follow him to a more evolved world, while the danger would be much greater, the chances of becoming more powerful would be much higher. At the same time, she could prevent that great gap between her and him from growing any wider. For some reason, Shang Guanbingshue slowly began to feel that she became obsessed with not wanting to fall too far behind Bai Zimin. Strangely, she did not wish to be ahead, if it happened then perfect, but if not then she would definitely not lose sleep over it. All she wanted was to keep an eye on the back that she could barely see at the moment. Whether this was due to her competitive spirit or her natural pride, Shang Guanbingshue did not know. She just knew that she definitely did not like the idea of completely losing sight of him at all, and that was enough for her to work hard and force herself to exceed her own limits countless times. But, if I bring you with me when I leave, then that might bring too much trouble. Bai Zimin frowned and shook his head. Trouble? Shang Guanbingshue looked at him and said slightly displeased, I didn't know that taking a friend with you so that she can become stronger too is troublesome. Bai Zimin rolled his eyes and said a little speechless, hello? Bingshue? Are you still asleep or what? You know well that's not what I meant. Then what is it? Shang Guanbingshue asked, crossing both arms under her chest and unconsciously causing her prominent mountains to rise even more. Bai Zimin could not appreciate the moment at all for when he saw her remove her hands from the ice-sealed mold he panicked and immediately had to check to make sure nothing went wrong. This time it was her turn to roll her eyes. Calm down, child. The remaining ice is enough to finish sealing the heat completely. In a few more minutes the hammer will be complete. Child? Bai Zimin blinked when he heard that word and couldn't help but think of Lilith again as she often called him like that playfully. Even though he really wanted to ask the beauty next to him what part of him looked like that of a child, he decided the right thing to do was to shut his mouth. He looked at her and noticed that she now had her elbows resting on the work table, her body leaning slightly forward, and her delicate chin resting on her hands as she stared at him. Shang Guanbingshue was wearing a snow-white dress devoid of imperfections that hugged the curves of her body delicately. In fact, this was a considerably modest dress just like most clothes she wore as the length was long enough to barely cover even her knees. However, there was a very small neckline that did not really reveal anything unless one looked from the top down. The problem was precisely that Bai Zimin was sitting on the work table and Shang Guanbingshue was leaning forward standing on the floor. The corner of Bai Zimin's mouth twitched a couple of times as for a second his eyes moved unconsciously to that patch of white skin with a barely visible but definitely deep crevasse in which countless men would be willing to die. His eyes only delayed merely for a brief second before he turned his face away slowly. Shang Guanbingshue inclined her head slightly and was about to ask what's wrong when she saw Bai Zimin point downward. I say, Bingshue. Do you really think I'm a little child or do you just think I don't like women at all? He said in frustration. Damn it, this senior has been fighting on the front lines without a good rest for almost 2 full months while big beauties willing to come into my bed every day tempt me relentlessly. Do they think it's easy to hold back? Bai Zimin secretly cursed as he activated blood manipulation to calm down his crotch and prevent it from waking up. Shang Guanbingshue was stupefied when she heard what Bai Zimin said, but when she looked down and saw the very subtle but clear view of her cleavage, she immediately understood what he was referring to. Her expression did not change so it was hard to tell what she was thinking as she straightened her posture and then sat down next to Bai Zimin. Even though he was approximately a head taller, it was impossible for him to see anything from the angle he was at unless he were cheeky enough to let her see him struggle to do so. A somewhat awkward silence surrounded them both as for an instant no one knew what to say. Shang Guanbingshui was secretly tremendously embarrassed. She basically trusted the man beside her to the point where all her guard was gone, but the problem was that she sometimes forgot that he was a young and healthy man. No, rather than her forgetting, the problem was that since Bai Zimin never showed any signs of lust or interest in women, she unconsciously even came to think that. I guess you are attracted to women, after all. She said in a joking tone to break the silence. What the hell? Bai Zimin turned his head and looked at her somewhat wordlessly. Then, as if he had become a little more daring just like when he spent his time with Lilith, he said in a deep voice, you want me to show you how much I like women. If there was one thing no man could ever tolerate, it was having his manhood questioned. Least of all a man proud and arrogant of himself like Bai Zimin. Oh. Shang Guanbingshui also looked at him, except that her expression was slightly amused. Her lips curved into a smile and she said with raised eyebrows, how are you supposed to prove that? Bai Zimin looked at the beautiful woman beside him and could clearly feel the emotion known as lust slowly awakening within him. He was, after all, a perfectly healthy man who also desired beauties, and it just so happened that the beauty next to him was without a doubt one of the most beautiful women he had ever met in his 20 years of life. However, Bai Zimin knew perfectly well that Shang Guanbingshui was joking. If he did anything she would definitely fight him and would be disappointed. Besides, Bai Zimin himself also had no intention of doing anything to her even though at that very moment he felt lust towards her. Shang Guanbingshui was also surprised to see the small flame of lust burning in the eyes of the man beside her. But instead of being angry or surprised by this, the real reason behind her surprise was herself. She couldn't believe what she was doing right now. Wasn't what she had just done for the last few minutes flirting with him? What difference did it make? Bai Zimin secretly took a deep breath and as the blood flow in his body slowed down, his heartbeat also slowly returned to normal. The flame of lust began to subside until a few seconds later it finally disappeared completely. During this whole time, both of them had been staring into each other's eyes with different complex emotions in their hearts. Looks like this is already over. Bai Zimin got down from the work table and hit the ice block hard, causing it to break into countless pieces. Shang Guanbingshui followed his movements while also taking a deep breath to calm herself. The two were a grown man and woman so they clearly easily noticed each other's emotions. But in order for the good friendship they had built up to continue as such, there were things that were better left unsaid out loud. How about the hammer? Do you think you can work better with it now? She asked as if nothing had happened and still sitting on the work table. Bai Zimin pushed what had just happened to the back of his mind and with a little effort broke the mold made of bones carefully. Then he took the hammer by the handle and immediately felt the weight of between 100 and 200 kilograms. Even though he had used a pretty big lapiodite fragment, the weight of the hammer surprised him a lot. Moreover, what Bai Zimin did not expect was that the electric property was still there, so blue lightning flashed on the body of the hammer like playful little snakes. Damn, doesn't this mean I'm the rightful heir of Asgard? He said aloud. Pfft. Ha ha ha. Shang Guanbingshui couldn't help but be surprised only to start laughing out loud when she heard Bai Zimin's funny comment. She laughed as loud and as free as that night inside that forest thick with dangers in which they both opened up and became close friends. In the span of a week or two, Bai Zimin had made her laugh more than she did in years and it was something she appreciated very much, therefore, she too decided to forget what had just happened while secretly vowing to herself not to be so naughty again. Bai Zimin sighed in relief at this and with a small smile began to read the records of the hammer. V-Sit-No, V, 3LB/N, dot, CM for new OVL. Refined Crusher. One-handed weapon. Rank, 1. Physical attack power, 600. Magical attack power, 200. It has a certain chance of paralyzing the enemy depending on the level difference. Durability, 5000/5000. Description, a hammer created in a clever but rather improper way by a novice blacksmith with intentions of obtaining better forging tools. Its high physical attack power makes it easier to fashion metals, but be careful how hard you hit or it could turn into a terrifying weapon. Pu. What? Bai Zimin almost spat on the floor when he saw the physical attack power of the hammer in his hands. Damn, this hammer has almost the same number of physical attack power as my main weapon. Although it's just a hammer meant for blacksmithing. Moreover, it even had 200 points of magic attack power. Shang Guanbingshui was curious to see Bai Zimin's attitude so she gracefully approached, bringing a gentle breeze along with her movements. Placing her small hand on the surface of the hammer and reading the records, even she was startled before her mouth twitched slightly as she murmured. Really? This hammer has almost the same power as my sword, but if we add the magic attack power then it far surpasses it. Bai Zimin looked at her and said not knowing whether to laugh or cry, I didn't even put effort into this stuff but that's how it came out. Shang Guanbingshui forced a smile and said slowly, maybe. We underestimated the power of a precious rank 2 or too much. Bai Zimin also forced a smile and nodded slightly. However, he was actually secretly ecstatic. He had found a large quantity of lapiodite so he couldn't wait to forge a new sword for himself. His attack power and overall battle power would definitely increase tremendously by then and even if a third-order existence appeared before him Bai Zimin was confident of prevailing. Just as those thoughts appeared in his mind, the sound of footsteps from outside caught his attention. By the time Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbingshui looked towards the still-open workshop door, they saw Chen He standing there staring at them with a calm expression. Bai Zimin shook his head secretly. This guy really had to arrive now? He even looked timed. He subtly glanced at Shang Guanbingshui, standing a step away from his body and whose small hand was just inches away from his as she was still holding a part of the hammer. Chen He, is something wrong? He asked calmly. It wasn't like he had to explain himself to anyone anyway, it was just that if possible he didn't want misunderstandings. Shang Guanbingshui didn't show many reactions either. In fact, she simply took her hand away and took a step back but stayed at a fairly close distance from Bai Zimin. Chen He looked for a moment at Shang Guanbingshui and then at Bai Zimin. Although he was naturally a bit jealous seeing the clear closeness between the two, especially seeing that his beloved was clearly in comfort there, he did not feel that it was too strange. Chen He could be a man in love and while love sometimes blinded people, he was not an idiot. On the contrary, Chen He was a really smart man, and it was not for nothing that he had the second highest grades in one of the most prestigious universities of the world, Beijing University, where even foreign students came. It was absolutely impossible for him not to notice the closeness that Shang Guanbingshui and Bai Zimin had grown closer. Although he did not know what had happened in the North Camp when the two of them left to conquer it, it was obvious that whatever had happened helped to increase the mutual trust between the two of them greatly. As to what level that trust had increased, Chen He had no way of knowing. The only thing Chen He did know was that, at the very least, Shang Guanbingshui was clearly very comfortable being together with Bai Zimin, and this was enough for him to be surprised. He was pretty sure that apart from Wu Yuzhen there was no second person who knew his beloved better than him, which was precisely why he was surprised, because he knew the kind of person she was and her distrust of men in general, as well as the reason for this trait of hers. Chen He really didn't know what else to do. He had been fighting practically without rest and had even spent a few days without sleep while hunting monsters to level up as fast as possible, now being a level 39 first-order existence. However, even though his power had increased tremendously, he still couldn't make the woman he was trying to impress look at him. Sometimes, it was impossible not to feel frustrated. However, looking at that intoxicatingly beautiful face with which he dreamed of day and night, those blue eyes that had been imprinted in his soul, Chen He felt all his frustrations disappear without a trace. He had been lingering after her for about 10 years, he would definitely not give up. He firmly believed that one day she would notice him and understand that they were born to be together. All West CHPTRs on n.o/vli/n/.cm. As for Bai Zimin, of course Chen He was jealous of him. However, jealousy was one thing and hatred was quite another. Chen He did not hate Bai Zimin in any way, on the contrary, he actually respected him a lot, and while there were many things he disagreed with regarding his decisions because they were both men with different philosophies, Chen He could not deny that Bai Zimin had the talent to lead. Bai Zimin was powerful, talented, fearless, and did not let strength go to his head too much. From a certain point of view, he was a considerably perfect man. Chen He had even noticed how Bai Zimin's appearance had improved to the point where he was not even behind him at all. Chen He admired Bai Zimin, far from hating him. It was just that he also saw him as a rival and threat when it came to love. Chen He, is something wrong? Hearing Bai Zimin's question, Chen He snapped out of his inner thoughts and blinked several times before calmly saying, "Yet. Actually, I was looking for you to ask you about the future of Baiquan Camp." Baiquan Camp? Bai Zimin looked at him and then looked at Shang Guanbingshui as he slowly said, "What a coincidence, she also just asked me the same thing a few minutes ago." Oh. Chen He looked at Shang Guanbingshui and calmed down a little. Shang Guanbingshui looked at Bai Zimin, but the latter didn't look at her anymore. Instead he walked to a corner and picked up another lapiodite fragment while calmly saying, "Chen He, do you think you can destroy the Baiquan Camp's defenses completely and force them into submission? Destroy their defenses?" Chen He blinked in confusion. However, Shang Guanbingshui seemed to understand what Bai Zimin meant by those words as she looked at him in amazement and said somewhat uncertainly, "You mean you want to fight them and defeat them in battle?" "Yet." Bai Zimin nodded as he put a lapiodite fragment into the furnace and signaled the small blue flame to burn slowly. "I want their forces to be crushed to the point where they can't put up any resistance. More accurately, I want them to dare not put up any resistance. I have no time for playing games, I wish to control everything as fast as possible." This. Chen He hesitated upon hearing this. Subjugating and destroying were two completely different issues. By destroying the defenses of Baiquan Camp, hundreds and even thousands could die in the process. It all depended on whether they were willing to fight to the bitter end or if the top leader or leaders would end up surrendering. But if not, the death count would be massive. As Bai Zimin watched the lapiodite fragment slowly begin to overheat, he waited patiently and did not press for an immediate response. Shang Guanbingshui only showed initial surprise, but her emotions soon calmed down completely. Honestly, she didn't care too much about how many enemy soldiers or soul evolvers died. If they were enemies, then naturally some would die and some would live. Therefore, she observed the expressions on the faces of the two men inside the room and analyzed what they might be feeling based on their facial expressions. Chen He's expression was that of a hesitant and even insecure man. It was clear from the erratic movement of his eyes as well as the constant fidgeting of his fingers that his emotions were not at ease and his thoughts were heavy enough to not let him stay steady in one place. On the other hand, Bai Zimin's expression was completely opposite to Chen He's one. His face was faintly illuminated by the mysterious blue flame burning in the furnace, his black eyes reflected the flame softly while glittering with a hint of mysticism, his jaw was firm and well delineated, all his features showed self-assurance and self-confidence. Shang Guanbingshui could not help but feel that although Chen He was older than Bai Zimin in terms of age, in terms of demeanor and attitude he lacked a lot comparatively speaking. While observing the opposite behavior of the two men as if they were black and white, Shang Guanbingshui unconsciously felt that a self-confident yet firm man was undoubtedly far more attractive than a hesitant one. Of course, Shang Guanbingshui was fully aware that Chen He's hesitation was completely normal and Bai Zimin's firmness in his decision was the abnormal thing here. After all, Bai Zimin was basically asking to massacre and oppress, something that a person who 2 months ago was studying to become a high government official like Chen He could never accept so easily. After what seemed like an eternity, Chen He finally responded. "All right, let me do it." Shang Guanbingshui could not help but be surprised again, and even though her face hid her emotions she looked at her childhood friend with eyes that practically spoke for themselves. It was as if she were silently saying, "Are you sure about that?" Bai Zimin didn't say much, he simply nodded and continued to watch the small blue flame at work as he casually tossed an unclassified soul stone into the furnace. "I'll do it, but I can't do it alone." Chen He pushed as he noticed that Bai Zimin didn't say anything. "Of course." Bai Zimin finally looked at him and calmly said, "You can mobilize the Blood Whip Legion troops. Let Fu Qigong help you in case you need to plan something. I'm sure that as a former military man he will be able to give you good advice, and considering that he was previously betrayed by his former superior he definitely won't hold back. However, if possible I would prefer that you use brute force and leave the higher UPS of the Baiquan Camp with no choice but to surrender." Chen He looked at Shang Guanbingshui for a moment and as if he had made an important decision straightened his back and said in a deep voice, "Understood. When do you want me to start?" Bai Zimin smiled faintly and said calmly, "Before you attack, send a messenger." Let Fu Suifeng do it. I want him to leave a letter where the Baiquan camp will be given 24 hours to surrender and hand over their forces willingly to our transcendent faction. Otherwise, when I, Bai Zeman, step upon their base, the conditions they will receive will not be so good. What? Why not just attack by sneak attack? It would be a lot easier and our side will suffer fewer casualties. Chen He gawked at him. Shang Guanbing Shui sighed and replied in Bai Zeman's place. While it might be a little easier to defeat the Baiquan camp with a surprise attack, endless trouble will come in the future. But if even after they were granted enough time to prepare they are crushed, no one in the future will dare to object to Bai Zeman's rule and his grip on the enemy forces will be stronger than ever. Bai Zeman looked at her with slight surprise but then smiled and said calmly, it seems we think alike. No. Shang Guanbing Shui shook her head and rolled her eyes as she said, I just know you well enough to know a little about how crazy you are. Ha 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 ha. Thank you. It wasn't a compliment. Chen He's mouth twitched several times as he watched from the side. Apparently, in fact, things were more complex than they seemed to him. Then, I'll go pass your order to Fu Suifeng and use those 24 hours to prepare the manpower. Chen He said and then added, Bing Shui, can you help me? Your prestige among the men who just joined the Blood Whip Legion that arrived from the north will definitely make everything smoother. Shang Guanbing Shui frowned slightly upon hearing this. Bai Zeman would perhaps need her ice maker skill to forge and besides she had yet to hear the favor he needed to ask to her. However, she could not deny that Chen He's words were indeed reasonable so she found herself in a dilemma about what to do. But Bai Zeman decided for her. Go with him. He said calmly and while turning his back to the two of them used the tongs to remove the red-hot lapidite fragment, besides, go with him to the front as well. What? Shang Guanbing Shui looked at his broad back in surprise. Why are you so surprised? Bai Zeman gave her a sidelong glance and said in an indifferent voice, even though Chen He is powerful, we can't be sure that there isn't a soul evolver stronger than him among the enemies, can we? Chen He's eyes lit up upon hearing this. Although he was confident that he could crush the enemy's war tanks and any interference, he naturally wouldn't refuse to spend time with his crush even if this was a one-sided love. I guess that you're right. Shang Guanbing Shui was forced to nod even though she somehow felt that something was not right here. Then, she added, will you be alright with your forge? Don't worry. Bai Zeman waved his hand casually and said calmly, even if I lose a few stuff it will all be due to my own incompetence. Besides, from mistakes you learn. Before Shang Guanbing Shui could say anything, an amused voice came from outside. Even though I don't have an ice skill as powerful as Bing Shui's, maybe I can help you with this. Everyone looked outside and noticed Wu Yujun standing a few meters behind Chen He. She was holding a bottle of water, but the main issue was that the water that by nature should be inside the bottle was actually floating in midair and dancing around her casually. That is. Bai Zeman's eyes widened as he saw the capacity to levitate water that Wu Yujun displayed with a proud smile on her beautiful face. Shang Guanbing Shui and Chen He were also clearly shocked as none of them could stare away as the small rush of water gently swirled around her. Honestly, I wanted to hide this skill until my monostats were high enough to do something meaningful. But I guess it's also okay to show it now. Wu Yujun said with a smile and then frowned slightly as she seemed to focus on something else. The water around her clearly received some sort of command as it gradually and slowly began to ease up the movement. Then, it floated a few millimeters from the mouth of the bottle and very slowly began to fall inside once again. Although the movement was slow and clearly inexperienced as it took several seconds to perform the feat, Wu Yujun managed not to lose even a single drop of water in the process. Is that water manipulation? Bai Zeman asked in pleasant surprise. Since Wu Yujun was one of the faction's greatest high commanders and the deal of support she had given so far to the faction's development were enormous, Bai Zeman had allowed her to learn the skills she thought were useful to her instead of handing them over to the base. Furthermore, as a first-order existence, Wu Yujun naturally enjoyed benefits that a normal soul evolver did not. Therefore, it was no wonder that Bai Zeman did not know about the existence of her acquiring such a peculiar skill since unless Wu Yujun herself decided to show it no one would ever know about it. Moreover, judging from the expressions of Shang Guanbing Shui and Chen He, Bai Zeman came to the conclusion that Wu Yujun really had not told anyone about this new skill of hers. It's not water manipulation. Wu Yujun shook his head and entered the workshop as he said with a small smile, but, even though it's really not as good as your blood manipulation skill, this hydrokinesis skill allows me to control water almost with complete freedom and even create almost ice-level frozen water. Oh. Bai Zeman felt curious and approached her as he said, would you mind sharing that skill with me? Sure. Wu Yujun replied sweetly and stretched her hand forward. Shang Guanbing Shui and Chen He looked at each other for a moment in confusion only to see the next moment see Bai Zeman take Wu Yujun's hand and say to her. You just need to think about the record you want to share. In this case, focus on me and this skill called hydrokinesis. Okay. Wu Yujun nodded and began to do what Bai Zeman had just explained to her. However, apparently it was not as simple as Bai Zeman thought it would be since even after several seconds Wu Yujun had not succeeded. But after thinking about it for a moment, Bai Zeman realized that clearly sharing a specific record with another existence naturally could not be easy. After all, doing so meant that they would temporarily be duplicating that record, which at the same time, meant increasing the soul burden of both beings. From a certain point of view, he was really an anomaly for accomplishing such a thing on the first try. But Wu Yujun was also a rare talent. It didn't take her more than a few seconds to discover the trick and she finally succeeded. However, the unthinkable happened. Again, as if an electric shock of several thousand volts coursed through their bodies from their joined hands, both of them were forced to separate immediately as a reflex action. Wu Yujun's face turned slightly pale but in contrast to the first time she did not feel overwhelming pain as when Bai Zeman tried to share his record with her. Seeing the change in Bai Zeman's expression and the pale face of her best friend and practically her sister, Shang Guanbing Shui closed the distance of a couple of meters immediately and supported her as she hurriedly asked, Yujun. Are you okay? Why yet? Wu Yujun nodded with a slightly gloomy face. Bai Zeman frowned tightly, but this was not due to pain, such pain to him was insignificant despite not feeling well at all. The reason behind his deep frown was that with what had just happened the theory why he could not share his record with her because his soul was too powerful had now been practically crushed into thousands of pieces. Wu Yuzhen's soul was naturally far weaker than Bai Zimin's soul. Not only was she several levels below him, but the quality of soul power by which both of their souls were composed was like trying to compare the skies with the earth. There was simply no comparison to be made as the two sides were worlds apart. So what was the real reason why they had just received such a heavy shock? Bai Zimin felt that he was close to finding the answer, but just when it seemed to be there, Shang Guanbingshue's voice made that thought disappear. What just happened? Bai Zimin looked at her and noticed that she was looking at him in confusion with clear concern. He sighed and shook his head as he said, "Believe me, I am as lost as you are about this." Shang Guanbingshue frowned and after a few moments thought she corrected her previous question. "Let me rephrase it then. What were you two going to do but failed and received some backlash strong enough to make Yuzhen's face go from healthy to sickly in an instant?" Bai Zimin sighed again and gave a brief but concise summary of what he tried to do. He also included that the day before he and Wu Yuzhen had tried when she was in his villa, but they had failed miserably as well. Although Chen He and Shang Guanbingshue felt it was a bit peculiar that Wu Yuzhen had been at Bai Zimin's house yesterday, both of them did not say anything about it. On the other hand, Chen He said, "Are you sure this works?" "Of course I am sure." Bai Zimin looked at him. "I've tried it with Lily and everything works perfectly." "Lily?" Chen He and the two girls were at a bit of a loss before they remembered. Because Lilith was gone, she had left a clone of herself with the appearance of Lily. However, that clone could only perform simple actions and wasn't very smart, so it had been working in Bai Zimin's house doing soft jobs, and thus Shang Guanbingshue and the rest hadn't seen her much recently. To be honest, I was very surprised when I failed to share a certain important record with Wu Yuzhen yesterday when she visited my room. Bai Zimin said without thinking too much, but the theory she had put forward regarding the setback was quite solid, so I didn't attach too much importance to it. However, now that even when she tries to share a record with me this happens, even though the pain experienced was much less compared to if I tried, I'm afraid things aren't as simple as soul power difference. Your room. Shang Guanbingshue couldn't help but stare at Bai Zimin, catching some words and meanings that surprised her. Yes. Is something wrong? Bai Zimin also looked at her, only that compared to the somewhat awkward look Shang Guanbingshue was giving him, his was a confused look. Without waiting for her good sister or anyone else to say anything, Wu Yuzhen hurriedly interjected, "He called me to his room to discuss an important matter that you will soon learn about." Just that. Shang Guanbingshue's blue eyes shifted between Bai Zimin and Wu Yuzhen. It was quite obvious from the way she was looking at them that she somehow doubted the words Wu Yuzhen had just said. Bai Zimin was taken aback for a moment as he looked on, as Shang Guanbingshue looked a bit complicated and Chen He smiled slightly from the side. However, he didn't care too much about the matter and instead continued on to what really concerned him. "Wu Yuzhen, could you share your record with Chen He or with Bingshue? You think the problem is you?" She looked at him. "Something like that." Bai Zimin didn't explain too much and simply nodded. "I'm sorry to have to ask this to you, although there's pain in failing." Okay. Soon, Wu Yuzhen and Chen He held hands first. She focused on her hydrokinesis skill and wished to share that record with him. Both of their faces contorted a little in pain and their faces turned slightly pale. But just when Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbingshue thought they were going to fail, Chen He said with surprise in his voice, "Oh, now I understand why you said it's a powerful skill despite the clear problems it imposes." "Success?" Shang Guanbingshue asked hurriedly. "Yes, it worked." Wu Yuzhen nodded and naturally disengaged her hand from Chen He's. Then she added, "Even though it is an extremely uncomfortable feeling and I honestly don't want to do it again, I did feel a small part of my soul and part of his soul come together for an instant." Chen He nodded and added excitedly, "Indeed. That little part of Yuzhen's soul represented the record of her hydrokinesis skill from what I could see. I didn't know we could do something like that. Let me try." Shang Guanbingshue approached Wu Yuzhen and took her by the hand. "This time, I will try to share the record of a skill of mine with you." "Okay." Wu Yuzhen nodded easily. Both beauties' faces wrinkled a little, giving the impression that they had eaten something ugly, but after they released their hands and their faces returned to normal, Wu Yuzhen said cheerfully, "I could see it. Besides, the uncomfortable feeling I felt with you for some reason was a lot less than what I felt with Chen He before." "I know. But you're right, the feeling is quite uncomfortable for my taste. After doing these weird experiments I really don't want to do this anymore." Shang Guanbingshue shook her head. "Bingshue, can you and I try it now?" Chen He proposed and extended his hand towards her while looking at her with his characteristic faint smile. Shang Guanbingshue looked at him, and seeing the smile on his face, she sighed. Chen He was really handsome and his good looks had increased even more after the advent of the soul record and the constant evolution through the purification of his soul. He truly had the ability to drive countless women crazy with just a smile. Unfortunately, it was unlikely that any feelings would be born on her part to him when it had not happened yet, despite all the years they had spent together. Just as she was about to politely decline, she noticed that Bai Zimin was watching everything from the side in silence. Intrigued, she asked, "Bai Zimin, did you find out anything?" Bai Zimin rubbed his chin and looked at the blue flame burning in the furnace. "This is just a theory, but what if the reason why we sometimes succeed and sometimes don't, as well as the reason why we sometimes experience different degrees of pain in our soul, is due to our soul's affinity with each other's soul? Affinity of our souls with each other's souls." Everyone looked at him in surprise. Bai Zimin continued as if he was talking to himself. "Just like water and fire, if we take two masses with equal power, one hot and one cold, the result will be that the two will clash because they are opposites, and in between the clash steam will be produced. If we take that steam as the pain resulting from the collision between two opposite poles, then I think it is quite logical. Just like water and fire, if we take two masses with equal power, one hot and one cold, the result will be that the two will clash because they are opposites, and in between the clash steam will be produced. If we take that steam as the pain resulting from the collision between two opposite poles, then I think it is quite logical. In the past, the existence of something as abstract as the soul of a person or of a living being, in general, was simply a theory, a sort of specter or energy that under a series of ideas or evidence not scientifically proven ended up becoming a mystery. However, with the arrival of the unknown entity called soul record, whose purpose was also a mystery, the existence of the soul in the body of living beings was immediately confirmed. The reason why the existence of the soul came to light was thanks to the mana that the seemingly omnipotent soul record awakened. When the mana awakened, the intelligent beings on earth were able to sense within their bodies that diffuse energy in the form of a mist called soul. The soul of a living being was the very representation of force. Not only the physical force, but the soul also represented vitality, strength, power, stamina, agility, etc. The soul represented the limits of the body of each living being, and the way in which everyone could have access to their soul was through the status window that displayed with the will of the soul evolver. When a living being absorbed part of the soul power of another living being, the soul of the number one living being became more powerful, and therefore the statistics increased, since the limits that represented the capacity of that living being received a boost that we could notice or not notice thanks to the status window. However, although the soul was basically the representation of the capacity of each living being, among mankind there were always different theories or thoughts about it. For example, romantically speaking, there was a famous phrase that had traveled the world, and regardless of culture surely every human being had heard at some time in their lives: soulmates. What were soulmates? This was a question that had no clear answer, since the existence of the soul itself was a mystery. However, there were many theories and definitions for romantics who firmly believed in the existence of the love of their lives. The most popular thought concerning soulmates was that, when two people were soulmates, the degree and the depth of affinity reached the maximum possible between the two. This could involve similarity, love, romance, platonic relationships, comfort, intimacy, sexuality, sexual activity, spirituality, etc. Therefore, humans have always asked themselves at least once unconsciously, if soulmates exist, where is mine? Is she/he the right one? Is this love true or false? So, when Bai Zimin talked about the affinity between two different souls, the reactions of the people in the workshop were different. Sheng Guanbing Shui looked deep in thought as she stared at no one in particular, so it was extremely difficult to understand what her thoughts or feelings were regarding what she had just heard. Wu Yujun had a considerably bad expression after hearing Bai Zimin's theory. As for her, the fact that their souls were not compatible was simply like receiving a bad omen in the middle of a storm. As for Chen he looked quite fearful. His expression turned from having a warm smile to seriousness, and he looked at her outstretched hand with hesitant eyes. Anyone who paid attention to him would immediately understand that he was no longer so sure about wanting to take his beloved's hand to check if they could share records. As for Bai Zimin, he was unable to appreciate the different emotions of each as he was staring at the small flame in the furnace. It was only after several seconds of silence that he turned his face and, noticing the awkward atmosphere, said with a smile, "Why are you all taking it so personally? Didn't I just say it's just a theory? I'm not saying that my words are 100% factually correct. In fact, most likely everything I said isn't even close at all." However, none of the three said much even after hearing this. The main problem lay in the fact that Bai Zimin was analyzing everything from a logical point of view and had left out emotions. The aspect of soulmates or romanticism never crossed his mind while he was elaborating the above theory based on what happened. However, this was thanks to the passive effect of Stoneheart. Those who did not have a powerful skill to keep their minds away from emotions did not enjoy such a privilege. After a moment of silence, Sheng Guanbing Shui interjected, "I think that while it might not be as you say, your words make quite a bit of sense if you ask me. Besides, I just came up with a somewhat far-fetched idea." "Oh." Bai Zimin looked at her. Since she was apparently the only one capable of reasoning with clarity at the moment, he asked, "Can you tell me more about this idea of yours?" However, Sheng Guanbing Shui shook her head and said with apparent calm, "I'm afraid I better not do that right now. However, I would like us to try to see if between the four of us we can share our records, since this idea I just thought of will depend on that in order to be feasible. If it can be carried out, in the first place, that's fine for me." Bai Zimin shrugged his shoulders. Wu Yujun also nodded without saying too much, but it was clear that the unease still lingered in her heart. This. Chen He, on the other hand, hesitated. But seeing that everyone was looking at him, he finally gritted his teeth and nodded, "Okay. Let's do it then." There was no place to run. Besides, thinking back, wasn't this also a good opportunity? If he and Sheng Guanbing Shui could share records, then it meant that, even if Bai Zimin's theory wasn't 100% correct, his soul and hers had some synchronicity. Sheng Guanbing Shui looked at him without saying anything, and her eyes flashed uncharacteristically. Then, Bai Zimin looked at the three people in front of him and slowly said, "The result of me trying to share my records with Wu Yujun was failure. The result of Wu Yujun with Chen He could be said to be a rather poor success, as the discomfort they both felt was not pleasant at all." Sheng Guanbing Shui continued with what he was saying, "As for Yujun and myself, even though I was indeed able to see the record of her hydrokinesis skill, the feeling of rejection was still there. It was probably the same as what she felt with Chen He, wasn't it?" "Yes. I honestly prefer not to do that again." Wu Yujun nodded and said earnestly, "Even though when I try to share records with Bai Zimin I feel pain, my soul doesn't reject his like with Chen He. I think there is definitely something strange here. Follow US stories at nvel/by/n.com. Bai Zimin rubbed his chin for a moment and then nodded, "I see. I guess there's still a lot to learn regarding soul power and soul record." But after he said these words he laughed at himself. How could there not be much to learn? This journey was just beginning for all of them after all. So, shall we begin? Sheng Guanbing Shui looked at Bai Zimin and Chen He. "That leaves the three of us. Yujun already made her attempt with each of us." "All right." Bai Zimin and Chen He nodded. "So, do you two want to try first or?" Bai Zimin looked at Chen He since a few moments ago he seemed eager to try. Bai Zimin himself didn't care who went first or last, to him this was just a minor analysis for further study, as they were just scratching the top of the secrets of the soul. Chen He seemed anxious, just like before. However, this time he was anxious about the results that would come out. For some reason, he wanted to delay the inevitable, but a soft, neutral voice beat him to it. "Then, I'll go first with Chen He." Sheng Guanbing Shui said and extended her white palm forward as she looked at her childhood friend. Chen He looked at the beautiful hand suspended in the midair, waiting for him to take it. For a moment, he simply stood there, stunned, staring at it. How many times had he dreamed about holding her hand? Probably too many to remember. However, little did he expect that when the opportunity would finally show itself to him it would be in such circumstances where his heart could not rest easy due to the constant anxiety born of negative thoughts. Shang Guanbingshui naturally understood what Chen He was thinking, therefore she did not press. This could be the opportunity to show her precious friend that they were that and only that, friends. She really appreciated Chen He very much, however, the appreciation she felt for him was that of a friend for her childhood friend. It could even be said that she saw him as a caring brother. Therefore, she really hoped that he would be happy. Unfortunately, even without joining hands to feel each other's soul, Shang Guanbingshui was somehow sure that there could only be one ending here, an outcome that Chen He would surely not like but which would perhaps help to kill all possible hope. After almost 2 full minutes of silence, Chen He finally took several deep breaths and extended his hand forward. Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun easily noticed how Chen He's usually firm and confident hand trembled slightly for every inch it moved forward, closing the distance with Shang Guanbingshui's clearly smaller hand. Just as his and her hand were about to touch, Chen He stopped his movements as if hesitating. However, Shang Guanbingshui closed that small breach by taking a small step forward and casually grabbing Chen He's hand. Chen He's mind went blank for a moment at the velvety softness that filled his senses when his hand came into contact with Shang Guanbingshui's hand. He felt as if he were touching the most expensive silk in the world and his heart pounded madly just by touching such a casual part of her body as her hand was. However, Chen He did not have much time to enjoy the sensation that was transmitted to his brain through the palm of his hand because the next moment his face turned pale as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight. Shang Guanbingshui, not wanting to delay this any longer than necessary and not feeling too comfortable even though the hand she was holding was that of a good friend, hurriedly followed the steps previously explained by Bai Zimin and sent the record of one of her passive skills towards Chen He. When that small fragment of her soul was surrounded by Chen He's soul, not even 2 seconds passed when both of their faces turned pale. As if a blazing fire were burning between their hands, Shang Guanbingshui and Chen He hurriedly let go and walked several steps away with white faces. A thin trickle of blood dripped from the corner of his mouth while she held a hand to her chest as if she were experiencing great suffering. Bai Zimin and Wu Yujun's faces changed at the same time and they both stepped forward to hurriedly support them. Are you all right? Bing Shui. Chen He. The pained expression on Shang Guanbingshui's face was on the level of Wu Yujun's when she tried to do the same with Bai Zimin the day before. On the other hand, Chen He looked even worse as if not for Bai Zimin's quick support he might have collapsed after stepping back a couple of steps. It's no good. Shang Guanbingshui shook her head as with Wu Yujun's help she rested her weight on the work table. His soul and mine are too different. The rejection is just too high. The rejection is just too high. When those words came out of Shang Guanbingshui's mouth, Chen He's already pale face turned even paler and a thin trickle of red blood silently slipped out of the corner of his mouth, dripping softly onto the ground. Seeing this, Bai Zimin hurriedly used his own blood manipulation skill and sent a small but powerful flow of mana and magic into Chen He's body. Just as Chen He instinctively tried to protect himself against the invading energy, Bai Zimin's voice stopped him. Do not resist. Let me help to calm your disturbed blood flow. Chen He nodded silently and as Bai Zimin supported him to sit on another work table his mind was in chaos as he stared at a fixed point with lost eyes. Even as he felt the pain recede rapidly and his altered blood flow returned to normal, he failed to feel better at all. Because just as Shang Guanbingshui had just said, the rejection between both souls was too huge. In fact, Chen He clearly felt how it was Shang Guanbingshui who restrained her own soul or else the damage his soul would have received when he tried to get closer would have been a lot greater. Shang Guanbingshui shook her head as if she were a bit dizzy and did not speak too much. Only Wu Yujun's soft voice was heard as she moved between her two friends trying to check their conditions. However, since the problem was internal and not external, there was nothing anyone could do. Even if Kong Lan were here, her healing skill couldn't do much since it could barely heal physical injuries, not soul ones. The soul was still a mystery to everyone on Earth despite now being aware of its existence, therefore, it was extremely dangerous to try to experiment with it. However, despite knowing what they were getting into, Bai Zimin's group took the risk. Regardless of what their motives might be, romantic or other, they all knew in their hearts that the world in which they now lived was no longer the safe Earth of the past. Risks were necessary to become stronger, and knowing at least one of the secrets of the soul would undoubtedly make them more powerful since the reason why they became stronger every time they absorbed part of the soul power of another living being was precisely because their own souls were strengthened accordingly. After several minutes, Shang Guanbingshui finally seemed to feel better as she walked off the work table and stepped closer to Chen He. Seeing his bitter look, she sighed in her heart. How could Shang Guanbingshui not be aware that the reason behind her friend's miserable appearance was none other than her soul's rejection of his? More than the actual pain experienced, Chen He's grief stemmed from Shang Guanbingshui's own spirit in essence fiercely rejecting his. If not for her restraining her soul, Chen He might have received real damage. That's how strong the rejection was. Chen He, are you fine? Chen He raised his head and looked at her for a moment, not immediately responding to her question. After a few moments, he smiled bitterly and nodded as he said softly. I'm fine. This small hurt will most likely heal after absorbing some soul power. It's not a big deal. Bai Zimin frowned and asked, do you think you will be able to carry out the attack on the Baekun camp? If you think it will be a bit heavy while you are not at your peak condition, then just let another legion move. However, Chen He shook his head and slowly stood up as he said. It is not necessary. I will let Fu Qigong prepare the soldiers. In the meantime, I will go hunt beasts and zombies to solve my problem. If you say so. Bai Zimin shrugged his shoulders. Wu Yujun looked at Chen He and asked worriedly, Chen He, you. Are you really all right? I'm all right. Chen He smiled slightly, not looking forced at all. He looked at Bai Zimin and asked, earlier, you said that this whole gist of the affinity between souls was just a theory, right? That's right. Bai Zimin nodded indifferently. Even though I have my basis for saying what I said, I am just a mote of dust in the midst of this great universe. It is impossible for me to know everything, let alone about something as mysterious and mystical as the soul. I see. Chen He nodded and didn't say much more. He just looked at Shang Guanbingshui and walked towards the exit. Shang Guanbingshui shook her head while Wu Yujun looked at the two of them with complicated eyes. As two of the people who knew best about Chen He, both women knew perfectly well that he had used Bai Zemin's words to find an escape from what had just happened. However, what Bai Zemin said was the truth. All this was just a theory with no real basis other than small coincidences based on events that could have unfolded by different coincidences of diverse magnitudes. Therefore, it was also acceptable for Chen He to do what he did. Just as Chen He was leaving, he suddenly seemed to think about something and stopped. I almost forgot. It still needs to be tested if you two are successful in sharing soul records. Chen He said as he looked at Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui. Shangguan Bingshui looked at Bai Zemin. She also seemed to want to give it a try as her blue eyes seemed interested in the proposal despite the sickening discomfort she felt when that feeling of rejection enveloped her whenever her soul rejected others. However, Bai Zemin shook his head and said calmly, we'd better leave it as it is. Although I have yet to check if I can share my records with you and Bingshui, both of you are clearly not in optimal condition. Let's forget all this soul affinity stuff for now and rather focus on absorbing as much soul power of the highest quality as possible to become more powerful. I think we may be getting too far ahead of ourselves by trying to experiment with our souls. I'm afraid if something goes wrong there could be major problems that no one wants to see. I see. Chen He nodded after thinking about it for a moment and was secretly surprised to feel relieved. Was he scared of the possible outcome? Of course, he was afraid. What if Bai Zemin and Shangguan Bingshui managed to unite part of their souls while holding hands? Chen He was not willing to see such a thing happening. Even if he had decided to think that the theory put forward by Bai Zemin was fruitless and riddled with defects, unconsciously he did not want his childhood crush to succeed in doing with another man what he could not do with her. Therefore, when he heard that Bai Zemin did not want to continue the matter temporarily, Chen He felt a little relieved even though he really wanted to see the final outcome. Without saying anything else, he quietly walked away. On the other hand, Shangguan Bingshui pursed her pink lips a little at Bai Zemin's words. Her beautiful blue eyes flashed with a glint of deception, however, she did not say anything about it as she was fully aware that what he had just said was completely valid and rational. It was just that Shangguan Bingshui really wanted to know what the outcome would be when Bai Zemin's soul tried to embrace hers or vice versa. Oddly enough, she was really looking forward to that moment. The beautiful ice princess was a bit surprised to realize that she felt as if she were a little girl anxiously waiting for the Christmas present under the little tree. In fact, even though mostly Shangguan Bingshui's expression did not change too much, Wu Yujun noticed the clear deception in her eyes. However, Wu Yujun did not think too much of what she saw and Shangguan Bingshui did not think too much of what she felt either. Therefore, despite and regardless of how complicated both women might feel about what had just happened or what did not happen, none of them mentioned the matter of soul affinity. At least not regarding the experiments as Shangguan Bingshui couldn't get something out of her head. Hey, Bai Zemin. She said as she watched him set everything up to start working. He looked at her with questioning eyes. About Lily but... Shangguan Bingshui asked calmly and neutrally indifferent as always, you really were able to share your records with her even though she's just a normal human. Ah, that. Bai Zemin's eyes flashed as if he understood something and nodded calmly, in fact. When I shared my records with her, her soul didn't feel the slightest rejection towards mine and my soul seemed to feel very comfortable with hers. That was precisely why I mistakenly assumed that everyone could share their records with different existences since when I did it with Lily in the past I never felt any kind of anomaly. Only now I know that nothing is as simple as I thought. Perhaps, this theory of mine is wrong after all. I see. Shangguan Bingshui nodded after a moment of silence. When she looked to the side, she was surprised to see Wu Yujun staring at her. Although Wu Yujun felt it was somewhat strange for Shangguan Bingshui to ask such a question, she soon seemed to realize that her friend was doing this for her. After all, it was no secret that she was in love with Bai Zemin. Wu Yujun thought it was most likely that her good sister was trying to ask the question in her place and thus prevent Wu Yujun herself from being embarrassed or ashamed by asking such a question. After all, the meaning of that question would change if it was Wu Yujun who asked it because of her feelings. Therefore, after thinking about this, Wu Yujun gave Shangguan Bingshui a look of thanks. Riyadh updated stirise at n//vel/bin.com. However, Shangguan Bingshui was extremely confused in her heart as she noticed Wu Yujun's look of thanks. Why was she silently thanking her? Shangguan Bingshui was dumbfounded about it. Just as the three people inside Bai Zemin's workshop were silently recapping what had happened, hurried footsteps from outside caused the guard of the three to rise unconsciously. Even if this was a forbidden area for most, nothing was 100% safe. Bai Zemin, are you inside? A sweet voice sounded from outside. Wu Yujun and Shangguan Bingshui immediately recognized Cai Jingai's voice. However, both women noticed the close manner in which she referred to him, shocking them. After all, this was the first time both women were present to hear Cai Jingai calling him by name and not leader or king. The two girls looked at each other silently, noticing the peculiar glint in each other's eyes. They silently grasped that apparently Cai Jingai and Bai Zemin were closer than they really seemed. At least, they were close enough that she could completely ignore the power scale and address him by his full name. Come in. Bai Zemin replied calmly. Cai Jingai wore leather armor that hugged her petite body perfectly, giving her figure the grace and seduction that belonged to her by nature but that normal clothing could not do justice to. She looked truly beautiful and the small but distinct curves of her silhouette gave her a charm that from a certain point of view was even higher than that of a woman with an explosive body like Nangong Lingzin. However, her beautiful face enhanced by evolution was tinged with anxiety as she stepped into the workshop. It was obvious that she did not bring particularly good news. Ah! A small sound of surprise escaped out of Cai Jingai's mouth involuntarily as she stepped into the workshop after opening the door and noticing that apart of Bai Zemin there were two other people present on the scene. She had crossed paths with Chen He on the way here so she incorrectly assumed that Bai Zemin was probably alone now, therefore, she didn't think too much when she called out his name earlier. Although Bai Zemin trusted Cai Jingai 99.9% because according to the skill attached to his title lower leader assured him that she would never betray him due to the title loyal follower he bestowed to her after sharing a tiny part of his soul with her in Kong Lan, in reality, they only acted close and without too much inhibition when they were in private. Therefore, both, Cai Jingai herself and Kong Lan, usually referred to Bai Zemin in a respectful manner in front of other people. It was also precisely because of this that Shang Guanbing and Wu Yuzhen were surprised when Cai Jing called by his name before, and apparently very naturally. This would be nothing strange in the past, as China was a country where people referred to another person by their full name as a sign of respect. However, now that a society based on noble ranks had been established within the newly named Transcendent faction, for a subordinate to call the higher leader by his full name could be seen as disrespectful. Cai Jing, is something wrong? Bai Zimin asked calmly despite seeing the slightly nervous and worried attitude of the beautiful girl who had just walked into his workshop. As for the matter of Cai Jing calling him by name, Bai Zimin didn't think too much about it. To him, such things were insignificant regardless of the difference in position within the faction. From Bai Zimin's real point of view, they were both comrades on the battlefield and comrades who had each other's backs. Cai Jing firstly bowed slightly to Shang Guanbing as Cai Jing herself was a noble level 2 while Shang Guanbing was a noble level 1. Shang Guanbing simply waved her hand gently and shook her head to indicate that there was no need to do such a thing in this situation. Then Cai Jing nodded with a smile towards Wu Yuzhen, with whom she shared a title of the same level. Finally, she looked at Bai Zimin and bowed deeply before speaking. A few moments ago, an envoy arrived from the Baiqun camp. He claims to be the nephew of the mayor of Baiqun Sub-District and demands the surrender of our group as well as handing over all armed forces. Shang Guanbing's eyes flashed weirdly when she heard this, and Wu Yuzhen couldn't help but shake her head while secretly forcing a wry smile. What a coincidence. Bai Zimin said with a grimace of disdain on his face. Turns out I was planning to attack them soon, but apparently they might have the same plan. That's good too. Riyadh updated stirise at n/vel/bin.com. He looked at Wu Yuzhen and asked, could you cool this metal? Apparently, I won't be able to get to work right away, and in the process, I'll be able to see what your new skill is capable of. Leave it to me. Wu Yuzhen nodded with a serious expression and immediately activated her skill hydrokinesis. Seeing the water floating before him, Bai Zimin didn't feel that it was too surprising. Even if she could levitate water, the temperature of the lapiodite fragment caused a large tub of water to evaporate in a matter of seconds. What could 500 milliliters of water do then? As if sensing Bai Zimin's doubts, Wu Yuzhen smiled slightly and explained in a calm manner. My skill hydrokinesis is a first-order level 4 skill from the moment I received the skill scroll after defeating a first-order black-scaled fish. While this skill does not allow me to manipulate the water element at will, as I currently cannot form solid objects and can only give simple shapes like spheres, and while this skill does not allow me to make water out of thin air like Bing Shui's skill, it could be said that hydrokinesis is a skill that is somewhere in the middle ground between manipulation and maker. Everyone inside the workshop felt as at the same time Wu Yuzhen's words came out of her mouth, the temperature fell slightly and a light mist of beautiful sapphire color surrounded the water ball. Hydrokinesis allows me to control the temperature of the water to some extent and also allows me to control the movements of the aquatic flow without spending any mana at all. However, the focus requirement needed to control this skill is quite high, and to top it off it consumes fixed mana points for every certain amount of time while the skill is active. Wu Yuzhen calmly explained as she made the ball of water at low temperatures envelop the lapiodite fragment. Before the eyes of Bai Zimin and the other two ladies, the burning lapiodite fragment caused steam to rise towards the ceiling while the water Wu Yuzhen controlled seemed to be on the losing side. However, she seemed to send out a large sum of mana all at the same time as the temperature of the water plummeted even more to the point where it almost became completely frozen. The speed at which the water evaporated dropped tremendously and the red color of the metal slowly began to recede as the natural color gradually returned to normal. The more mana I use, the greater the effect shown by the skill hydrokinesis. Wu Yuzhen said with a slightly pale face. That's why I wanted to wait until my mana reserves were more prominent, so I could do something more noteworthy. I think this is already noteworthy enough. Shang Guanbing remarked as she looked at her best friend with a proud expression similar to that of an older sister proud of her little sister. Indeed. Bai Zimin nodded and reminded, I believe that when your plant empowerment skill and your hydrokinesis skill evolve to higher stages, the effect and synergy between these two skills will surely not disappoint anyone. If at some point Wu Yuzhen acquired the skill of making plants or growing plants, if at some point her hydrokinesis skill acquired the ability to make plants or crops grow faster, Wu Yuzhen would undoubtedly become an extremely terrifying existence as long as she was in favorable territory. Wu Yuzhen's eyes closed and her eyebrows curved into a crescent shape as she smiled sweetly. The small dimples that formed on her cheeks as she smiled made her cuteness and sweetness shoot skyward at rocket speed. She really is like a little succubus. Bai Zimin secretly thought as he saw the innocent expression on her beautiful face, creating a great contrast as far as her curvy body was concerned. In terms of face and body, Wu Yuzhen was the one who most resembled Lilith when it came to innocent yet seductive charm. After the lapiodite fragment cooled down, Bai Zimin simply left it on the work table as he was going to continue working when he solved the immediate important matter. Little friend, come back home. Bai Zimin squatted in front of the forging furnace and stretched out his hands towards the blue flame. Shang Guanbing had been curious regarding the strange deep blue flame, so now that Bai Zimin seemed to finally make his move, she felt that she could satisfy that curiosity of hers. Bai Zimin, that flame is a treasure. That's right. He said as with a swift and fluid motion the flame shrank to the size of a fist and struck his chest, disappearing beyond his sleeping clothes in an instant. Cai Jing and Wu Yuzhen looked at each other in shock while Shang Guanbing's sky-colored eyes widened slightly as she witnessed such a strange act. For an instant, the three ladies had thought that the flame was going to attack, but instead of hurting Bai Zimin it simply disappeared as if it had integrated with his body itself or simply vanished into nothingness. When Bai Zimin stood up and noticed the surprised looks the three ladies were giving him, he calmly explained, that blue-colored flame is actually an epic grade treasure that I obtained after opening the single green treasure orb that I acquired after slaying 4 of the 5 leaders of the goblin army that attacked the north camp back then. The eyes of the three ladies flashed with understanding when they heard this, and Shang Guanbing nodded as she said. But why are you talking to the fire? Her voice was somewhat awkward as was the way she was looking at him. But this was understandable considering that no matter how many crazy things were going on in the world, the fire was still just fire in everyone's eyes. Regardless of whether that fire was a treasure, Shang Guanbing felt that it should just be a more powerful fire than a normal one, but that was all. Bai Zimin chuckled and shook his head lightly. This treasure is called Endless Blue Lotus Flame, and while it is now an epic grade treasure, in the past it was a god-grade treasure. Or at least that's what the records engraved on the flame say. I don't know what a god-grade treasure is and not if it is the highest level of treasures, but I assume it must be pretty high on the chart and thus the endless blue lotus flame has its own will and conscience. It's just that after falling from god-grade treasure to epic-grade treasure, the endless blue lotus flame's conscience went into a state lower than semi-conscious. But even then, the flame still seems to understand my words after identifying me as its master. I see. That makes sense. Shang Guanbing Shui nodded in surprise as did the other two girls beside her. But, who would have thought that you would obtain such a valuable treasure? Now it will be much easier for you to forge and you will be able to launch more powerful attacks, right? Bai Zimin simply smiled slightly without commenting too much about it. To be honest, even he had no idea how powerful his fire-type attacks would be if he used the endless blue lotus flame's power when casting them. This. Cai Jing I interrupted. About the nephew of the Baiqun sub-district's mayor. You girls go to the meeting hall first, I'll go put on something more appropriate. Bai Zimin looked at his clothes and sighed. Even if the other party is just an ant, it won't look good for me to show up there wearing pajamas. After all, you have an image to take care of. Wu Yujun smiled teasingly as she looked at him. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. In the meeting hall where the functioning of the three legions of the Transcendent faction as well as the delivery of noble titles had been set up before, 3 people were in the company of Bai Zimin's head maid, who was there to serve them tea or deliver snacks if requested. 2 of the 3 men were standing behind a frivolous-looking young man whose eyes kept glancing at Qin Ming's curvy body. Damn it, these bandits dare to leave me waiting here and treat me as they please? Who do they think they are? The young man did not try to hide his voice at all. When Qin Ming heard the arrogant tone and scornful words of the young man of about 25 sitting on the couch no more than 5 meters away, her face trembled imperceptibly. In her heart, she scoffed at this person who clearly did not know the immeasurability of the heavens and the earth. It was this type of person that the young supreme leader of the faction hated the most and tolerated the least. If Bai Zimin did not appear, then all might be well. However, if Bai Zimin really did come? Qin Ming could only secretly shake her head as her lips curved upward slightly. When the young man sitting on the couch noticed the small smile on Qin Ming's pretty face he immediately felt heated. His name was Bai Jian and he was the nephew of Bai Yang, the mayor of Baiqun sub-district. Bai Jian's mother was Bai Yang's younger sister and from a very young age he was always loved by everyone in his family. He was always a respectful child who got good grades in school and never used his family's power to oppress anyone. However, this changed when at the age of 15 Bai Jian was rejected by the girl of his dreams. In the Baiqun sub-district, the mayor's authority was basically supreme and was only below the true ruler of the entire Yanqing district. Being one of the 4 highest authorities in Yanqing district along with 2 other mayors of large sub-districts as well as the general ruler of the district, Bai Yang's family naturally enjoyed a great number of benefits and the power in their hands was not small. It was just that Bai Jian was not fully aware of this until, after being rejected and in a fit of anger and sadness, he decided to order several people to kidnap this girl. After getting away with the girl's body, frightened by what he had just done, Bai Jian killed the girl and ordered to bury her corpse. However, he was a young man inexperienced in the world so he and his henchmen left a series of tracks that made the police get to the bottom of the matter, finding him as the culprit. It was then that Bai Jian discovered that his family had the power to protect him from the wind and rain. This was because despite what he had done, no one came to arrest him and the girl's family said nothing, moving to another part of the country after receiving a large sum of money. From then on, Bai Jian's respectful character practically disappeared completely and as if he started to relieve himself with all the women in the world due to his broken heart, he started to use his family's power to do whatever he wanted to do. How many women were affected because of Bai Jian? He no longer knew the number but probably more than a dozen. This number increased enormously as the world changed and due to the brilliance of his uncle Bai Yang, who mobilized the police forces of about half of the sub-district to establish a firm base in the midst of all this chaos. With so much power backing him up in a world where the powerful make the rules, Bai Jian felt like he was the king of the world and basically did whatever he wanted whenever he wanted. As Bai Jian became more and more impatient and seemed to be minutes away from attacking Qin Ming without caring at all that it was the enemy's base, the large wooden door opened wide. Follow US stories at nvl/by/n.com. Attracted by the sound, Bai Jian turned his gaze toward the fountain expecting to see the beautiful petite woman who had welcomed him several minutes ago. It's about time his words caught in his throat when he saw the most outstanding group of women he had ever seen in his 25 years of life. Shang Guanbing Shui in her demure but perfectly beautiful white dress which matched her flawless skin as smooth as that of a newborn baby made an appearance as her impossible to hide curves swayed tantalizingly with every step she took. Her cool gaze and slightly raised head were signs of a proud and arrogant woman capable of awakening both lust and desire for conquest in men. Wu Yujun wore a spring pink dress, her dark eyes seemed to sparkle playfully as she curiously looked at her surroundings. The curves of her body were clearly more striking than any of the 3 women who had just walked into the room due to her smaller stature and her baby face giving her the appearance of a baby-faced beauty with big breasts. Unlike the 2 aforementioned women, Cai Jing I was wearing her leather armor as due to her assassin evolution path her clothes were extremely comfortable. Her petite body coupled with her seemingly sinless smile created an extremely tempting image for men with particular tastes. In short, all 3 were undoubtedly beauties. Even more so after constantly evolving in the wake of soul purification and empowerment, which as a side effect improved physical appearance. Beauties. Great beauties. Bai Jian swallowed as he muttered. His eyes could not leave Wu Yujun's body and Shang Guanbing Shui's immortal fairy-like face. These 2 women were undoubtedly the greatest beauties he had ever seen in his entire life. Bai Jian was cursing himself for not coming on the previous occasions or otherwise these 2 beauties might already be in his arms. However, now that I'm here. He secretly chuckled as his lips curved upwards and he crossed one leg over the other, leaning back on the couch with an arrogant and confident look. Wu Yujun's eyebrows immediately furrowed as she felt the practically naked lust with which the young man on the couch was looking at her. If it was in the past then she might not mind since she was used to it, however, for some reason, she was not at all comfortable with that kind of eyes anymore, she wanted only a man to give her that kind of look. Cai Jing I did not have any reaction at all. She really didn't particularly care about the way men looked at her. From her point of view, Eyes didn't hurt but hands did. If any man thought he could extend his pig's feet towards her, then her dagger would probably end up stuck in the pig's throat. Shang Guanbing felt the gaze of the young man sitting on the couch and her blue eyes glittered chillingly. If it was in the past, she would have had to bear such impudent glares. However, with the way things were in today's world, even if she froze the offender to death no one would say anything. Much less considering her position within Bai Zimin's faction where she was above thousands and only below one. However, Bai Zimin, who was now dressed in casual clothes, gently taped on her arm as if telling her to hold on for now. Therefore, she reluctantly endured. However, her eyes were like daggers as the moment she sat up she looked at the person who seemed to be completely unaware of the danger in which he was. Bai Zimin sat up and surveyed the two men standing behind the young man. One of the men was wearing a black suit, he was tall, about 6 feet 2 inches in height. He had a shaved head and looked quite fierce with his powerful jaw. Furthermore, the aura exuding from his body made it clear that he was a first-order soul evolver whose level definitely could not be underestimated. The second man was less striking, slender, and of normal physical build. His eyes were slightly sunken inward and his small nose slightly upturned. Although Bai Zimin generally did not judge people by their physical appearance, this soul evolver whose power was also within the rank of the first order was quite ugly even after evolving so much. He looked quite a bit like a rat now so one could try to imagine how ugly he was before becoming a first-order existence. So, you are the rumored leader of this bandit faction? Bai Jian asked as he looked at Bai Zimin arrogantly. Of course, Bai Zimin didn't look at him yet and as he observed the two men he noticed that they both looked quite relaxed as they looked at XIETIAN and Wu Yujun. These two men probably felt that the soul power of the two women was lower than theirs due to the natural aura of their bodies so they were not too worried. As for Shang Guanbing and Bai Zimin, the two of them looked at Shang Guanbing several times because of her beauty but they did not seem worried. This was because Bai Zimin and Shang Guanbing's soul power was so far above both of them that none of the two noticed anything, which made them mistakenly think that both of them were just normal humans. After getting a rough idea of the other side's strength, Bai Zimin finally looked at the young man whose face was getting uglier and uglier after being rudely ignored. So, who were you again? He asked with a faint smile as the arrogance in his gaze grew to the point of completely disdaining the other side. Cai couldn't help but chuckle as the other two women who were sitting on the long leather couch looked indifferent. Even Qinming, Bai Zimin's head maid, had a slightly arrogant look on her face as she looked at Bai Jian. Since her master was someone powerful, she, as his employee, also deserved some respect. Just like the saying, before you hit the dog you must first look at the owner's face. No one could touch Qinming casually unless they were willing to suffer the rage of Bai Zimin. Bai Jian's face became serious as he straightened his posture and then leaned forward slightly. As he stared Bai Zimin in the eyes, he said in a deep voice, "You don't need to know who I am. You only need to know that if you don't hand over your power to me right now so that I can hand it over later to the higher UPS of the Baequan camp, your fate will be no different from that of a dying dog." Bai Zimin shook his head when he saw the attitude of this person in front of him. Although Bai Jian was older than Bai Zimin, Bai Jian's character was like that of an immature child. He, like all of Bai Zimin's enemies to date, could not see the immensity before his eyes and as a result would suffer a miserable fate. "I do not like your arrogance nor do I like your words. Let me tell you what I will do with you," Bai Zimin said as he leaned forward and looked at Bai Jian with a faint smile. "I will break your legs, your hands, then hand you over to my advanced troops to see with your own eyes how the Baequan camp you rely so much on collapses like a card castle in the middle of a storm. Then, I'll take you in front of your uncle and your good-for-nothing mother and let them decide if they'd rather keep you alive or die in your place. How's that? Doesn't sound bad, does it?" Bai Jian looked confused at first. However, after his brain processed what he had just heard, he began to laugh out loud as if he had gone mad. "Ha ha 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 ha. You want to destroy my uncle's Baequan camp? Laughable." Bai Jian managed to say in between his wild laughter, leaving aside Commander Jin Shun's over 10 war tanks and professional military troops, "My uncle has over 5,000 armed men and nearly 300 soul evolvers. You, a small warlord leading less than 10,000 survivors surely don't even count 5,000 armed men, let alone hundreds of soul evolvers. You will be crushed in an instant. Dumbass." Shang Guanbing could not help but say such word. Why did men have to be so stupid? She couldn't help but look at Bai Zimin secretly as the thought that he really was different from most took root more and more in her. Bai Jian had basically exposed the Baequan camp's government forces and part of the military forces due to his arrogance. As if that wasn't enough, he had also made it clear that despite having more than twice as many survivors in their base, the number of soul evolvers from the Transcendent faction was greater or at least not less at all. Bai Zimin and the rest felt that they were on the right track by prioritizing empowering humans instead of relying on firearms. Heavy weapons were very useful in the present day, it could be said that the one who controlled the largest amount of heavy weapons was the king. After all, the power of heavy machine guns had the ability to pierce the defenses of first-order creatures as long as the soldier managed to hit the enemy correctly. Taking into account that first-order creatures could still be considered as rarities and at least 80% of the soul evolvers should still be somewhere in the unclassified rank, the power of heavy firearms was indisputable. Not to mention the kings of the land, the mighty and almost unbeatable war tanks. Just the IFVM-3 possessed enough power to break the defenses of a second-order creature that did not specialize in defense. One could imagine then what the mighty war tanks could do. Probably even defense-focused second-order beasts would suffer under the cannons of these ferocious metal beasts that for years were mankind's most powerful mobile land weapon. The fact that the Baequan camp had around 10 battle tanks as Bai Jian had just revealed in a fit of anger expressed through his wild laughter slightly surprised Bai Zimin and the girls. After all, considering the current stage of the apocalypse, the Baequan camp possessed enough capacity to resist the attack of second-order beasts without major problems as long as it was not an agility-type beast and they had enough ammunition. In fact, as long as they had enough ammunition to replenish their weapons, the Baequan camp could defend against enemy attacks for at least a year considering the speed at which the beasts and zombies evolved it, unless they were unlucky enough to attract more than one second-order existence. However, Bai Zimin and leaders like Shang Guanbing, Wu Yujun, Chen He, and others had decided to focus primarily on developing soul evolvers instead of focusing on developing or searching for too many firearms. Basically, while the Baekwon camp relied on the firepower created by mankind in the past, the transcendent faction established by Bai Zemin's group decided to rely more on the power of evolved humans through continuous strengthening by absorbing the soul power of other living beings. At first, Bai Zemin had planned to let Chen He take care of this little problem. After all, he didn't have to do everything. However, suddenly the desire to know whether his Blood Spear Legion composed of over 700 soul evolvers or the several thousand men armed with modern and ancient weaponry of the Baekwon camp were more powerful. Therefore, he decided to stop wasting his time talking to insignificant beings. Evangeline, kill those two first. Before everyone could even react, the space inside the hall shuddered for a moment and in the next instant a silhouette appeared behind the two men standing right behind Bai Jian and were serving as bodyguards. The two men were first-order existences whose levels were between 30 and 35, they could be considered as elites among humanity and the fact that they reached that level and stage in just under 2 months was a commendable feat even if everyone's growth had accelerated due to the rapid growth of the world. The first instant Evangeline appeared behind them, both men immediately felt the change in the atmosphere as a huge killing intent weighed down on them. However, before they could even activate their skills, Evangeline's Death's Kiss dagger seemed to turn into a bright flash. Swoosh. Swoosh. The movements of the two soul evolvers who had probably been sent by the former mayor of the Baekwon sub-district stalled and their eyes widened. A moment later, a thin red line appeared on the tall man's throat. The black-suited soul evolver put both hands on his throat as he took several steps back. However, this did not stop at all the blood from slipping through his fingers. On the other hand, the smaller rat-like man felt a stabbing pain in his chest and when he clutched at the heart area the blood also began to gush out. It didn't take long for the two men to collapse on the floor, in their own pools of blood that slowly grew larger and larger. The smell of iron soon permeated the previously clean room and the silence prevailed as even the sound of insects seemed to stop. The face of Bai Jian turned as pale as a sheet when he turned back to look behind him and saw an incredibly beautiful foreign-looking woman gazing at him with the coldest eyes he had ever seen in his entire life. For the first time, Bai Jian felt death looming over him. Do you have any idea what you have done? He finally woke up and looked at Bai Zemin. His face was still pale and his courage seemed to have flown out the window as even his tone of voice no longer had that arrogance and superiority from before. I see that you are no longer as wild as you were a moment ago. Bai Zemin still had the same faint smile on his face, not worried at all even though with mere words he had taken the lives of two humans as if he was killing pigs instead of beings of his own kind. I don't like it when someone shows me disrespect. He said as he stood up and closed the distance between him and Bai Jian coolly. I also don't like it when a brat like you, who has no idea about how hard life is, threatens me. His hand moved at lightning speed and no one saw his movements with clarity. All they heard was the sound of bones cracking into what seemed like hundreds of small pieces followed by the boar-like cry of a pig being slaughtered from Bai Jian. The pampered young man of the Bai government family fell off the couch as his limbs were crushed beyond all recognition. He writhed on the floor and his back arched at different angles as his arms looked like old rags flying everywhere. Standing in the corner, Qin Ming's face was indifferent as she watched all this in silence. Her heart was not disturbed at all despite the bloody scene before her in which 2 lives were lost and the limbs of a third were crushed to dust. In the past, Qin Ming had suffered from Lei Su's physical abuse and had seen the atrocious things that the 4 previous leaders of the main base where Bai Zemin's forces were centered carried out. Although it had only been about a week of abuse, that single week made Qin Ming understand through beatings and torture that this new world was no different from a jungle where countless lions would fight to lead. Since Bai Jian was only a lamb and had challenged the fierce lion that Bai Zemin was, his fate was destined to be miserable. This was a certain fact that Qin Ming knew from before it happened. From the moment Bai Jian stepped into the hall while looking at everyone with disdain, Qin Ming was 100% certain that that young man would definitely not go back out the door he came in through using his legs. Do you want me to kill this man too? Evangeline asked calmly as she looked at Bai Jian in the same way a leopard would look at an ant. Nah. Bai Zemin shook his head and said with a faint smile, I promised to let him live so that he could see with his own eyes how his fantasy world self-built by his childish mentality protected by his family collapses with a single blow. Evangeline shrugged and said no more on the matter. As far as she was concerned, killing 2 or killing 3 made no difference. Why didn't you try to make those 2 men submit? Shang Guanbing Shui stood up and while looking at the corpses of the 2 soul evolvers. These 2 were definitely elites and could enter the 10 strongest even in our faction. Wu Yujun also had the same doubt so she looked at Bai Zemin. Her beautiful face that would previously pale at such sights remained impassive. Although she had not killed any humans so far, she had seen enough death that the loss of a few lives would either shock her or shake her core. Those 2 definitely wouldn't have submitted. Cai Jing replied in Bai Zemin's place. She looked at him with a faint smile and asked back, isn't that right, leader? Yes. Bai Zemin nodded and looked at everyone seriously before saying in a deep voice, this always happens in novels after all. The bodyguards of the young master who thinks he's invincible always attack the protagonist's group by shouting some arrogant words regardless of whether the protagonist suggests letting them go alive. Visit N. Felbin. CM for you ovals. Everyone was silent as Bai Jian fainted on the spot with white foam coming out of his mouth. The corner of Cai Jing's mouth twitched a couple of times when she heard this. However, she simply nodded and said in a low voice, yet. That's right. Asterisk. After locking Bai Jian in a vehicle prepared specifically for capturing wild beasts and studying them, Bai Zemin immediately began to give a series of commands. The first thing he did was to communicate to Chen He that the Blood Whip Legion did not need to move and when the talented archer asked dumbfounded why such a sudden change of heart, Bai Zemin simply said that the Blood Spear Legion would be moving to carry out the task that had previously been entrusted to him. While the Transcendent Faction's logistics team worked to prepare the necessary quantity of supplies so that the assault team that would be heading to the front lines would have a trip devoid of food needs, 600 soul evolvers were kept on standby inside the military barracks until the order to mobilize was received. Several soldiers prepared the vehicles while the mechanics team made sure that everything was in order. The citizens of the Transcendent Faction easily noticed the smell of gunpowder floating in the air. Seeing the modified vehicles constantly coming and going as well as the serious and even excited expression on the faces of the soldiers patrolling the streets, it didn't take a particularly smart person to know that something big was going to happen soon. While all this was going on, an off-road motorcycle shot off into the distance through the gate in a southerly direction. Approximately 20 hours later and under the care of Bai Zimin, almost all preparations were completed. Now it only remained to wait one more day until Fu Suifeng returned, and then the first large-scale war between soul evolvers and modern weaponry would be carried out. Several soldiers riding bikes rode through the streets of the Transcendent faction, and under the eyes of hundreds and thousands of citizens, they shouted from different points of the mini-city. His Majesty Bai Zimin has personally given the decree to move in a southerly direction. Our objective this time will be to control the forces of the Baekun camp and take over their resources, with His Majesty himself leading the attack. All those who have family in that area, do not lose hope. Once His Majesty reigns supreme, the living will one day meet again without a doubt. Many super survivors who only longed to live in peace and feared defeat were frightened when they heard the announcement of the impending war. However, despite being in the minority, there were many others who cheered loudly and shouted out loud the name of Bai Zimin while crying tears of joy when they heard that at least they would have a chance to, perhaps, see their loved ones again. The main road that led south from the base where the Transcendent faction was located to the Baekun camp was in the past filled with destroyed vehicles, trees that had been uprooted by some mutant beast or simply collapsed after being hit by some large vehicle, etc. The road was in such a deplorable condition that it was basically impossible to drive a vehicle, let alone a caravan of vehicles driving in that area. It was simply undoable unless a large number of human power was mobilized to slowly remove the trees and move the vehicles or other obstacles out of the way. After about a week's time, the troops that had been led by Zhongde shortly before Bai Zimin left for the north of the district had finally succeeded in clearing the road. While this now made it possible for vehicles to circulate basically without major problems except for certain areas where the road had been destroyed, in reality it also had certain consequences. For example, one of these consequences was that the Baekun camp finally discovered the location of the base called Beginning Village. When the united forces of the government and the military discovered that just at one day's distance there was a human camp with more than 1,000 survivors, everyone was thrilled. After all, 1,000 survivors was a large sum of human power, and from the Baekun camp's point of view such a camp should definitely not possess the power to oppose the weaponry they had. Unfortunately, during the first clash between Zhongde's advanced forces and the Baekun camp, the results did not satisfy the high command at all. The power of the more than 50 soul evolvers armed with heavy weaponry led by a brave young man like Zhongde caused some of the most prominent soul evolvers of the Baekun camp to be wounded, some of them even on the verge of death. Realizing that the other side had sharp teeth, the top commanders of Baekun camp had come to the conclusion that it would be best to try to have a trialogue. Through some pressure as well as some advantages, the beginning village would probably surrender, it was what they thought. Unfortunately, no matter how hard they tried, they were pushed back. Moreover, now that they were finally willing to fight a war, they were surprised to discover a couple of days ago that the small base with just over 1,000 survivors now numbered over 9,000. Inside the government building at Camp Baekun several people had gathered around a round wooden table, totaling 14 of them. 12 of these 14 people were actually important figures within the base, and a single word from each of them could easily decide the life or death of the others. So, a man around 50 years old but whose complexion still looked imposing surveyed the people around him and slowly said, "What do you think we should do about this beginning village, as they called the place where they are settling? Even though my nephew Baijian insisted on going and I even sent 2 powerful soul evolvers with him, I doubt very much that the leaders of the other party will easily submit. I think we should crush them," said a man dressed in military uniform wearing several medals. His stomach was slightly bulging, giving him the appearance of a woman 3 months pregnant, and his head was completely bald. His small fingers gave him a rather suspicious look, but no one inside the room dared to scoff at all. "Crush them? Commander Jin Shun, do you really think everything can be settled by using violence?" A young man wearing an extremely eye-catching violet-colored suit asked with a slight smile while hugging 2 beautiful women. This young man was Mo Zan. Mo Zan was only 27 years old, and in the past, he was the leader of a small gang. When the apocalypse fully broke out, together with several of his confreres, he managed to break through the ranks of power, and in a very short time he ended up becoming the most powerful soul evolver on the base after cooperating with Mayor Bai Yang. "Mo Zan, aren't you ashamed to say those words?" said a beautiful woman of about 29 to 30 years old. Her expression was proud and at the same time slightly cold as she watched Mo Zan enjoying the body of the 2 women, clearly awkward with the aggressiveness of the powerful soul evolver in front of so many people. This woman's name was Shen Mei, and although her strength was slightly lower than Mo Zan's, the number of soul evolvers under her command was higher since before the apocalypse broke out her husband had been a heavyweight in the sub-district mafia before he turned into a zombie. Mo Zan simply laughed and said nothing. However, it was obvious from the way he looked at Shen Mei that his thoughts were pure lust as he used his eyes to enjoy every curve of her form. "Mo Zan, Shen Mei." Bai Yang, the man who had spoken first, said faintly. Mo Zan simply chuckled and said nothing more while Shen Mei snorted. The 2 of them, despite their differences, were under Bai Yang's direct command. It was Bai Yang who controlled the most supplies and no one really knew where he hid them, so the vast majority of soul evolvers were under his control. On the contrary, the vast majority of military power rested in the hands of Jin Shun. With around 5,000 men armed to the teeth and several vehicles of all kinds prepared for war, there was absolutely no one who dared to underestimate this little fatty. The relationship between Bai Yang and Jin Shun had never been good. The 2 men secretly fought for supremacy, but no one really dared to take the first big step, so except for small fights under the table, no big things worth mentioning happened. Bai Yang knew how terrifying the firepower of heavy machine guns, IFVs, war tanks, and other modern machines under Jin Shun's command was. At the same time, Jin Shun was fully aware that while his modern weapons were terrifying, the mysterious power of the soul evolvers was not to be underestimated. So, the 2 of them reached a kind of equilibrium, and thus Baekun camp was enjoying somewhat of an inner peace. However, that did not mean that the 2 men did not secretly try to take over each other's power. For example, leaving aside Bai Yang and Jin Shun, the other 10 people were somehow related to the 2 of them. Therefore, the real power of the base was undoubtedly in the hands of these 2 men. When 2 of Bai Yang's allies jumped in to hit Commander Jin Shun's proposal, the commander's side naturally did not stand idly by, and soon the entire meeting hall became quite agitated. The 2 armed soldiers and police force officers guarding the entrance to the hall could even hear the voices from outside. However, None of them had any change in their expression, as this happened quite often when dealing with overly important matters. About half an hour later, the meeting continued in the same manner. Many raised ideas but most rejected, so the atmosphere quickly heated up. Damn it. Jin Shun slammed his fist on the table and blurted out, I've been telling all of you that we needed to placate those bandits for a month now, however none of you listened. Look now. Those damn bandits have become powerful enough to bear the weight of almost 10,000 people. EUW ovals up Tez on no/l/b.i.com. Hearing Jin Shun's anger-filled words, everyone immediately shut their mouths, and even Bai Yong frowned without saying anything. After all, if it was true Jin Shun had wanted to send 1 or 2 war tanks to the north, not to shoot, but as a dissuasive weapon. If it were before, it was highly likely that beginning village would collapse after seeing the 2 iron giants. However, such a thing was no longer possible because the high command of Baekun camp had sent several spies who had pretended to be survivors, so they knew a few things about the current situation of the enemy faction. The organization was pretty good, the security within the walls of the beginning village was basically perfect, the distribution of troops was strategic, the constant movement of soldiers and soul evolvers coming in and out with new supplies or survivors, etc. They definitely have some talented people with them. Bai Yong said calmly. Not only must they have some people with government backgrounds capable of forming a makeshift but firm cabinet, but they must also have the support of people with great military knowledge. Otherwise it is simply impossible for a bunch of bandits to form a turtle shell-like bastion like that. Bai Yong had secretly tried to corrupt several of the higher UPS in Bai Zimin's faction. However, he was surprised to find himself up against a huge, thick wall that he could not get through no matter how hard he tried. No matter what Bai Yong promised, be it beauties, status, using his position as a true member of the government, vast amount of supplies, soul record treasures, forged equipment, etc., everything was rejected. But Bai Yong had no way of knowing that unlike him, who made use of his position to sit in the seat he was in now, Bai Zimin had started from the bottom, and at least 90% of the people who followed him right now, in the past, were just workers, students, and even gang members or ex-convicts. In contrast to Bai Yong and Jin Shun, 90% of the higher UPS within the Transcendent faction raised and established by Bai Zimin had been saved by him in some way or another. These people not only respected Bai Zimin or were grateful to him, but also greatly enjoyed the many benefits promised and provided by Bai Zimin. Moreover, unlike Bai Yong and Jin Shun, who relied on the power of other people or modern weaponry, Bai Zimin was truly terrifying. All those who saw him in action at least one time had already lost all intention of betraying him, because they instinctively knew that this young man who was once just a normal college student would definitely rise to great heights. In the Transcendent faction, everyone knew that Bai Zimin was considerably fair. He did not mistreat those who did not deserve to be mistreated, did not murder those who did not deserve to be murdered, bestowed honor and glory on those who deserved it, and even did not make use of his power to take private property from others. Therefore, the vast majority preferred to follow him in silence rather than risk losing everything for a small improvement in status. If the traitors won, then all would be well. But if they failed, it was clear to everyone that Bai Zimin was by no means merciful, and even he himself made it clear that the traitors would be slaughtered and their families enslaved. No one wanted to risk before such punishment. Now that you mention it, didn't a girl named Wu Yujun claim to be Premier Wu Jianhong's granddaughter? Jin Shun suddenly looked at Bai Yong and leaned back in his chair as he slowly said, Mayor Bai, don't you think you should cede your position to this girl with the last name Wu? Humph. Bai Yong snorted. How could Bai Yong not understand the thoughts of an old fox like Jin Shun? If Bai Yong really surrendered his position, Jin Shun would definitely try his best to overthrow Wu Yujun and take full power. After all, in Jin Shun's eyes, dealing with an immature 23 or 24-year-old girl should not be too challenging compared to dealing with a cunning old man like Bai Yong. Just because that girl has the surname Wu doesn't mean anything. Bai Yong sneered, does someone who has the surname Xianyuan immediately become a relative of Sir President? Just because that girl has the surname Wu doesn't mean anything. Bai Yong sneered, does someone who has the surname Xianyuan immediately become a relative of Sir President? Hat. Jin Shun scoffed in a low voice and said no more about it. The thoughts of the two men were clear enough for everyone present to see. It was clear that while Jin Shun wanted to make Bai Yong hand over his position, Bai Yong was naturally unwilling to hand over the command of power he currently held. After all, who would be crazy or willing enough to give up everything to an unknown girl? Forget about an unknown girl, even if that girl named Wu Yujun really was the granddaughter of Premier Wu Jianhong, a person whose ambitions were growing more and more like Bai Yong would definitely not give up his strength so easily. Now that the world had changed and the old society collapsed, everyone had their own thoughts. Bai Yong and Jin Shun were no different, both men were ambitious enough to want to build a new China from the ashes of the old one and become the founding fathers of the new motherland. It had been almost 2 months, but the central government had sent no sign of any movement, so everyone firmly believed that the top leaders had fallen, or at least were not in a good enough situation to worry about anything other than themselves. Therefore, no one feared being labeled a traitor of the country. Besides, the winner was the king and the loser was the thief. Whoever succeeded in unifying all of China again will be the true hero, regardless of whether they were a rapist or a serial killer in the past. History books were written the way the winner wanted them to be written. Besides, even if that Wu Yujun girl really is the Prime Minister's granddaughter, she doesn't have the qualifications to revoke the position Wu Jianhong himself bestowed on me. Bai Yong finished as he saw the weird looks he was getting even from some of his allies. Damn old fox, Jin Shun snorted in his heart. Bai Yong's words were in a certain way true. After all, what if Wu Yujun really was the Prime Minister's granddaughter? It wasn't as if she could do anything about it anyway. Back to the main point, according to reports the leader of the other side seems to be named Bai Zimin. Bai Yong picked up a stack of documents and frowned. Although we managed to attract some soldiers from the other side as spies, they are actually just lower caste soldiers with no real position within the enemy establishment. In short, you spent resources for nothing. Jin Shun tried to put as much pressure on Bai Yong as possible whenever the opportunity appeared. Indeed, when Jin Shun said those words, the face of everyone inside the hall changed slightly and they looked at Bai Yong with questioning eyes. Resources were extremely valuable. Even more so after discovering that the land seemed to be experiencing certain problems, as no matter how hard they tried, all the planted seeds ended up strangely dying. Under such negative circumstances, every grain of rice consumed was 1 grain of rice less, and while it was true that Baekun camp enjoyed a good amount of meat, the reality was that with over 20,000 survivors to take care of the daily consumption was just too high. In contrast to Bai Zeman who possessed power high enough to go into a forest plagued by mutant beasts on his own, the soul evolvers of Baekun camp needed to plan for several days and set up large hunting teams before going into enemy territory. Therefore, it was no easy task to hunt mutant beasts and get the meat. In fact, there were many times when the losses outweighed the gains. Although the Baekun camp had a special soul evolver that possessed the ability to lure mutant beasts out of the forest, no one dared to accept the idea of luring the enemy out of the den. This was because if they managed to lure a few unclassified beasts then all would be well, but if they lured several first order to a large number of several thousand unclassified creatures then the security of the camp would be compromised. Under such circumstances where everyone was aware that a single mistake meant the end of everything, no one dared to be too bold. As a result, the Baekun camp could barely sustain itself with the current daily consumption, but if things continued like this, they would definitely be meeting their doom in the not-too-distant future. Precisely because of this, everyone's expression turned a little ugly as they looked at Bai Yong after hearing that he had been wasting resources. Bai Yong's expression also changed slightly as he perceived the change in the atmosphere. He was fully aware that despite controlling half of Baekun camp's forces, the truth was that a single mistake was all that was needed to fall from the paper throne on which he was sitting. However, Bai Yong soon calmed down. Without saying a word, he took a picture out of the folder in his hands and silently passed it to the person next to him. The person next to Bai Yong was a middle-aged woman of around 50 years old. However, despite having already reached such an age, there were hardly any wrinkles on her face that instead of making her look old gave her an extra touch of maturity, and even the few strands of white hair looked like ornaments among her lustrous jet black hair. The name of this woman was Bai Wei. She was Bai Yong's younger sister and Bai Jian's mother. At the same time, Bai Wei was also the person in charge of controlling the police forces in place of Bai Yong, so her power could not be underestimated at all. Bai Wei's eyes flashed quizzically as she saw the picture before her and asked a little surprised, "Who is this young man?" Bai Yong looked at her sister and secretly sighed as he noticed how her breathing seemed to turn slightly heavy. Bai Wei was actually a soul evolver as well. While her level was below 15, she had enough strength to protect herself in most normal cases, and her beauty had also returned to when she was around 40. The only problem was that she was a bit prurient when it came to young men, and Bai Yong was fully aware that the young man in the picture was undoubtedly the most handsome man his sister had ever seen, therefore, it was understandable her reaction. "That young man is the leader of the enemy camp, Bai Zeman," Bai Yong said in a deep voice as he took off the picture from Bai Wei and passed it to someone else. Bai Wei froze when she heard this before a glint of disappointment flashed through her eyes. However, she soon seemed to think of something and quickly perked up again. No one knew what she was thinking. The rest inside the room were also surprised when they heard Bai Yong's words and quickly began to rush the others to see the image of the young leader. While everyone was calling Bai Zeman and his troops bandits in a loud voice, the truth was that they all thought differently. A person who led a group capable of surviving for so long in a chaotic world like the one they were currently living in despite carrying the weight of almost 10,000 survivors was definitely someone to be admired. As the picture of Bai Zeman passed around the table, Bai Yong continued. "That image you are looking at was secretly taken by one of the spy soldiers I managed to secretly corrupt." After saying this, he looked at Jin Shun for a moment, which caused the latter's face to darken. Bai Yong sneered at Jin Shun with a scornful face and continued. "The amount of information I managed to get about this person named Bai Zeman is not too much. His name, 20 years old, and it is also said that he possesses enough power to flatten the ground 1 kilometer before him using blood spears." As Bai Yong slowly narrated what he managed to learn about Bai Zeman, Shen Mei, who was the last to receive the picture, took a detailed look at the image of the young man in front of her, and her heart could not help but be a little moved. Rawlat stch on n/v/l, b, I, cm. The image had been secretly taken from the distance, so it was a bit blurry. However, in the picture, she could see his full figure wearing black armor and his face was also partially visible. The picture was taken a day after Bai Zeman returned from conquering the North Camp, and as a result, there was a slight smile on his face as he was still enjoying the overwhelming victory he had experienced. Although Shen Mei was 30 years old, like all living beings she also knew how to appreciate pretty looks, and Bai Zeman was by far the most handsome man. She considered that even if his overall appearance had improved due to evolution, his general features must not have been bad at all in the past. After all, to reach such a level of handsomeness it would probably be necessary to reach the second and even the third stage of evolution. Shen Mei by no means believed that anyone had reached such a level yet. Of course, Shen Mei had no way of knowing that previously Bai Zeman could only be described as slightly above average in terms of appearance, and while his level had not yet reached the second or third order, the purity of his soul somehow compensated for it. Mo Zan noticed Shen Mei's bright eyes and his expression sank. He had always tried to get between her legs, but Shen Mei was an extremely proud woman who never looked at any man, so now that he saw her seemingly interested in a pretty face boy, he suddenly felt unhappy. Flattening a kilometer in front of him using blood spears? Pure bullshit. Even my skill fire wheel can't do that, let alone some shitty blood spears. Mo Zan scoffed disdainfully as he squeezed both beauties' breasts in his embrace hard. The faces of the two beauties turned pale and they had to restrain the urge to cry out in pain as they continued to smile to save themselves from trouble later. Such things had happened before. No one wanted to suffer at Mo Zan's hands when he was in a clearly bad mood. Bai Yong looked at Mo Zan and said calmly, "I also find it hard to believe, but that's what some of those who were present on the day when another camp in the north attacked them using a group of several soul evolvers and several dozen armed policemen." Everyone was silent and even Mo Zan did not find much to say this time. However, Jin Shun snorted and said coldly, "Even if he is strong, what? He can fight off the bombardment of 13 war tanks while evading a hail of heavy bullets? Even if I get beaten to death, I refuse to believe that a 20-year-old brat who hasn't experienced the cruelty of the world can do something like that." Mo Zan immediately nodded and said disdainfully, "In this case, I must agree with Commander Jin Shun. Before he was just an ordinary citizen who studied obediently. I refuse to believe that in 2 months a person can undergo a drastic change unless he miraculously obtains a skill that changes the way he behaves. I guess you're right." Bai Yong nodded after thinking for a moment and the others nodded in agreement as well. Mo Zan's words were quite reasonable. If such skills were normal, then fools could become geniuses in an instant. While no one denied that such skills existed, no one believed that such a thing would appear so soon after the world changed. Of course, little did the high command of the Baekun camp expect that Bai Zeeman had actually acquired at the beginning of the apocalypse a skill that almost completely changed his attitude. No, perhaps more than changed his attitude, the stone heart skill caused Bai Zeeman's emotions to become firm and allowed him to make decisions without hesitation. There was no doubt that one of the main factors behind Bai Zeeman's great and fast growth was the skill stone heart. Even if he was brave and had great talent for magic and close combat, his unwavering mentality was undoubtedly what allowed his diminutive body in comparison to the burdens that weighed on his shoulders not to collapse. So, what do you suggest, Major Bai Yong? Shen Mei asked after handing over the picture but not before giving it one last look. Bai Yong carefully kept the picture for which he paid more than he expected and said slowly, although I really don't think that having an all-out confrontation against people who are clearly powerful, I'm afraid we have no choice but to do it. So it really is war. I wonder how many will die in the process. We're finally going to wipe out these savage bandits. Cheat the L test bells on no/v/Elbin. C/OM. After conquering another camp with so many survivors, I bet that this Bai Zeeman has a lot of supplies in his base. If we manage to get our hands on all his treasures. The room immediately became noisy as everyone began to comment loudly. Some agreed to attack, others seemed unsure. While some seemed to be a little afraid of the possibility of being defeated and losing everything, others firmly believed in the power of the Baekun camp so they were already thinking about the treasures they would get after the victory. We finally agree on something. Jin Shun nodded in satisfaction as he gave Bai Yong a self-satisfied look and said, if you had listened to me earlier, those bandits wouldn't have been able to grow to this extent and everything would be much easier. Bai Yong sighed and while forcing his forehead said quietly, the problem is those 20 million zombies. If we want to grow beyond the Baekun sub-district, we have to spread north and south. To the north is the faction of this young Bai Zeeman, and to the south millions of enemies. If we stay like this, stuck as we are, it will only be a matter of time before a hard enemy shows up. The most efficient way to reach the southern district was to cross using the Eastern Dragon's Back. The Eastern Dragon's Back was a huge bridge that stretched for over 100,000 meters where the only thing underneath was water. The other way was to head northwest or northeast and cross another district and then go around it and finally reach the southern district. However, this would take weeks in the past not to mention now that the world was no longer the way it was. This was precisely the reason why Bai Zeeman constantly aimed south. He did not have time to spend several months circling districts before finally finding his loved ones. Therefore, the two sides were destined to clash. It was only a question of whether the clash would be sooner or later. Is there no way to come to an agreement? Shen Mei asked with a frown. Even though she had been a gangster's wife in the past, it didn't mean that she loved war and death. She was just a woman in love and for love anyone would do anything. If there was any way to avoid war, then Shen Mei hoped to find it. I'm afraid it will be difficult. Bai Yong sighed and shook his head as he explained his thoughts. This person called Bai Zeeman must definitely be powerful to rise from being nothing to leading a large faction in such a short time. Unlike people like me or Commander Jin Shun who already had a solid foundation before the apocalypse, this Bai Zeeman established everything from the ground up by himself, and to do something like that you need to wield a great deal of power. Shen Mei was silent when she heard this. In all the past meetings, Bai Zeeman never showed himself. Bai Yong continued, according to reports, he is a very proud person who prefers death rather than submission and judging by the way things are going, I'm afraid he will definitely not hand over his faction. Now we can only hope that Bai Jian manages to lure him out using the position of police forces leader as well as an important position in the government cabinet. Otherwise, we can just fight. Ha ha ha. I wonder if that Bai Jian guy will manage to do that or will his arrogance go to his head. Mo Zan laughed out loud, ignoring Bai Wei's gaze. Shen Mei also frowned at the thought of Bai Jian's arrogant attitude. She couldn't help but say in a low voice, I'm afraid that Bai Jian might bring more problems than solutions. Even more so considering how lustful he is. Bai Wei slammed the table and said angrily, my son may be lustful and have many faults, however, he is definitely not foolish enough to not see the big picture. Shen Mei sighed and shook her head. Let's hope that's the case. Mo Zan scoffed and said no more. From his point of view, whether it was one Bai Zeeman or two Bai Zeemans the only difference was one more head to chop off and that was it. His current level was 45 and he was very close to reaching the threshold of the next stage, he could feel the soul power inside him almost touching a boundary barrier. He was fully confident in his power and feared no one. As long as he was not caught by heavy weaponry, Mo Zan firmly believed that there was no human capable of taking him down. After discussing a few more details, Bai Yong looked at Jin Shun and said in a deep voice, Commander Jin, I hope we can put aside our differences at least for a moment. The present and future of the entire base rests on our shoulders. Jin Shun also put on a serious expression and said in a dignified voice, don't worry, Mayor Bai. For the sake of the country and the people, we, the army, will give our all to root out the bandits who took advantage of the instability of the motherland to plan a takeover. The expression of some people in the hall became quite amused as they looked at Bai Yong and Jin Shun with weird eyes. It was clear that the two men were making use of their positions again to throw dirty water on someone else's head. However, one needed righteous reasons to launch a fierce war like the one that was soon to break out. By using the name of the country and the people to eradicate traitors as a base, even if the central government ever recovered, the top commanders of the Baekun camp could immediately excuse themselves and their actions as them saving the Chinese people from the clutches of a dictator. Bai Yong also understood Jin Shun's thoughts, so he too nodded and said deeply, Commander Jin is a hero. I hope you will order your military troops to cooperate with my special forces to attack the enemy. If the two of us join hands, then even if this Bai Zeeman person is really as strong as the rumors say, he will definitely fall. Take them to a point that they can't get out of, and they will die before they can escape. Jin Shun quoted. Our numbers are definitely at least 4 times greater than the enemy's. Even if the enemy leader is a 4-armed, 2-headed monster, he will have to fall from exhaustion. Since an agreement has been reached, I will go and prepare. I will do the same for my part. The two men stood up and gave orders to the people on their side within the hall. Then, with the two leading the way, they all walked out together before splitting up to go give orders to the forces they were leading. Little did they know that an enemy had already sneaked into their base while they were discussing the war. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Dressed in threadbare clothes and with several patches of dirt on his face, Fu Suofeng tousled his hair to make it look like a bird's nest of straw and mingled among the survivors who occasionally entered the base. Although there were a large number of soldiers guarding the north gate of the base as they were aware of the existence of another camp at the north of their current position, Fu Suofeng had no trouble getting through as not only did his body smell extremely bad but he also had no belongings on his body. After a quick search, the soldiers did not want to stay close to a smelly and worthless survivor so they sent him off in a hurry after giving him a couple of slaps. If it was Zhongde, those soldiers would definitely have died horribly. However, Fu Suofeng was calmer so he didn't mind too much and it wasn't as if the slaps of normal humans meant anything to him. Therefore, after enduring a couple of slaps on the head and ridicule, he successfully entered the enemy base. As he looked around, he noticed that this base was in roughly the same condition as the North Camp after 3 days of improvement following the arrival of Bai Zimin, Shang Guan Bing Xuet, Nanggong Lingzhen, and Nanggong Yi. In a nutshell and at first glance, the Baiquan Camp was in slightly better condition than the North Camp before it fell into the hands of the Transcend faction. Big brother is big brother after all. Fu Suofeng whispered proudly as he secretly compared Beginning Village and Baiquan Camp. His respect and admiration for Bai Zimin grew more and more every day. Like him, Bai Zimin had been just an ordinary man before the apocalypse. But in such a short time he had managed to establish a base that although it was much smaller than the Baiquan Camp, the foundation was undoubtedly firmer. After all, even though Bai Zimin had a much thornier start than people who already enjoyed high positions, all the power of the Transcendent faction was firmly in his grasp in contrast to the Baiquan Camp which was divided into 2 large groups and several smaller ones. Because Fu Suofeng had nothing to do at the moment and could not simply sneak into the private areas of the base in broad daylight, he simply wandered around the base and pretended to be just another survivor. He heard several rumors of which he could not be sure but he also got some information while wandering around the market. Apparently, the soldiers are more restless than usual. I wonder if they are preparing for the war. Fu Suofeng thought secretly as he watched people pass by from inside a dark and wet alley. This is the 10th group of soldiers I've seen pass by in 4 hours and if add to that the other 10 police groups I think it's safe to assume something big is going to happen. Fu Suofeng stood up as the sun went down and muttered, I'd better get moving too. I have to hurry back to base to report this to the big brother. Making use of the night cloak, Fu Suofeng's active skill invisibility showed great effect in evading patrols. This in conjunction with the active skill suppressed presence made it extremely easy for him to leave the base and then sneak back in without having to go through so much trouble. It was just that when he re-entered the base, his clothing was no longer that of a dirt-covered survivor. He wore black leather armor, a dark metallic-colored dagger, he even wore a white bone mask on his face capable of protecting his head from smaller caliber bullets. Quietly and unnoticed, Fu Suofeng charged into the deepest parts of the base. His first target was the military base of the enemy. The night was cold to the point of being almost unbearable. Winds seemed to blow from all 4 main directions and living in a district surrounded by forests definitely didn't help to overcome the cold temperatures. Upstate from N0/V/LBN/.co/M. The trees were swaying so fiercely that one often couldn't help but wonder how the roots had not yet been pulled up from the bottom of the earth. But in fact, were it not for the fact that the trees evolved to become monsters 2 to 10 times their former size, they would definitely have been sent flying on several occasions when the wind became especially wild. In the deepest part within the central area of the Baiquan camp was where those with power and prestige lived. The truly powerful were somewhat judged by how close to the center they lived but no doubt they were all big shots with many contacts within the establishment. Some of these privileged survivors had formed their networks from before the apocalypse while others managed to rise up in the midst of the chaos. Just like the proverb, whenever there is chaos, some will fall and some will rise. Regardless of this, the closer to the center, the greater the status and power one possessed within the base. This was because right at the center of it all was the military might, the base where the war tanks, IFVs, jeeps mounted with heavy machine guns, combat trucks, off-road vehicles modified to survive in the apocalypse, etc., were stored. In addition to the vehicles, heavy arsenals such as machine guns, sniper rifles, assault shotguns, as well as the necessary ammunition for the different types of firearms were also stored inside a large facility built using the bones of several mutant beasts so that even normal soul evolvers would have trouble breaking through the defenses of the large building. Around the perimeter were several men armed to the teeth with professional military training but even those unarmed possessed the ability to fight against several people at the same time because apart from the rigorous training they had undergone, they were all soul evolvers as well. Even if they were only level 5 to level 10 soul evolvers, they were undoubtedly as powerful as level 15 or 20 soul evolvers with no experience in real death combat. Even if a first order soul evolver wanted to sneak into this area, they would definitely not be able to do so without alerting anyone. At least, not if they were a common first order soul evolver. Hey, who do you think will win the battle against that faction north of our position? A burly soldier asked, bored. Is that even a question? Another soldier chuckled and replied confidently, Commander Jin has control of a complete arsenal. If it wasn't because we didn't have enough manpower, those 2 or 3 M3 Bradley wouldn't have been left behind in that forest and if it wasn't because of that coward dog named Fu Qigong we could have gotten even more guns and ammunition. But even then, I doubt that the other side could do more than put up a little resistance. I guess so. The power of the war tanks and mortars will probably be enough to wipe out the enemy's morale. The first soldier sighed. Then he seemed to think about something and said quietly, it seems that Sergeant Fu Qigong joined the enemy side. I overheard this information by chance when I went to take some documents to Commander Jin so don't go around opening your mouth all over the place. Is that right? The second man became serious when he heard this. He gritted his teeth and said viciously, that dog with the surname Fu. He refused to come with us and because of his stubbornness many brothers were killed but he easily surrendered to a random gangster. If he appears in front of me on the battlefield, I swear I will be the first to pull the trigger without hesitation. The 2 men continued chatting with each other as they patrolled the area, occasionally running into another group. No one really believed that anyone would be so bold as to sneak into the most secure area of the entire base so although they were alert, they were actually quite relaxed. Unnoticed by anyone, a black-clad silhouette flickered through the soldiers at lightning speed. This silhouette was, of course, Fu Suifeng. After breaking through several defensive perimeters and taking almost 2 hours of time, he finally managed to get here. After arriving at the core of the base, Fu Suifeng did not immediately move in and instead spent nearly 3 hours studying the enemy's movement pattern to adapt to their movements and then try to devise a charge plan. After studying the movements of the evolved soldiers in the base, he finally found that between each group's encounter there was approximately 60 seconds difference. Simply put, Fu Suifeng needed to close the distance between the outer part and at least the middle part in that period of time, since immediately after those 60 seconds all the groups would line up with the building as the center point. If it was in the past, when he was still just a normal college student, Fu Suifeng definitely could not possibly have performed such a thing. In fact, he would probably be so nervous at this point that his legs would be shaking. However, after going through a month of fierce training under the regimen set by Fu Qigong for evolved people with Chen He's help, Fu Suifeng became very skilled. Although he was still far from reaching the level of an assassin at Evangeline's level, he would definitely be able to enter the top 10 of the best assassins in the world if this was before the apocalypse. Of course, apart from the training he received, what helped Fu Suifeng the most was his perfect active skills to carry out this kind of task. When he found the perfect opportunity, he did not even hesitate for an instant and immediately rushed forward after jumping off the top of the wall he was hiding on. Fu Suifeng's feet had barely touched the ground when he immediately activated invisibility, suppressed presence, shadow steps. Then, like a ghost, he flashed using the few shadows in the surroundings whenever he had the opportunity to pass between the various groups of evolved soldiers. The skill Shadow Steps was a first-order level 2 skill, so it was naturally incomparable to the second-order level 5 skill Lightning Movement. However, the advantage of the skill Shadow Steps was that in addition to making no noise at all, it also increased camouflage by 15% when using stealth skills. Several soldiers with keen senses seemed to notice something strange, so their muscles tensed immediately. However, after looking around and not noticing any incidents, they simply shook their heads at the questioning looks of their teammates before continuing to patrol in silence or chatting quietly. When Fu Suifeng passed by 2 other Evolver soldiers after silently breaking through the defense of more than 5 groups, his steps almost faltered as he heard them speaking negatively about Fu Qigong. However, he continued to move forward as his eyes flashed coldly. These treacherous and shameless people really don't know the meaning of the word honor. Fu Suifeng thought as he forcibly suppressed his rising anger. He, like most of those in the faction under Bai Zimin, knew perfectly well that Fu Qigong's group had been cruelly betrayed and abandoned by Battalion Commander Jin Shun and the squads that made up the group. However, these people dared to badmouth behind his back and say such words without any shame. Fu Suifeng made a sidelong glance, remembering the appearance of those people. Then, he continued blinking between the different groups. When there were only about 10 seconds left to reach the time limit, he quickly jumped to a corner where there was a small shooting range where he waited for 15 more seconds with a lot of patience and nerves. In the end, Fu Suifeng had to stop more than 4 times, and there was one instance where he came really close to being caught after making a small error in judgment. However, about 5 minutes later he finally managed to get inside the building. However, rather than calling it a building, perhaps it would be more accurate to call it a huge hangar. Fu Suifeng's eyes sparkled as he observed the vast amount of machinery inside the hangar that easily stretched at least 500 meters long and 500 meters wide. Box after box of ammunition, dozens of vehicles mounted with machine guns, about 20 M3 IFVs, and another 10 normal IFVs. There were also several rows of weapons that were under lock and key in other rooms with several cameras capable of detecting the heat of anyone who came within a certain range. But what frightened and surprised Fu Suifeng the most were the 13 giant steel beasts at the end of the hangar whose cannons pointed toward the hatch in a menacing manner. When had he, a normal student and son of an average family, ever seen such monstrous war tanks up close? Never. Not to mention that those war tanks were his enemies even if they were now turned off. Fu Suifeng observed and studied the area before moving. He took out several devices from his backpack, and the first thing he did was to take off the bone mask covering his face to put on a pair of infrared vision goggles. Fortunately, his worries proved unnecessary as there were no apparent motion detectors or invisible alarms. But this was also natural considering that 80% of the weaponry inside the arsenal Jin Shun ran out of was basically vintage equipment, so it would be too strange if they had such advanced technology. One thing that perhaps needed to be stressed was that up until now, Fu Suifeng had kept his invisibility skill active at almost all times. This was only possible because after successfully evolving to First Order and acquiring his Storm Assassin job, the mana consumption to maintain stealth or lightning-like movement speed skills had decreased by 20%. That was the passive skill he had obtained after evolving. Although this passive skill was nowhere near as brutal as the Blood Will passive skill that empowered Bai Zimin greatly the more enemies he was surrounded by and even served as an enemy alert, obtaining a 20% decrease in the consumption of a certain group of skills was undoubtedly a great bonus. Not for nothing the job of Fu Suifeng was also a rarity that few in the universe possessed. I'll leave you a little present before I head off to finish the task that Big Brother entrusted me with. Fu Suifeng whispered softly, and a devilish smile appeared on his face as he took out a small box the size of a cigarette box from his backpack. While there were a few soldiers inside the hangar, the security was simply pitiful when compared to the danger outside. Fu Suifeng had no trouble reaching the first of the 13 war tanks and silently rolled across the floor until he reached the bottom. After hiding and securing the small box at the bottom of the war tank, Fu Suifeng emerged and continued rolling on the ground and reached the second war tank. He did the same as before and continued like this until 10 of the 13 tanks finally gained an extra unknown object at the bottom. Fu Suifeng's eyes flashed with a hint of regret as he stood up and looked at the large number of vehicles in the remaining 3 tanks. It was a pity that he only had 10 of those dangerous toys with him, or else the battlefield scene 2 days from now would surely be a lot of fun to watch. The enemies would hardly know what hit them. After confirming the enemy firepower, Fu Suifeng quietly stepped out and more easily than before managed to avoid the perimeter of the evolved soldiers. But instead of leaving the core of the base completely, he charged toward one of the larger and more enlightened villages. Surely someone important lived there. The villa Fu Suifeng was targeting was quite luxurious and the surrounding lighting was quite exaggerated. At the very least, he estimated that a person within the top 5 of this base's power scale should live in this place. The reason Fu Suifeng came to such a thought was because although no armed guards could be seen with the naked eye, he noticed that hidden in the bushes, on the rooftops, even on some of the balconies, there were several soul evolvers hidden in the sparse shadows, shadows which had clearly been left on purpose as the light bulbs had been placed in such a way that certain areas would remain dark forever. But none of you can catch me. Fu Suofeng's mouth curved slightly upwards and his eyes glittered as he surveyed everything from the rooftop of another villa less conspicuous than the first. With a swift leap, he dashed forward and when he reached 50 meters in distance he immediately activated invisibility one more time. His body seemed to blend in with the surroundings and his footsteps became light enough to go unnoticed amidst the silence, not to mention a night with howling winds that were similar to the roars of lions. Fu Suofeng took no more than a couple of seconds to reach the target property and very easily overtook the soul evolvers hidden in the shadows. None of them noticed anything strange at all, as not only Fu Suofeng was a holder of a special job within the First Order existences, but the other party had levels ranging from level 5 with level 12 being the highest. After circling the 3-story villa several times, Fu Suofeng found a place to sneak through. Taking some distance, he jumped as far as he could while continuing to run in midair, and when his feet touched the wall he jumped a second time, this time reaching the roof of the villa. Without delay, he evaded the 2 female soul evolvers carrying sniper rifles and quietly slipped inside the building, using as an entrance a skylight that had probably been left open by the owner of the house to let the wind flow gently along with the starlight. When Fu Suofeng's feet touched the red carpet of the top floor hallway, he seemed to sense something, so he immediately jumped into an open room and pulled out his dagger while leaning his back against the wall. So, you're telling me that Boss Lu's son slept with his friend's girlfriend? That's right. The rumor is spreading fast. It seems that young Master Chen was furious when he found out that his girlfriend put a green hat on him, so he threw her alive into the zombies, and now he's looking for young Master Lu but can't find him anywhere. Probably Chief Lu is hiding his son. As one of the police chiefs, Chief Lu's prestige is not inferior to Sir Chen at all, so it's unlikely that the matter will escalate any further. Who knows? But that girl sure doesn't know what's good for her. Stabbing the back of the person who took care of her despite having nothing in the world. That's the way things work. I guess you're right. Fu Suofeng held his breath and closed his eyes as he tried to think about something else to calm his heartbeat to avoid being caught. However, realizing that the footsteps of the 2 people were of normal, unevolved human women, he relaxed a bit. Gossiping, Fu Suofeng could not help but want to hear more about the melodramatic drama, but in the end, he simply dashed off in the opposite direction from where the 2 women dressed as maids were heading. Because Fu Suofeng was unfamiliar with this villa, he had to tread carefully as he didn't know where each door would lead. If he ended up opening the door that led to the room of a powerful soul evolver present, then he might cause several problems, so he had no choice but to proceed carefully. After walking slowly and carefully along 2 corridors, Fu Suofeng judged that the 3rd floor was probably occupied only by the master of the house, and the basis of this thought lay in the fact that so far he had just seen a few maids who were making sure that everything was in order before leaving without delay to the lower floor. While it was true that Bai Ziman liked having his bedroom on the highest floor of his villa, it could not be said that everyone liked it as well. Fu Suofeng himself was a clear example of this, as despite having his own villa no less luxurious than the one he was currently sneaking into, he preferred to stay on the middle floor. From the maidens who passed by and were gossiping among themselves, he learned that indeed the person who lived in this villa was one of the most high-ranking people in the Baekwon camp. Moreover, apparently, that person was a woman. Now feeling a lot calmer, Fu Suofeng began to search through the rooms one by one. He carefully opened the doors and after taking a quick look through the small slit, he simply left everything as it was before and then moved to the next one. Even after checking more than 10 rooms, all Fu Suofeng found were empty rooms. There was literally nothing in them. Just when he wondered if the owner of the house had strange tastes and perhaps preferred to sleep on the floor instead of the comfort of a bed, he finally hit the jackpot. A room decorated in a slightly luxurious manner but not to the degree Fu Suofeng expected appeared before his eyes after opening the 2nd door of the 1st corridor next to the main staircase leading to the lower floors. The floor was carefully covered by a carpet made from the pelt of what appeared to be a purple panther, the curtains covering the large window were also silky purple and even the bed covers were deep purple. Aside from an oversized bed, the room had only a dresser, a nightstand, and a desk with a wooden chair. Although the furnishings were sparse, Fu Suofeng estimated that the price of the curtains alone could make an average worker like his father cry tears of blood to pay in the past. After making sure no one was in, he quietly closed the door behind him and walked to the dresser. Damn it! Fu Suofeng blushed as he saw the sexy underwear of all kinds of colors in the top drawer. There were 3 rows filled with black, red, pink, white, navy blue, etc. colored bras. Another 3 rows filled with panties of all kinds of colors, but some of them were so small that Fu Suofeng couldn't help but wonder if that could even be considered a panty or not. Then there were 3 other rows stuffed with carefully packed and unopened pantyhose. There were even several sexy lingers there. Damn it! He muttered again and had to bite his tongue hard to keep from being distracted by the beautiful sight in front of him. Although Fu Suofeng possessed enough status and power that a large number of ladies were willing to sleep with him into Bai Ziman's faction, some of them even beauties who in the past would not have even given him a glance, Fu Suofeng himself was an extremely shy young man who had difficulty communicating with the opposite sex. In fact, except for Kong Lan and Cai Jing'ai, Fu Suofeng basically did not speak to any woman other than his older sister who now lived in his villa after being found by Bai Ziman when he headed north to conquer the enemy camp. Fu Suofeng felt footsteps from the staircase and fearing that another maid might appear he quickly took something out of his bag, a letter. Then, he made sure the letter was in a visible place while with trembling hands he placed it on a bra at the front of the main drawer. If the landlady wanted to take a shower tonight she would definitely see the letter. Just as Fu Suofeng was about to jump out the window, a cold voice sounded from behind him. Didn't your mother teach you that sneaking into a lady's room is impolite? Fu Suofeng's pupils constricted abruptly and as if by instinct he activated the earth bracelet's effect. Swoosh. The wind whistled behind him as a sharp object was thrown towards his back. However, thanks to his quick reaction and just an instant before he would be hit, an earthen spike shot out from the magic circle that shone above the floor. Bang. Ugh. The earthen spike exploded after colliding with the sharp object and several fragments struck Fu Suofeng's body, forcing him to retreat a couple of steps while internally thanking his armor or otherwise he would have definitely been injured. After all, the earth spike was not a normal earth spike, it was a skill that came from a treasure. After making some of distance between the entrance of the room and him, Fu Suifeng looked ahead and saw a beautiful woman standing right in the middle of the doorway. The woman had a pretty sexy body, nothing extremely over the top, but she definitely stood out in what she had to show. Her face was quite nice, not Shang Guanbing Shui level beauty but definitely a beauty. However, that pretty face seemed to be covered by a layer of frost as she looked at Fu Suifeng with dagger-like eyes. Fu Suifeng activated invisibility on the spot and his body blurred before disappearing. However, the lady who had just arrived was clearly not normal as she simply snorted and her dark eyes took on a strange bright red color. Her gaze suddenly shifted to the side and with a swift movement, she threw another sharp object. Fu Suifeng, who had darted towards the window the first moment his skill was activated, sensed something and when he looked behind him over his shoulder he was shocked to see the devilish look those glowing red eyes were giving him. When he saw how the beautiful woman's hand trembled, the moonlight that barely penetrated the silk curtain shone and a small object the thickness of a needle was reflected for an instant. Fu Suifeng leaned as far as he could to the side while gritting his teeth in preparation for the impact. Swoosh. Surprisingly, however, the small object passed just 1 inch from his head leaving nothing but a small mark on his bone mask. Fu Suifeng didn't think too much about it and pulled out a strange seed from his pocket before squeezing it with all his strength but without breaking it completely before throwing it against the wall in front of him. Bang. The strange cracked seed finally broke apart after hitting the wall and immediately after that a dense cloud of green smoke flew out everywhere. The woman's expression changed slightly when she saw this and hurriedly jumped back as she kicked the door, leaving the room and sealing most of the smoke inside. An instant later, however, the woman sensed that something was wrong and hurriedly opened the door. Despite having inhaled the greenish gas, her organism felt nothing strange. Obviously the other party had made her believe that it was some kind of poison to escape. Shen Mei didn't know whether to laugh or cry as she looked at her open bedroom window with the curtains flapping fiercely due to the strong wind blowing from outside. Her icy expression from before when she looked furious disappeared without a trace and she silently walked towards the closed dresser drawer.